I'm the prince of a major kingdom, but my own brother shot me in the back with an arrow, leaving me in a coma. The reason? I'm the son of the king's first wife, who died mysteriously from poison, and they never found out who was guilty after taking that arrow. I was in a coma for 6 years, and my soul was sent to the place where heroes go after death. Only people who changed the world in their eras end up there. At first, everyone thought it was amazing that such a young kid became a hero, but soon they found out I was nothing like that. I was weak, talentless, and definitely not a hero in my time. Still, they couldn't accept someone like me in the realm of heroes, so they trained me for 1,000 years until I was just as worthy as everyone else there. After 1,000 years, my body finally woke up from the coma. Those heroes who treated me like trash for a millennium ended up wishing me luck when I left. I smiled and stepped into the light. Since only heroes go there, they'll never see me again, since I'm not a hero and I don't plan on becoming one. When I opened my eyes, I felt my weak body had no strength to get up. I am Davey Alrone, the eldest son of a small kingdom. Those who killed my mother and tried to do the same to me better wait, because I'm not that weak and innocent brat anymore. Day after day, only one maid came to my room to take care of me. That's what kept me alive. I didn't want to reveal I was awake, so I only moved when she left. I went to the calendar because I didn't know how long I'd been sleeping. When I saw the date, the truth hit me like another arrow in the back. I've been here for 6 years, because 6 years ago that bastard shot me in the back, and now he's going to pay. To take control of my family, I need a strong body. I tried using the magic I learned in the other world, but I couldn't do it and didn't understand why. Back in the land of heroes, a girl taught me about magic and holy powers. The very saintess known for centuries for her God-given powers was the one who taught me magic. The magic wasn't working, and I soon felt like all my training in the other world was going to vanish and have no effect on Earth. When any normal person would have given up after hours of failing, it worked. The divine healing power actually worked. A green light took over the room, and after that, my weak and miserable body, which felt like a 300-year-old man's, was now bursting with energy. Seeing the kingdom where I grew up, I stretched out my arms in joy and shouted to the sun god. Unfortunately, I didn't notice that the maid had come back into the room behind me. She cried with emotion seeing her young master alive. Sometime later, the castle doctor examined me and confirmed that my health is incredibly better than before. It's an unexplainable miracle. During the checkup, a woman entered the room. That is Linus Barrett, the woman who poisoned my mother and took her place as the king's new wife. These are her sons, the second prince, Carlos, and the third prince, Benedict. The second prince tried to eliminate me, and he thought he succeeded. The woman asked if I saw the face of the person who shot that arrow years ago. I said yes, and that an assassination attempt against royalty is the biggest crime possible. Hearing those words, the culprit felt his blood freeze. But beside him, his mother laughed sarcastically and said the case was closed years ago. The doctor sensed the weird vibe, said I'll be completely cured in a few days, and left the room. The woman, Linus, didn't hide her true feelings and said it would have been better if I had died. So I asked if the fact that I'm alive upsets her that much. Carlos replied that it's a shame for the kingdom to have a prince fall victim to an attack and stay in a coma for so many years. He said a pathetic prince cannot become king in the future. After that, they all left. Now that he was alone, the protagonist realized that even though he had been using magic in front of the others, no one had noticed. He figured that their differing power levels allowed him to go unnoticed by others. Seeing the wicked queen and her sons again made the protagonist want to exact revenge immediately. However, he managed to control himself. He attributed this to having stayed in a temple for a long time, but still he wanted to seek his vengeance. For now, he needed to calmly think about what to do. But for now, he wanted something to eat and wondered what his first meal after waking from the coma would be. 15 days after recovering his sacred powers and cutting his hair, the protagonist had been training in his room. He realized time passed very slowly when there wasn't much to do. Thanks to his training, however, his mana control had greatly improved, and his recovery process sped up considerably. Even though he could recover quickly with continuous healing magic, coupled with a necromancer's knowledge of the human body and the medical expertise taught to him by Master Haya, fully restoring his body wouldn't be an issue. The protagonist put everything he learned during his isolation into practice and found that magic indeed made things much more convenient. Still, one thing bothered him. His maid, Amy, had decided to strictly follow the doctor's orders and serve the prince soup daily. Because of this, he felt like an old man who couldn't chew anything. Amy felt bad that he didn't like it, but claimed she couldn't do anything about it. Regardless, the protagonist insisted that one dish wouldn't be enough to sustain him, so he told her to serve 5 more just like it. The maid was startled by the request, but Davey assured her he would eat everything, as long as she brought the meal. Davey knew that for a normal person this would be a lot, but because of the restoration magic he used, the amount of food he needed was much greater. In a way, after eating properly, he felt like his soul was finally at peace. However, while he consumed a lot of food, his visits to the bathroom were also frequent. Sometime later, Davey came across some documents and uncovered an unexpected truth. Amy expressed her apologies for this, but Davey comforted her, saying it wasn't her fault. He realized the amount of food he was consuming was becoming a problem for his family. Not only that, but he discovered Amy was the only remaining servant in the castle. The family's financial problems had even impacted this. What's more, the castle where he lived was enormous for just one maid to manage everything alone. Worried about the future, Davey asked what the estimated value of the castle's assets was. Amy replied that they only had 6,000 gold coins. Davey said that if they could manage this budget, they shouldn't have any more problems. However, Amy stated that officially, they were supposed to receive 500 gold coins a month, but in reality, they were getting less than 100. Davey asked if his family was being extorted. The maid said no, so he asked if the problem was her salary. But he understood that by this point, she probably wasn't even getting paid regularly. Amy couldn't lie to him, so she admitted she was only receiving a third of what she used to earn. With this, Davey thought Amy might be generous, but agreeing to work under such conditions was foolish. After all, household maids were considered property of the nobility, and Amy was the daughter of an artist. Due to their poor circumstances, she had become his maid, but looking after the prince and the castle alone for the past 6 years must have been incredibly tough. Not only that, but she had practically spent the little she earned to keep looking after the prince. Because of this, Davey ordered her to take what she hadn't received so far from his personal funds. Amy refused to do so, saying they didn't even have food for the next day, so she couldn't accept such an amount. Davey told her that from now on, she didn't need to treat him like a prince anymore. He also said he felt much better and no longer needed her constant care. Besides, being called prince was too formal and made him feel distant from Amy, and he didn't like that because she was the only person who had truly stayed by his side for so long. Sometime later, Davey, the protagonist, is visited by a counselor at the kingdom's financial department. The man states that it's impossible for the prince to use the funds already accounted for. However, Davey can only focus on the counselor's strange mustache. He notices that the people around him are looking at him with disdain, and even the counselor observes this. But instead of lowering his head, Davey tells the counselor not to obstruct his request. He states that he should be receiving around 500 gold, but he's getting less than half of that and wants to know why. The counselor explains that the costs of maintaining the castle are deducted from the amount of gold the prince's family should receive, so they only get what's left over. However, Davey says he's getting irritated by these arguments. The people around him feel the same way, as they point out that the family's castle has cracked floors and a garden full of weeds. Therefore, such a poorly maintained place shouldn't cost so much to keep up. Even Davey agrees with this. Not only that, but he knows it's uncommon for a prince or any other royal family member to manage their own finances. In turn, the counselor states that the use of the maintenance fund is not supervised by the finance department. He also says that this place is for managing the budget, not for requesting loans. Davey realizes that no one is willing to take the blame for the financial problems. He then prepares to leave, until the counselor asks if the prince will go to the maintenance department. Davey replies that he wouldn't get any answers there. He knows that anywhere, those in charge always come up with excuses and blame others instead of providing satisfactory answers. Before leaving, he tells the counselor to enjoy the money he still has in his pockets. As he walks through the palace, Davey thinks it's no wonder that no servant besides Amy has remained working, because besides being poorly paid, they were mistreated by the nobles, leaving the entire burden on Amy. Next, Davey asks if Amy could bring him a sword. The maid is startled by such a sudden request, but he claims he has no intention of using the sword to harm anyone or anything like that. At this, Amy goes to fetch a sword for the prince. In her absence, Davey thinks that he won't cut a person, because those who are his targets cannot even be considered human. The protagonist knows he's in an unstable position now, and he can't start eliminating his targets without prior planning. After all, he's already an outcast, and if he were discovered, it could be even worse. Besides, his intention isn't to stoop to the level of the nobles he despises so much. At another point, Davey and his maid come across a dead wild boar. Davey claims he found the animal that way. This is obviously a lie, as he himself hunted the animal and is now preparing it to be eaten. However, upon seeing this, Amy becomes distraught, claiming that a prince's hands should never touch a dead animal. Not only that, but she tells him to be careful not to get hurt again. Davey says it will be fine if no one else sees him doing this. He knows that even if he wanted to see the king, he'd be prevented from doing so. As for others, there's nothing he can do about them either. Davey knows that the queen is doing everything in her power to harm him. However, However, as an apprentice of Hercules, he knows how to fend for himself when it comes to survival. In this situation, Davey tells Amy that the wild boar will now be his dinner, and the animal poses no danger to him. At another time, in the Queen's chambers, she tells a maid that the more she thinks about Davey, the more she finds him different from before his coma. Her maid, Shirley, says that according to the doctors, the prince can barely walk now, and it will take more than a year until he fully recovers. However, the Queen asks if there's any chance this information is inaccurate. She states that even though Shirley is a Class A informant for the Black Moon, she is nothing more than a Class C maid in the Queen's presence. Shirley belongs to the Assassin's Guild residing in the capital of Raun, the Black Moon. Even though she trusts her, the Queen can't feel comfortable with the prince awake. The Queen knows that even the king abandoned the prince, and even after waking from a coma, he is still weak. But she'll only truly feel comfortable once she completely removes the prince from her path. Despite this being her desire, Shirley warns that her comrades act independently of class. If the Queen continues to insult them, she could face problems with them. Startled, the Queen says she merely expressed her concerns out loud. She also says that she wishes she could interrupt the prince's plans at any moment, otherwise she claims it will be Shirley who pays the price. Having said that, she dismisses the maid. In her absence, the Queen thinks it's better to get rid of the disobedient dogs before taking her next step, and she can't wait for that to happen. A flashback shows that the protagonist once learned controlling mana is like pulling a thread through hundreds of needles, something that must be done slowly and carefully. His master also told him that the hardest parts to reach are the veins of the brain, and if he didn't want to go blind, he should never forget these teachings. However, when he saw his masters, the protagonist thought that the priestess Ro-Ias was just a drunkard who could split the ocean in half with mere words. The other was a necromancer who acted more like a priestess than Ro-Ias herself, and despite being a great mage, all she ever seemed to show off was her huge staff. Then, the goddess Hippocrea, also known as Sister Hia, said that while participating in this experiment, she would do her best to complete the task. She also said that people didn't seek her out just to watch her, but also to learn from her, so she would like Davey to try a little harder, and she affirmed that if he trusted his masters more, he might be able to evolve his abilities. However, the moment the protagonist did so, he went through such an unpleasant experiment that he never wanted to go through anything similar again. Back in the present, Amy finds him outside the palace. She asks why the prince is exploring the gardens again. He just says the weather is very pleasant, and even the forest garden looks elegant now. He then tells Amy she can return to her duties, and should only inform him if someone asks for him. Davey thinks that normally Amy would go crazy if she saw him getting into anything remotely dangerous, but apparently she's getting used to his routine. Although she still refuses to sit and eat with him, Davey wonders if his efforts to get closer to her are bearing fruit. Anyway, he finds a good spot in the middle of the garden. It's discreet and calm there, so he can finally begin his work. With that, he begins his meditation process, concentrating to absorb the surrounding mana. Davey thinks that as long as the air is pure, besides his lungs being nourished by oxygen, he also absorbs some of nature's mana. This ancient technique, it's said, was created by Odin himself and passed down to other gods from generation to generation. But despite its effectiveness, there's a limit to the mana each user can store in their body. So to increase this limit, training and management are required. However, through this method, mana that would normally take months to collect can be obtained in just a few days, making it a miraculous technique. The protagonist thinks that if everyone discovered this, there would be a revolution in the country, but he has no intention whatsoever of sharing this knowledge. After all, this isn't something just anyone can do. During his meditation, the protagonist notices someone watching him. He wonders who is lurking, but the person realizes their presence has been noticed and flees immediately. Davey thinks that although it's been a while since anyone watched him closely, investigating it would only bring trouble, so he decides to let it go for now. He wants to project the image of a fragile and useless prince, as that would allow him to train his mana in peace. However, he thinks he has to deal with another issue, the mana circle. Davey knows that priests cannot use magic, and mages cannot use sacred powers. Furthermore, necromancy is a power neither can use. However, he's a special case, as he can wield the abilities of priests, mages, and necromancers, all thanks to his crazy temple masters and also the two eccentric researchers. Even so, just remembering that time makes the protagonist feel bad. Anyway, he thinks that mages normally draw a circle in their heart to use mana. Unfortunately, this method cannot handle the clash between necromancy and sacred power. If he were to do that, his heart would probably be destroyed in the process. Called the Artery Circle, this method involves combining the arteries around his body to create an impenetrable and mana-resilient circle. By doing this, Davey would use his entire body, including his heart, and not only would it stop the clash between necromancy and sacred power, but it would also bring surprising results. However, since this is as close as it gets to body modification, even a single mistake would be fatal. That's why he didn't want to resort to this method. Last time, he only succeeded thanks to the Temple Masters, but now that he's alone, he's unsure about the outcome of the process. Thinking so much about it, the protagonist has a glimpse. He ends up seeing his masters. So, he thinks that even if he fails the method, it wouldn't be as bad as spending 1,000 years in the temple. In that case, he decides to try. Sometime later, worried about the prince, Amy thinks it's already past dinner time and he hasn't appeared. She finds it strange, as he's never late for his meals. She had been ordered not to disturb the prince unless something of extreme importance happened, but even so, she's worried about his well-being. Plus, if anything happened to the prince, she could be held responsible. However, the protagonist appears shortly after. He apologizes for making her wait. Davey says he admires Amy's resilience. Not only that, but he ends up collapsing onto her. This leaves Amy quite embarrassed, as she thinks it's a display of affection. However, the protagonist was just leaning on her. From sheer exhaustion, he could barely stand. For the same reason, he then falls to the ground, leaving Amy truly worried about his physical state. Sometime later, the protagonist wakes up in his bed, realizing he fainted as soon as he found Amy. Speaking of Amy, Davey notices his friend's presence when he sees her lying beside him. With this, he knows he's caused Amy trouble once again. Anyway, the protagonist realizes that the circle formation process has been perfectly completed. The 3 powers are flowing through his veins, and on top of this strange circle, there's another special effect. Not only that, but Davey feels a stronger mana presence in the environment. Since he's stronger now, he can also absorb more mana from the air. He feels that with just a flick of his fingers, he can use any simple spell, including restoration. 5 months later, things are different. Amy is helping the protagonist with some ingredients. Davey believes he's fine with what he's been eating, as ever since the Artery Circle was completed and his life stabilized, someone has been leaving meat and vegetables in his castle. At first, he attributed this to some plan by the queen, but he doesn't think she could manage to get away with it perfectly every time without a reason. Davey feels that someone is indeed trying to help him, though he hasn't yet discovered who is doing it. Although he feels a presence, having spread his mana throughout the castle in an attempt to find this person, he still hasn't gotten any answers. However, this has been helping the protagonist better understand who is approaching or moving away from him. Then, Amy says they won't have food problems anytime soon. However, Davey warns that they'll have guests shortly, as he senses someone approaching. He wonders who it could be, deducing it might be one of the queen's informants. Already in his quarters, the protagonist receives his visitors. A priest analyzes his physical state and asks if the prince thinks he'll fully recover soon. He says that since the prince has been bedridden for so long, it's dangerous to use his holy powers in an attempt to heal him. The protagonist, in turn, believes everything the cleric is saying is nonsense, as he hasn't even used proper healing spells and has no real intention of helping. Davey knows that the priest represents God in the nation, so discarding this responsibility to follow someone else's orders is disappointing. Therefore, he thinks the priest should save his words, as he knows the priest has no intention of helping. But contrary to what many believe, Davey is almost healed. He then says that with the silver weapon Priya gave the priest, he should be able to heal such trivial injuries. The priest defends himself, saying that the prince is a layman and has no idea what he's talking about. He also says that the use and knowledge of power are granted only to priests, and even as a prince, he shouldn't be as selfish as Prince Carlos. Hearing this, Amy reprimands Father Boris for his rude words. He, in turn, doesn't like being reprimanded by a mere maid. Angrily, he slaps the young woman. Davey is worried about Amy. After all, he can't intervene without spoiling his disguise. Boris justifies himself, claiming that if he let a maid behave that way, it would be bad for the prince himself, which is why he had to correct her. However, he says it's a shame to have to go that far, as he asserts the maid has a beautiful smile. Irritated, Davey almost gets up to confront the priest. Anyway, Boris says he's leaving and asks the maid to at least accompany him to the door. With that, he says he'll return in 15 days for the next examination. The protagonist asks Amy to accompany him to the door. She doesn't like it at all, but has no alternative but to obey the prince. Outside the room, Boris tries to arrange a meeting with Amy, telling her to show up alone at night. He claims the prince's life is in her hands, so if she wants Davey's well-being, she must do what he says. However, Boris doesn't care about a mere maid or a sick prince. He believes he'll do whatever he wants with the girl and then discard her as if she were nothing. Alone in his room, the prince is filled with rage. He stands up, thinking he didn't build his dignity in the temple just to stand idly by in situations like this. Davey remembers Lady Daphne always saying he would be an animal if he didn't control his anger, but he thinks differently about that. The priest's companions are truly terrified when they see the prince walking. Davey thinks to himself that proper rage is a source of life and can also guide his purpose. He also believes that if laziness is the key to progress, then anger would be his fundamental strength. Soon, the priest's companions are the first to fall to his sword. Meanwhile, the priest tries to blackmail Amy. He says he's working on the queen's orders, so he doesn't care about a mere weak prince, much less his maid. Not only that, but Boris claims everyone in the kingdom thinks the same way. Therefore, he can do whatever he wants with both of them without suffering any punishment, since he has the queen's protection guaranteed. Hearing this, Davey starts to laugh, claiming he needed an excuse to act and found exactly what he was looking for. He then points his sword at the priest and asks Amy, "What's the punishment for blasphemy against royalty?" Annoyed and surprised, the priest asks, "How is the prince standing?" Davey says Boris wasn't promoted from his low-ranking position for a reason. His sacred magic was never actually needed. Next, the protagonist reminds Amy that he warned her to always answer his questions and doesn't want to ask the same thing twice. In that case, Amy says the penalty for blaspheming against royalty is immediate execution. Right after that, the protagonist carries out the sentence on Boris. With his last words, the priest says the queen won't let this happen without retaliation. Davey thanks the phony priest for the warning, but says that all those who stood by the priest will suffer the same fate. It didn't take long for the protagonist to find the queen. As soon as she finds him, she says Davey must be crazy to kill someone like the priest. After all, he was a disciple of the Holy Order. The protagonist justifies himself, saying that Boris threatened his life, so he punished him according to the law. Annoyed, the queen is about to attack the prince. However, he says that before his coma, the kingdom's laws weren't so brutal. Not only that, but he says that while all this is happening, the king remains silent. Besides, Davey sees no point in being punished for his actions, as he simply dealt with someone who blasphemed against royalty. Unless, of course, the status of royalty has become inferior to that of a low-ranking disciple while he was in a coma. With these provocations, the queen becomes truly annoyed, but backs down. Regardless, she says the prince has no proof of what he's saying, and even if it were true, she claims that recklessly provoking the Holy Order is foolish. She then says she always knew Davey inherited his mother's stupidity, and takes the opportunity to insult him and his mother in various ways. In turn, the protagonist says it's not polite to offend someone's parents in that manner, especially someone who has already passed away. He then draws his sword and threatens the queen. However, the queen's servants immediately appear to protect her. That's when the protagonist realizes why the queen is so audacious. She has people to protect her in situations like this. He says it would be interesting to continue this, but he'll leave it for another time. Regardless, he claims that talking too much is just putting another nail in someone's coffin. Therefore, he states that trying to kill someone of the same royalty is no different. Immediately, the queen realizes that Davey already knows it was her son, Carlos, who tried to kill him. The protagonist thinks he's not stupid enough to keep an ace up his sleeve for too long. After all, that doesn't suit his style. He also says that the moment the queen slapped him during his coma, it showed she wasn't very considerate. Not only that, but he tells her to act like a lady, because upon seeing the state of her chambers, he claims the place is far from elegant. And since she herself was responsible for scaring away everyone who worked there, she will now be responsible for taking care of the cleaning as quickly as possible. Otherwise, he says a very nasty rumor might start spreading around. Therefore, he asks the queen to make her decisions carefully from now on, as he won't stand by watching her act behind his back. After the protagonist left the queen's chambers, she unleashed all her anger on her guild servants, screaming her lungs out. Not only that, but she almost destroyed her entire room. Now that she understood the prince's true intentions, her desire to eliminate him grew even stronger. However, she wanted him to suffer before leaving this world. It wasn't long before rumors started to spread. Some believed the prince had eliminated the priest because he went mad after waking from his coma. However, this was all part of the protagonist's plan. After the queen discovered what he did, others found out too, but they didn't have access to the full truth. They only knew the prince had eliminated the priest. Since half the palace staff were on the queen's side, Davey's reputation plummeted even further. However, not all news was bad. Amy appeared before the prince, telling him more supplies had been left for him, even though Davey said he didn't need more medicinal herbs. Amy, however, suggested that someone out there must know about his good nature and was trying to reward him. Davey asked if Amy thought he was a good person. The girl didn't hesitate and replied yes. Despite seeing the prince eliminate someone right in front of her, Amy hadn't changed her opinion about his character. Davey then thought she was truly an incredible person. In the middle of their conversation, someone appeared. It was Besfus, the Grand Chamberlain for the royal family's affiliates. He told the prince he had brought the sinners at the queen's command. Besfus explained that all of them had been stealing palace money, and some even tried to escape but were captured. The prince then asked what the appropriate punishment for such behavior was. The chamberlain replied that normally, the punishment would be the elimination of the sinners and their families. However, it was the prince who would decide their fate. Davey mentioned that rumors about him being bloodthirsty had recently started circulating. He then asked if he should act accordingly. The sinners begged him not to, pleading for their lives to be spared. In response, the prince ordered that the appropriate punishment be applied to all of them, but first, he wanted them imprisoned without food or water for 9 days. Even though this was the queen's order, Davey, despite disliking it, wanted to turn the situation to his advantage. Sometime later, the prince ordered that new servants be hired, but that Amy be kept as his personal assistant, and her salary increased. He also wanted to know if an audience with his father would be permitted. Besfus said no, so the prince asked if it was his father who denied it, or the queen, his wife. The chamberlain couldn't answer, claiming to be merely a messenger. He also asked the prince to be patient, as his request would eventually be granted. Davey said he would keep that in mind. The chamberlain then prepared to leave. Before he left, the protagonist mentioned he had eaten all the food he received, and therefore didn't need the chamberlain to send more medicinal herbs. Besfus, however, claimed not to know what the prince was talking about, suggesting perhaps the prince was simply being blessed by his gentle nature. But he added that someone was outside wanting to visit him, so he wouldn't disturb him further. Despite Besfus denying responsibility for the supplies, the protagonist was certain it was he who was bringing the food and medicinal herbs. After all, Besfus was the head of all the king's staff and had known him forever. He just hadn't known that besides Amy, someone else in the palace was on his side. Anyway, Davey needed to focus on the visit awaiting him. Amy appeared soon after, announcing that the 4th prince and 2nd princess had arrived to visit him. Immediately, the princess entered the protagonist's room. Her name was Winley Alround, and she was overjoyed to see her brother. Her happiness was so great that she jumped on the protagonist, making him fall to the floor. Amy became very worried seeing him in that state, but right after, their brother appeared, saying Winley should be more careful. He was Baris Al-Rome, the 4th prince and Winley's twin brother, and he added that he was also happy to see Davey healthy. The current king, Cryones Al-Rone, had children with 3 women, the current queen, his first mistress Anisha, and his second mistress Alice. While Alice is the queen's perfect support, Anisha chose to remain neutral, becoming an outsider among the others. Baris and Winley are Anisha's children, making them the protagonist's half-siblings. While Baris adopts a more formal and polite demeanor, his sister acts more recklessly. Winley tells her brother not to act so formal all the time, reminding him that he was the one who started whining about wanting to see Davey. As they argue, Amy tries to check if the prince is okay. The protagonist, meanwhile, remembers hearing that the twins were leading a group of thieves. Seeing how unroyal their behavior is, he thinks it might be true. However, they are still his siblings, and they listen to everything he says. And in the protagonist's current situation, that's something he can't ignore. After they sit down to talk, they realize it's been 6 years since their last meeting. The twins were sent to a remote area after Davey fell into a coma. They were only 8 at the time, and could do nothing but obey the orders they received. Furthermore, their mother had sent her first daughter, Dana, to a foreign realm, all because of the current queen's schemes. Anisha couldn't control her other 2 children, and though others don't know it, everything the king's mistresses do is under the queen's supervision. Back to their conversation, the twins mention they've seen their father. Davey asks how the king is doing. Baris replies that despite being tired, their father is well. However, Winley realizes that her brother Davey hasn't even had the chance to meet his own father, and is shocked by this. Anyway, Baris mentions that on his way there, he noticed the palace's conditions weren't up to standard. Davey explains that some people had been stealing his money, but he's already taken care of it and soon everything will return to normal. Even so, Baris insists this is unacceptable. While his brother was in a coma, some decided to rob him, so he plans to ask the king to take action. However, the protagonist asks him not to, claiming everything is already resolved. He'll handle it himself, as he doesn't want to bother the king with such trivial matters. Noticing the growing number of people willing to help him, the protagonist wonders if this is truly happening, or just his imagination. Putting that thought aside, he expresses surprise that Winley has a talent for magic, and asks if they are truly part of an artistic group. Winley explains that her twin would get hurt if it weren't for her, as he always runs around wildly without any coordination. She claims that people like him aren't qualified to participate in any fencing competition. These words genuinely annoy Boris, and once again, the twins start bickering in front of their brother. After they calm down, Winley hands the protagonist a letter explaining that a fencing competition held every 5 years is about to begin. This time, the tournament will take place in the realm of Pisti. Reading the letter, the protagonist recognizes the seriousness of the competition. Boris suggests Davey should take this opportunity to leave the realm, as he's lived his entire life there, and even asked their father about it. However, Winley corrects him, stating that she was the one who made the request, and Davey was personally authorized by the king to go. Besides that, Winley claims that the realm of Pisti is the city of water, so it must be beautiful there. She then declares she wants to accompany him and won't take no for an answer. Given this, the protagonist says he can't refuse a request from his siblings. In that case, he'll travel with them. Davey reflects that he has indeed never been to a foreign realm, and it wouldn't be so bad to enjoy an event like this. What's more, he figures a bit of fun will do him good, and he becomes excited for the event. Meanwhile, in the royal hall, Besfis remarks that Boris will soon turn 14, practically becoming an adult. He adds that the princes must be discussing the fencing tournament right now, but he tells the king not to worry, as the young master has matured. Besfis praises Davey's splendid calmness and perception, expressing surprise at how much the prince has grown. Hearing this, the king says it's enough that even the chamberlain is aware of it, and states that the situation is quite sad. Back with Davey, he stared at a portrait of his mother, filled with admiration. Not just for that, but also because his room was finally organized and no longer looked like a haunted place. With Besfis's help, the new employees had done a quick job, and the palace now had the appearance it deserved. Not only Davey, but Amy too was enchanted by the new decor. She found it very pleasing that things were finally getting back on track. However, Davey wouldn't be staying to enjoy his new room, as he had to travel. Amy confirmed she had already packed everything the prince requested. He then left a bottle in her care and joined the twins to head to the kingdom of Pisti. The Continental Fencing Tournament had long been an event that drew everyone's attention, in addition to holding enormous influence. Alongside Boris's participation, Davey had been permitted to go with them, hoping his brother would achieve victory, thereby shaking Carlos's position. For some reason Davey still didn't know, the queen had agreed to Boris's participation in the competition. Perhaps she didn't believe in his victory, or maybe she was planning something sinister that Davey would have to keep an eye on. Before they departed, the king appeared publicly to bless the journey. Upon being seen by the crowd, he was cheered, for Cryanessa Alron was the ruler they so loved. But for Davey, he saw the king as his supposed father. This was the first time he had seen him since waking from his coma, as for the past 6 months, the king had avoided his own son. The king then asked if Boris was confident. The boy said yes, asserting that he would represent his kingdom very well through his achievements. In turn, the king wished Boris a safe return home. Instead of speaking with the others, the king simply turned his back. But before leaving, he told Davey that it was good to see him healthy. Winley asked if her brother was okay. In his thoughts, Davey replied yes. After all, he didn't want to waste his emotions on the king. Following this, a messenger from the king announced that Prince Boris's participation in the tournament was of great importance, and therefore, there would be no curfew during the event. Davey, for his part, thought the king was truly different. He showed no trace of his former heroic and confident personality. Now, he seemed merely an unkempt old man, as if exhausted by everything and everyone. In any case, the main party set off for the tournament. During the journey, Boris noticed his brother seemed bored and asked if anything was making him uncomfortable. Davey replied no, he just wasn't used to long-distance travels like this. Winley, however, picked up the wine Davey had prepared and suggested it might liven things up during the trip. She said it was the first time she had tasted such a fragrant wine and asked where he had found the bottle. Davey explained that the wine had been left by his mother, adding that she had done so for some reason he still didn't know. Upon hearing this, Boris asked if they should really be drinking something so valuable. Davey replied that this was the best moment for it. After all, they were celebrating. Winley commented that Davey had changed quite a bit, claiming he used to never let go of anything his mother had left behind. Anyway, he said wine wasn't made to be stored but consumed, then proposed a toast to their happiness. Sometime later, they set up camp on the road. Boris said they would continue traveling in the morning, as it would still take about a day to reach their destination. He also mentioned that he had somehow managed to keep Winley settled for now, and the fact that she had drunk too much certainly helped. Boris remembered Davey used to say he wanted to go camping someday, and noted that this was exactly what they were doing now. He also said he had tried to make the departure procession mission as short as possible, imagining it would be taxing for his brother. Davey thought the journey could be faster if they rode horses. Traveling so slowly was testing his patience. Besides, he reflected on the things that had changed and wondered if other shifts had occurred too. Boris, for his part, retired to sleep. Amy approached the prince and asked if he didn't want to rest a bit as well. Davey, however, said the moon was more beautiful than usual. Not only that, but he knew the magic was stronger too and wanted to make the most of it. During the night, someone mentions that the red moon is named Cyrus and the blue one Crius. They also say that Cyrus is called the one who makes the beginning shine, and Crius, the one who illuminates the end. At this, the protagonist remarks that the man knows quite a lot. The man replies that it's common knowledge, as even a big kid would know such things. He also adds that he'd prefer to be having this conversation with a woman. Just then, a colleague approaches the man and asks who he's talking to. The man gets startled, as he thought he was already speaking with his colleague, prompting him to wonder if he'd been talking to a ghost earlier. The protagonist laughs at the situation, realizing he was the ghost in question. Davey had used his abilities to become invisible and had been spying on the guards, noticing that 4 of them were elite expert swordsmen. For now, he believes that if anything important were to happen, they would probably be able to handle it, for example, being attacked in the middle of the night by 20 enemies. The protagonist spotted ninjas from afar, imagining they had probably waited for everyone to fall asleep before attacking. This was likely the queen's plan. After all, it would be an excellent way to get rid of Davey and the groans all at once. The protagonist didn't want to expose himself, precisely to avoid raising any suspicion, but he also knew he couldn't simply ignore the situation. What's more, people who witnessed his power didn't usually live to tell the tale. Even without a proper weapon, the protagonist prepared to fight. He recalled his old master used to say that anything at hand could be used as a weapon. According to Davey, there are no rules in battle. Weapons are an extension of your body, and depending on your creativity, even a piece of cloth can become a unique sword. So, armed with a stick, he leaped into action. Not only that, but he scoffed at his opponents, seeing they weren't very competent at what they did. Just out of curiosity, the protagonist asked if they had been sent by the queen. However, no one spoke to him. In that case, Davey told them that if they weren't going to answer, they could just leave. But knowing well that the queen's hounds wouldn't give up, he then attacked again. While fighting, he pondered what the queen stood to gain by doing this. Eliminating 3 royalties would impact the entire kingdom. Even Liness would face difficulties because of it. Or perhaps she had some other motive behind it. Back in the fight, the protagonist took down a few enemies, and then asked if the others weren't going to try and escape. He also told them he would give them a chance to escape, and tell the queen that Prince Davey would destroy everything she had just for fun. Seeing how strong he was, the enemies decided to retreat. However, the protagonist wouldn't let them escape so easily. He went after the ninjas, telling them they were slow. Not only that, but he took the opportunity to eliminate them, claiming it wasn't so easy to escape his grasp. After eliminating the ninjas, the protagonist once again scoffed at their performance. He remarked that a ninja's greatest virtue was patience, so they should know that. After all, it was a famous saying among them. Then, more ninjas appeared, as they had been hiding. However, the protagonist claimed this tactic was useless against him. He could perceive that one of the ninjas was escaping, while the others had stayed behind in an attempt to delay him. After eliminating the straggling ninjas, Davey commented that they were so useless, they weren't even worth the effort. Besides, he had prepared everything even before the ninjas arrived on the scene. He declared that unless they were on the other side of the continent, no ninja could escape his reach. At this, he launched an attack at the ninja who had fled, and hit him squarely with a magical technique that had no shape, scent, or color, but upon hitting its target, it instantly eliminated their soul. The protagonist himself found it a bit brutal to do this, but his masters had taught him to always finish what he started properly. Not only that, but they had also taught him to show no mercy to those who threatened his life. So he figured a perfect elimination would be an appropriate end for these enemies. Best of all, nobody had seen him in action, so he wouldn't be associated with any of this. Some time later, the queen received news of what had happened. Shirley reported that all the candles she had lit, and which were connected to the lives of her students, had been extinguished. At this, the queen understood that everyone had been annihilated, but she asked, what happened to the targets? Shirley replied that they must have just arrived in the Pisti kingdom. The queen was furious, demanding to know how Shirley had failed to deal with just 3 children and 5 knights. She also declared that the Dark Moon Guild couldn't be as formidable as they claimed. Not only had they failed, but they'd also lost 20 members. Shirley stated that they were still investigating what happened, but all signs pointed to Prince Davey having an accomplice. At this, the queen scoffed, "Who would help that brat?" She ordered Shirley to find out more, declaring she wanted to show this person what happens when someone dares to cross her path. Furthermore, she reminded her servant that the only reason she had agreed to work with Shirley's guild was because they had promised never to fail. Therefore, if such a mistake were to repeat itself, their contract with the guild would be cancelled, and she would use her power as queen to dismantle the guild once and for all. Back with the protagonists, Winley spotted the Pisti kingdom and alerted her brothers. Davey was pleased they had finally arrived. He knew the Water Kingdom was a small city-state. However, its historical buildings and ruins were among the most beautiful on the entire continent. Upon reaching the location, the protagonist took in the view. Judging by his expression, his brother noticed he was happy. Davey confirmed, saying that this was, after all, where the sword-fighting competitions took place. They had a stadium typically used as an arena for battles. The place was very popular, with many fighters and monsters battling for their lives. Winley mentioned that in this edition, 8 participants would represent their respective countries. The protagonist then quickly realized that, in the end, this was nothing more than a battle of national pride. Moreover, only people under 20 years old were participating, making it a competition for newcomers, not established talents. Not only that, but Winley added that the Round Kingdom had sent an idiot to represent them. At this, his brother asked if she shouldn't try to motivate him instead of insulting him. Davey, for his part, thought that Baris's skills were intermediate level, his rank just below a master swordsman, which was impressive for his age. But then, Winley revealed that the representative from the Fallen Kingdom was the famous Sword Princess. The protagonist hadn't known this, and realized a lot had changed during his coma. However, he knew that Elena of Fallen was the only princess of the Fallen Kingdom, as all 9 others were princes, but she was Prince Crown's favorite. Baris mentioned that despite Elena's fame, it wasn't just her skills that made her renowned, for she also possessed the divine sword. Winley explained that this sword was called Calerus, the favorite blade of the sword god, a masterpiece that took 1,000 days to forge. Davey realized it had been some time since he'd heard that name. Hares, the sword god, had been his teacher at the temple. Though lazy, he possessed excellent skills and constantly boasted about his sword, and it was common for him to leave his mark wherever he went, but the feeling was still somewhat strange for Davey. Just then, a young woman passed by him, and something caught his attention. When asked why she stopped, she claimed it was nothing important. At another point, Davey discussed the sword with his siblings, recalling that it possessed a spirit said to have been born from the creator's love for creation. This sword wasn't called divine for nothing, and because of that, he wondered why it had chosen Elena as its next wielder after hundreds of years. Baris added that there was another reason for Elena's fame. He claimed she was one of the continent's 5 immeasurable beauties. Davey, however, didn't believe that was the reason the sword had chosen her. After dinner, he put on an outfit prepared by Amy, then asked if she didn't have something simpler. However, the maid replied that this was the simplest she could find, for even if he wasn't participating in the competition, he was still a prince and needed to conduct himself as such. The night of the festival arrived, and the twins were also ready. Davey complimented his sister's appearance, but Baris told him not to overdo it, as Winley might actually believe him. After that jab, he received a stomp on the foot, and Winley led the protagonist onto the dance floor, inviting him to dance. At the same ball, another princess was asked to dance. However, she was feeling uncomfortable with all the noise. Her companion suggested that this was an event for the new generation to get to know each other, and she should enjoy it. He then asked how her earlier visit to the village had been. The princess replied that it wasn't bad for such a barbaric place. Before the competition, a banquet and a ball were prepared for the nobles to interact. However, the protagonist was only interested in the competition and used the ball to observe the other guests. He noticed that most guests were young, as the competition was restricted to people under 20. Despite this, there were chaperones just like him. By far, Baris was the most popular. Even without trying, he became the center of attention for several girls. Davey thought his brother's skills might be the reason for his popularity. Regardless, he found it interesting that Baris was interacting with others. Not only Baris, but Winley was also drawing a lot of attention. However, Davey wanted to keep his distance and analyze potential opponents. Amidst all this, Baris tried to ask for help to escape the attention, but when he looked for his siblings, they had gone off to dance and left him behind. Davey wished his brother would enjoy his youth and wouldn't do anything to disrupt it. Winley said she never imagined Davey would dance with her someday. She also mentioned that, without realizing it, she had just entered the social hierarchy. Despite this, she was a little upset, claiming that if it weren't for Davey's situation, he could also enter the competition. After all, he was talented with swords too. In response, response, the protagonist said his sister was exaggerating, claiming that even with skill, he couldn't reach an expert's level. However, Winley argued that talent was nothing more than an illusion. If a person didn't work hard, their talent was worthless. Even so, Davey stated that he didn't care much for such things. Instead of attention, he wanted a peaceful life. Hearing this, his sister said he sounded like an old man, but in the middle of their conversation, someone appeared and said this was the most fitting place to reunite with Princess Winley. Immediately, the protagonist stared at the man, wondering who he was. More importantly, he wanted to know where this guy knew Winley from. Winley herself didn't look comfortable at all with this sudden appearance. However, the man pushed the protagonist away from his sister and asked Winley if she would grant him the honor of a private conversation. Winley, however, called him Prince Valentian and said she was in the middle of a conversation with her brother, so she couldn't give him attention at that moment. Valentian, despite not liking to be rejected, formally introduced himself as Valentian du Boltus, the 7th prince of the Boltus kingdom. The protagonist did the same, introducing himself as Davey Alroun. With that, Valentian started a conversation, but the protagonist quickly said he was only there to accompany his siblings. In that case, Valentian wished him a pleasant stay. He then returned to speak with Princess Winley, saying he would very much like to win this competition in honor of her beauty, then asked her to pay attention to the arena during his matches. Winley, however, said he was being rude to the other participants, claiming he would win even before competing. But Valentian asserted that it was rude to only speak the truth. Annoyed, the princess said her twin brother would be participating in the competition, and hearing him say that only proved how much Valentian was underestimating his opponents. She then abandoned the prince and withdrew with Davey. Seeing his sister's attitude, Davey realized she could defend herself. However, he knew very well that the arrogant prince wouldn't let things end there. In turn, Valentian stood up and tried to pull Winley by the arm. Seeing this, the protagonist thought he had been patient enough with this rude individual. He then managed to unbalance the prince and disarm him completely, leaving him without a reaction. Next, Davey said Valentian shouldn't touch his sister like that. He also added that Valentian was lucky he didn't break any bones, so he would be able to participate in the competition without problems. However, this only served to make Valentian even more furious. He removed one of his gloves and threw it at the protagonist's face. With that, he challenged him to a duel. Winley spoke up, saying the prince was overstepping his bounds, Valentian insisted, claiming he was doing this for his honor as a knight. At that moment, another person spoke up, saying Valentian was causing too much of a ruckus for someone who claimed to have honor. It was the princess from before. She stated she had been observing Valentian's situation, and then asked if he truly thought he could recover something he never had. As soon as the protagonist saw the princess, he found her very familiar and was surprised by her presence. Harris, the god of swords, was an ancient hero who founded the Fallen Empire, an empire that eventually became one of the continent's 3 great powers. It is common knowledge that Harris was the first owner of the holy sword Calerus and the founder of the lost claymore sword technique. They say those who mastered this swordsmanship could cause tsunamis with just a single sword strike, but the protagonist finds that a bit much, even for Harris. Back in the present moment, he realizes the princess looks a lot like Harris. However, this is Princess Ileana of the Fallen Empire, the Emperor's treasure. Still, Davey can't stop thinking that she resembles the sword hero too much. Despite being handsome, Harris was always a man, so there's no way he would have disfigured himself to become a woman. But as he thinks this, the princess approaches the protagonist and asks what he just said. Davey apologizes, saying he was just thinking aloud and was mistaken. He then tries to convince her to let it go. Meanwhile, the princess scolds Valentian. The protagonist thinks that Ileana of Fallen has a truly stunning appearance. However, the same can't be said for Valentian, as Davey believes that besides being ugly, the arrogant prince is uncharismatic. For her part, Ileana says that if Valentian truly considers himself an honorable knight, he should apologize to those he offended. Judging by the arrogant prince's face, he has no intention of doing so. The protagonist thinks that regardless of intentions, someone so proud wouldn't apologize easily. In that case, he says he accepts the duel proposed by Valentian. Ileana asks if he's really serious. She claims that this is a meaningless fight and Davey doesn't need to accept it. But the protagonist says that the decision is his to make, and if Valentian hasn't given up on the proposal yet, he accepts to duel him right now. Shortly after, Davey picks up a wooden sword and thinks it's been a while since he used one of these. Boris approaches and tells the protagonist that even though he's strong, his opponent is a tournament competitor. Davey knows this very well, and seeing his distressed siblings, he tries to reassure them both. His opponent takes the opportunity to taunt him, saying that if he's just going to swing a sword like an amateur, he should just give up now and stop worrying his siblings. He also says that if Davey admits defeat and begs on his knees, he might consider forgiving him. Annoyed, Boris tries to defend his brother, but Davey stops him and says that actions speak louder than words. In that case, Valentian claims he won't lose, and since it's impossible for Davey to win in a scenario like this, he would kneel himself and acknowledge his superiority. The protagonist agrees to this proposal, but says he shouldn't chicken out when he loses. Next, Davey thinks about how he's going to handle the fight. After all, in the eyes of others, he's just a weak prince who barely recovered from a coma, so he doesn't want to reveal his true strength in a mere skirmish like this. With that, they begin the fight, but Valentian thinks the protagonist is scared because he thought that Davey would make the first move instead of standing still. After hearing that, the protagonist gets an idea. He charges full force towards his opponent, leaving Valentian quite surprised by this sudden attack. But instead of attacking, Davey intentionally strikes the ground and pretends to let his sword fall from his hands. Not only that, but the sword ends up hitting his opponent's face. While Valentian takes a solid hit, Davey pretends that out of carelessness, he let his weapon slip. However, all of this was part of his plan. He knocked down his opponent without needing to reveal his strength. Not only that, but Valentian feels humiliated because the blow that knocked him down was actually a slip-up by his opponent. And what's more, other people think so too, and quickly comment on how shameful his defeat was. Furious, Valentian gets up from the ground, wanting to eliminate his opponent for good. However, Davey claims that for that, his opponent should train better, because with those poetic skills, he wouldn't be able to eliminate anyone. Valentian attacked the protagonist, trying his absolute hardest to wound him. Yet, he couldn't land a single blow, while Davey, in contrast, wasn't even breaking a sweat. Realizing he was on the verge of defeat, Valentian fell into despair, wondering why he was at such a disadvantage. Mid-frustrated attempt to win, he was struck down, and the crowd watched him fall before his opponent. On top of losing, he had to endure the taunts not only from the protagonist, but also from the rest of the people who had witnessed Valentian lose more than once. Annoyed, he told everyone to shut up, declaring he couldn't stand to hear any more nonsense. Meanwhile, Davey noted that his adversary was more than just defeated. He had been publicly humiliated by the very prince everyone had considered weak until now. The protagonist believed his fencing technique was superior, thanks to his use of the drunken stance. As the name suggests, this fighting style involved deceiving the opponent by pretending not to know what you were doing, just like a drunk. This technique was invented by Dak Go-jun, the greatest drunk in the pantheon of heroes, and also by the Hare, who was interested in creating the most wicked and wretched fencing style. The protagonist knew this because he had met the man himself during his time at the temple. Dak Go-jun used to boast about creating the technique, yet he was also aware of how malicious the style truly was. Davey had always heard that such a technique should only be used against someone who truly deserved it. So, the protagonist knew from the beginning that even its creators considered this technique taboo. Not because the technique was too sharp or strong, but because of how much it could manipulate and deceive an opponent. Therefore, this style wasn't made for self-defense or offense, but rather to completely humiliate an opponent in front of others. The style aimed at an opponent's openings while they attacked, delivering a fatal blow, making it highly effective for that purpose. Thus, the adversary became like a mouse lost in a labyrinth. Not only that, but the more people watching, the worse it was for the technique's target. Exactly what was happening now. After playing around with his opponent for so long, Davey wondered if he was incredibly lucky, or if Valentian was just genuinely terrible. Not only that, but he found using this style immensely enjoyable, feeling it suited him perfectly. Davey believed this style was the best for anyone who wanted to have fun while fighting. Unlike him, his opponent wasn't having fun at all. Furious, Valentian manifested his powers, intent on eliminating Davey from the face of the earth. Benedis declared it was just a friendly training match, asking if Valentian had gone crazy for using his powers. However, the protagonist had left his adversary with no alternatives. Thinking about this, Davey figured that if he got out of this attack, he couldn't just use luck as an excuse. Besides, he knew he'd been watched ever since the duel began. Valentian, for his part, seized the opportunity and charged fiercely at the protagonist. But just as he tried to strike, he was taken by surprise, as Davey dodged the attack once more. Not only did he surprise his adversary, but he also managed to turn the situation to his advantage, unbalancing Valentian and sending him to the ground. In this way, the arrogant prince realized Davey's superiority, but in turn, the protagonist tried to play it down for the public, pretending he had simply tripped and by sheer luck disarmed his opponent. The people's reaction was one of contempt for Prince Valentian, and regardless, this secured Davey's victory in the duel. Questions were raised about the duel. People wondered if Valentian had always been as pathetic as he'd appeared today, and if Prince Davey was truly the same person who had recently been in a coma. Davey justified himself, saying he could barely hold his sword properly, which made him unbalanced, but luck was on his side. Hearing this, Winley remarked that her brother must have used up all his luck that very day. But what was a great show for some was a complete waste of time for Ileana. She found what she witnessed quite stupid, so she turned her back and left. Davey noticed this and concluded that the princess was quite cold. Sometime later, Davey was reprimanded by his brothers. Not only had he been irresponsible, but he had also caused quite a commotion. Davey defended himself, saying that everything turned out fine in the end, and there was no point stressing over what had happened. Benedis argued that Davey was lucky because his opponent had a truly explosive personality, and it could have very well ended in a fatality. He mentioned that the twins had previously encountered Valentian and witnessed his skills firsthand, and after that, Valentian had started pursuing Winley. While they agreed that Valentian probably wouldn't try anything with Winley again, Benedis warned Davey not to try something like that again, as luck might not always be on his side. In response, Davey took his brother's hand and squeezed it. After demonstrating his strength, he told Benedis not to treat him like a sick patient. He promised to heed his younger brother's advice and stay out of trouble anyway. Davey thought that sooner or later his brothers would discover his true strength, so he figured it was better not to hide it from them anymore. Winley felt more relieved knowing that Davey was strong enough to protect himself. Besides, he had caught his opponent off guard while Valentian was trying to balance the weight of his sword. Even Davey himself was surprised by his opponent's humiliating defeat. Speaking of him, Valentian was still furious. He smashed objects in his chambers to vent his anger, while his servants tried to calm him down. Valentian declared that he was the next prince of the Baldi's era, and he would not tolerate being shamed in front of the other nobles. After all, he wanted to project an image of a radiant figure with exceptional talents. Moreover, there were few things in the world he didn't have access to, making practically everything within his grasp. That's why Valentian had fallen in love with Princess Winley and chosen her to be his future wife, because besides her beauty, she also had an expert swordsman brother of a medium level, and he would become a subordinate through this marriage. On top of all that, Valentian had already arranged everything with Queen Roun and had the entire plan mapped out, which only increased his certainty of success. But now, an obstacle had appeared in his path, and above all, his credibility had gone down the drain. Consequently, Valentian's fury was more intense than ever, and as he destroyed everything around him, he felt an immeasurable desire to eliminate Davey for humiliating him. But as he voiced this idea, a voice asked if this was truly Valentian's desire. Surprised by the sudden voice, he asked who was speaking. A feminine presence manifested and told the prince she could help him fulfill his wish. Still confused, the prince asked who he was speaking to. The woman introduced herself as Shariel and told him to remember that name. Then she approached the prince, asking Valentian to trust her, because only then could he achieve his desire. Sometime later, the day of the tournament finally arrived. Amy informed Davey that his brother was about to enter the arena. He seemed excited, but not for the fight itself. He said he still had a long way to go. The maid asked what he was referring to. Davey claimed he was just thinking out loud and said he was ready to go, as other things could wait. Benedis, for his part, was already in position. Winley watched the match from the stands. Not only her, but the entire arena eagerly awaited the fight. However, Benedis' opponent was none other than Valentian, who, after what had happened last time, had no intention of losing again. The protagonist arrived at the arena. Seeing how excited everyone was, he thought the energy of the place was incredible. He was grateful that Benedis' match was in the afternoon. Not only did he not want to watch the morning fights, but he also felt unwell. When he met up with Winley again, she asked if her brother was feeling better. Davey preferred to keep his physical condition private. He mused that he had completed the mana circle at a very young age, which gave him the power to defeat much stronger opponents. However, his transformation wasn't fully complete, and sometimes, after overusing his abilities, he'd get indigestion. So he figured if this kept up, he'd have to use his sacred powers to cure his stomachache. Soon after, Benedis entered the arena. As he was cheered, the protagonist noticed his brother's popularity. Up until then, he hadn't known who his brother's opponent was. But as soon as he saw Valentian enter the arena, he found it highly ironic that the same opponent would face two key figures from Roun. Besides, he'd imagined a fight like this would take much longer to happen. Before the match began, the judge announced that the blades were blunt, making it forbidden to use mana on the swords to injure or threaten an opponent. Staring at his brother, Davey said that the audience's opinion was no joke. Winley worried about her twin, thinking he might get hurt if he got too carried away. However, the protagonist reassured her, saying Benedis was no rookie, so he didn't fear for his safety. Therefore, he believed nothing bad would happen. Back to the fight, the judge asked the competitors to step forward. Then, some mages created a magic barrier around the arena. Valentian, who hadn't said a word until now, remained focused. Not only him, but Benedis was also taking this very seriously. With that, the judge authorized the start of the fight, and both adversaries charged forward. Judging by the duel against the same opponent, the protagonist concluded that Valentian was unpredictable with a sword. Benedis, on the other hand, used strength to deal massive damage to his opponent, and comparing their styles, his brother had a better chance of winning. Furthermore, the protagonist believed Valentian likely wouldn't be able to withstand Benedis' heavy attacks. However, the opposite happened. When attacked, Valentian didn't dodge. He chose to block the blow, defying all expectations about him. Seeing this, some people concluded the fight would be more interesting than they'd imagined. In turn, the protagonist thought Valentian hadn't acted like this during their duel, and improving literally overnight was impossible. Even a genius would take time to master certain physical abilities. Still, he believed that if Benedis kept attacking, sooner or later the opponent would reach his limits and tire out. Even trying to analyze the situation coolly, the protagonist had a feeling that something was wrong. Not only him, but Winley said she had never seen Benedis move so fast. She thought that if her brother had improved, she would have to work harder too. Davey also noticed his brother's improvement. Since he was little, Benedis had dreamed of being a knight. After 6 years, the protagonist could see his brother's evolution. After all, he had dedicated himself to it. However, he knew little about his opponent. Seeing Valentian fight so differently than before, Davey thought he was practically facing another person. He had felt this strange sensation before, as if something dangerous was about to happen. Noticing her brother's discomfort, Winley asked if Davey was okay. Back in the fight, Benedis analyzed his adversary. He hadn't expected Valentian to counterattack his longsword. He admired his opponent's persistence, and despite his strange movements, he knew he couldn't drop his guard. Instead of waiting to be attacked, he wanted to end the fight at once, so he prepared his strongest blow. But as he unleashed his attack against his adversary, Valentian stood still, waiting to be attacked on purpose, and saw the sword very close to his face. Benedis didn't understand why his adversary acted this way. However, he diverted his own attack at the last second. After all, he couldn't injure him, or he'd be punished by the organizers. With that, he tried to attack again, but in a way that wouldn't hurt his opponent. However, it was all part of Valentian's strategy. Before Benedis could attack again, he channeled his mana into his sword, and even knowing it was against the competition rules, he put Benedis' life in danger. The night before, Benedis had practiced a lot, not wanting to lose the competition. Then, Davey appeared to talk to his brother, claiming he couldn't sleep because of him. Davey mentioned that Winley was already asleep and asked why Benedis wasn't doing the same. His brother replied that he couldn't sleep, which led him to practice a bit. Benedis also admitted he felt uncertain about the upcoming combat, yet he still believed he would win. Davey encouraged his brother, assuring him he wouldn't lose and had no reason to worry. Observing Benedis' structured mana flow, Davey noticed his brother possessed a gentle and smooth mana. He even considered giving his brother a boost. While it would be a scandal if people found out, Davey was willing to take that risk. So he asked Benedis to stop for a moment, saying he seemed a little tense and offered to massage his shoulders. However, during the massage, Davey took the opportunity to lend his brother some of his own mana, warning him that the process would hurt a little. Immediately, Benedis felt as if his entire body was in shock. Davey explained that this was likely due to Benedis staying up all night instead of sleeping, and advised him to get more rest. Meanwhile, Davey mused that the technique worked by activating the recipient's mana, creating a chain reaction that forced a greater flow of mana throughout their body. He knew that despite its seemingly simple nature, this method required an experienced practitioner and was forbidden in most places. Come to think of it, Davey once heard of a place where the technique wasn't forbidden, and they even gave excellent massages. As the process concluded, Davey uttered a magical word. Surprised, his brother asked what language it was, but Davey just continued without answering. Once he was done, his brother was on the floor, his body unable to withstand the sudden surge of extra mana. Davey figured this wouldn't directly help Benedis in the upcoming battle, but it would certainly certainly help his brother evolve faster. However, he couldn't let Benedis just sleep there. It wouldn't be good, even if it did offer more security. Benedis complained that his brother should treat him better, stating that if it were Winley, Davey would be carrying her on his back. Davey denied this, but told Benedis to go to sleep immediately, or else he'd give him another much more intense massage. Benedis didn't think twice and darted to his room. Satisfied that his brother would now be safer, Davey also retired for the night. Back in the present, the moment Benedis was struck by his opponent's magic, the shield his brother had given him activated, protecting him. It immediately repelled Valentian's sword away, stopping him from continuing his attempt to injure Benedis. The crowd noticed that Valentian's sword wasn't normal. On top of that, they also saw a mana shield protecting Benedis. From the VIP box, Winley cheered, celebrating her brother overcoming his opponent. But when she glanced to the side, Davey wasn't in his seat. Inside the arena, even with the shield, Benedis was still injured. The mages immediately ended the fight and removed Valentian. Not only was he disqualified for violating the rules, but he was also punished. The organizers declared that his actions could even spark a war between nations, and promptly sent a notification to the nation of Voltus. Valentian's servant tried to convince them not to proceed, begging his prince to say something. However, Valentian grabbed the servant by the neck and, in an exaggerated display of strength, exploded the poor man's head in front of the horrified crowd. This act, of course, left everyone utterly shocked. After all, no one expected to see a prince publicly execute one of his own servants. What's more, they all thought Valentian had completely lost his mind, and in a way they weren't wrong. Ever since his encounter with Chariot, Valentian hadn't been the same. Seeing the madness that erupted in the arena, some people started fleeing the scene. Prince Valentian had gone mad and was on the verge of a complete breakdown. The organizers knew they had to do something, but realized it wouldn't be easy to contain someone in that state. That's when the protagonist stepped forward. He went over to his younger brother and told him the match was over, and he'd done incredibly well. Benedis mentioned he had created a mana barrier. The protagonist then gave a proud smile. He knew that a mana barrier was a high-level mana ability, protecting its creator from harm. Davey had placed a barrier on his brother as a safeguard, but the main reason Benedis was safe was due to his own growth. Even though Benedis was only 14, it was something anyone would be proud of. Despite his immaturity, he clearly had a lot of potential. Davey had expected his brother to cry and complain about the pain, but Benedis had surprised him. Nevertheless, he told Benedis that he had done enough, and it was now time to rest. Benedis was then carried out of the arena on a stretcher. Meanwhile, on the other side of the arena, a problem was still unfolding. Valentian was causing immense chaos, something the protagonist had to resolve. Some mages tried to contain the mad prince, but even using magical attacks, they couldn't handle the situation. Valentian's mind and body were visibly altered. Not only that, but he was far stronger than the mages could cope with. So, they tried to evacuate people while the magical barrier was still intact. However, at that very moment, the protagonist arrived in the arena, surprising the mages who were already there. They urged Davey not to get closer, warning him that the opponent was too strong. Even Winley, seeing the protagonist in the arena, grew worried about him, especially since she hadn't even seen him move to get there. Despite this, the protagonist wanted to deal with the situation. He noticed that Valentian had been infected with something, and remarked that it looked like the enemy had truly taken hold. He then started thinking about how he would deal with him. Valentian grew even more furious upon seeing Davey. As he charged towards the protagonist, the mages tried to stop the prince. However, they couldn't handle the crazed opponent. Valentian then had a clear path to Davey, but then Winley suddenly appeared in the arena, worried about her brother. The protagonist was caught by surprise by her appearance. After all, this wasn't part of his plans. The last thing he wanted was to involve his younger sister. However, Winley wasn't the only one to show up. Ileana arrived right after, pushing the protagonist away from the enemy. Davey definitely hadn't expected this. Up until then, Ileana hadn't even been seen in the arena. She had seemingly appeared out of nowhere. Not only that, but she arrived with the clear intention of eliminating the enemy. Valentian, by this point, wasn't thinking straight and was merely following his fighting instincts, but Ileana knew what she was doing. She unleashed an attack called the Great Mountain Divider, and upon hitting the enemy, she sent him flying. Seeing this, Davey was truly amazed. It was the first time he was seeing Ileana in action. After attacking the enemy, Ileana thought the situation was resolved, but she was surprised to see Valentian still standing. Even though her attack was above average, Valentian wasn't seriously hurt. Not only that, but he looked even more bloodthirsty. But before he could do anything, Ileana launched her attack, striking him from several different directions, aiming to incapacitate him once and for all. She continuously attacked with her blade and hand to hand. Taking advantage of the enemy enduring her blows, Ileana didn't hold back any energy during the fight. Seeing her fight with such energy, some spectators were left speechless. Ileana thought she had finally succeeded. Valentian was seemingly down and unconscious, so she ordered the guards to arrest him for his actions. Winley tried to pull Davey away from the arena, telling him to let Ileana handle everything. Meanwhile, Davey admired Ileana's energy and understood that she was much better than most other swordsmen. However, Ileana saw something others hadn't noticed and called Valentian a vampire. Davey didn't quite understand, but Ileana moved towards the enemy. Even chained, Valentian could move, and with that, he inflicted damage upon himself. Davey observed the enemy's actions from afar, yet he could still perceive what he was doing. Ileana tried to stop the enemy from doing this, but she couldn't get close in time. Because of that, Valentian conjured a blood tide, and those who were close to the attack were the first to fall. Amidst the blood mist, Davey tried to protect his sister. Winley wasn't feeling well, but instead of worrying about herself, she showed concern for Davey. Trying to reassure her, Davey said everything would be all right. He then got up from the ground and asked her to rest for a bit, claiming that when she woke up, she'd think it was all just a bad dream. As soon as he put his sister into an induced sleep, Davey thought it was time to act. Otherwise, things could quickly get worse with this necromantic mana in the air. He was the only one who understood what was happening. Not only that, but he believed that when someone connects with their own mana, their powers start to develop their own personalities. But he had 3 different powers, and each behaved in different ways. Necromantic mana was basically a psychopath, making it the most effective to use. On the other hand, regular mana was a tsundere. Even though it seemed difficult to handle, once it developed trust, it worked with the user's will. And finally, there was the most stubborn of all, holy power. This power had no intention of listening to anyone and also had a lazy personality. Therefore, if there wasn't a significant commotion, holy power wouldn't manifest. However, this was commotion enough. Because of this, Davey received the Radiant Blessing, a 4th level holy magic. Now that Winley should be fine for a while, he had time and space to think. He concluded that the enemy had used the Blood Tide, a power that steals the life essence from living beings in the surrounding area. The bad news was that Davey didn't have enough power to save everyone in the arena, but he was happy that Benedis had left earlier. And now that no one was watching, he could handle the situation calmly, without having to worry about hiding his abilities. However, to Davey's surprise, Ileana was awake and still had the strength to get up. After all, a proud warrior like her wouldn't give up so easily. Davey considered this the worst possible situation. He hadn't imagined anyone else could remain conscious in the blood tide besides himself. But seeing Ileana de Farron standing, he realized there was indeed a reason she was the new owner of the divine sword. However, Davey could only think about how beautiful Ileana looked, even when tired. He approached the princess, and as he touched her shoulders, she flinched slightly. Davey tried to talk to her, asking if she was all right. But despite their perilous situation, Ileana tried to keep him at arm's length. The monster was still on the loose, and Davey only wanted to help. Noticing her resistance, he told her that if she felt well enough, she should leave. But Ileana grabbed Davey by the arm and asked how he wasn't feeling unwell. Davey realized he was cornered. He'd expected Ileana to suspect something, but not to be confronted about it right away. So he decided to play dumb, claiming he didn't know why he hadn't been affected by the mist. Ileana's expression clearly showed she didn't believe his lame excuse, though Davey privately thought she should be thanking him for not dying. Regardless, Ileana took the lead in the fight, telling him to get out of the arena and leave the rest to her. She insisted it was a situation someone like Davey couldn't handle, adding that he'd only gotten lucky in his last duel, and luck wouldn't help him now. Ileana clearly saw Davey as just another helpless prince, believing herself to be far different. She possessed strength and knowledge, knowing full well that the blood demons mentioned in ancient texts were, in fact, vampires. She told Davey he must have heard about them, emphasizing that luck wouldn't be enough against such an enemy. After all, anyone who couldn't sense or manipulate mana would be ripped to shreds in a matter of seconds. Davey pointed out that the enemy wouldn't let anyone leave the arena without a fight. Ileana then declared she would provide cover for his escape. Davey noticed that Ileana exuded a great deal of confidence. However, for some reason, she seemed more emotional than she had been during their duel, almost as if she were facing her arch-enemy. A flashback revealed a glimpse into Ileana's past. Once as a child, she woke up in the middle of the night and went searching for her mother. But when she found her, her mother was sucking blood from another person. Even though she was quite young, little Ileana knew it was a vampire. After that, she never forgot what she saw. Back in the present, facing the enemy, she thought that all vampires still alive in this world must be eliminated. As long as she lived, that would be her objective. But just as she was about to attack, Davey pulled her hair, stopping her. He apologized, but then told Ileana not to interfere in his business. Davey still didn't know why the princess was so obsessed with vampires. However, he was no longer concerned about maintaining his disguise and prepared to fight the enemy. Contrary to what the princess believed about him, Davey actually possessed a great deal of knowledge about vampires. He'd learned about them during his training and probably knew more than Ileana. Plus, he had already faced several vampires before, gaining extensive practical experience. In fact, fighting yet another vampire was almost tedious for him. As he dodged the enemy, he muttered that it seemed to have gotten much dumber compared to their last duel, but Davey wasn't there just to defend himself or dodge. He also intended to attack and eliminate his adversary. With that, he landed a blow that struck at the enemy's very heart. This was an application of the celestial demonic arts, an ability known as demonic blood explosion. After being hit, the enemy not only felt the impact, but was also hurled across the arena. Seeing this left Ileana truly impressed. After all, someone she had judged to be weak had just unleashed an extraordinary display of power. After seeing what just happened, Ileana wondered what that was. Seeing the protagonist use his powers, the princess doubted if it was even humanly possible. Until then, she believed Davey was just an ordinary person, incapable of sensing mana, but she had just seen him destroy a statue while attacking a vampire with her own eyes. It was something even knights and mages would struggle to do. Even she, with her sword, couldn't pull off something like that. This made her wonder if Davey really was just a prince who recently woke up from a coma. The protagonist extended his hand to Ileana, but she recoiled in fear. Even so, he insisted on the gesture. Thinking the prince wanted to help her up, Ileana decided to accept his kindness. However, just as she was about to touch his hand, Davey asked to borrow Ileana's sword. She then realized he wasn't being chivalrous at all and felt embarrassed for jumping to conclusions. Anyway, she told him her sword had broken when she tried to hit Valentian the first time, but Davey said he wasn't referring to that sword, but the one she wore as a necklace. He added that he'd need a very sturdy weapon to face the enemy. Davey tried to convince the divine sword to lend him its powers. The protagonist knew that Surtur, the celestial blacksmith, had dedicated his life to creating countless weapons, including the sword that saved the world. Even broken weapons were renewed in Surtur's hands, transforming into immeasurable treasures. Surtur's fame had spread across the entire continent. In particular, his 12 infamous swords were scattered throughout the land and regarded as national treasures. But among them, one was the blacksmith's favorite, the sword Calerus, the White Guardian. Although it was one of the 12 swords Surtur created, this one held special value. Calerus was on a level above the others, as it was forged for a friend of the blacksmith named Heresi, the god of the sword, who poured his own life force into the weapon. This resulted in the sword having its own ego and making conscious decisions, which fascinated some people when they learned about it. However, the protagonist knew the sword's true nature because he had met Heres, and knowing Heres's personality, he knew the sword wasn't easy to handle. Immediately, Calerus asked who the protagonist thought he was to just grab it like that. At that, Davey realized the weapon was acting exactly as expected. Since the sword was shrunken, Davey ironically asked if Calerus was capable of anything more than screaming like a madman. He added that they'd get along much better if the sword just agreed to work with him. At the same moment, the princess went up to the protagonist asking for her sword back. Davey then said that if Calerus kept refusing to fight by his side, Ileana would suffer. Besides that, the protagonist was impressed that even without the sword's power, the princess managed to stand firm amidst the fog, realizing how strong she truly was. However, despite her strength, he judged the enemy as someone Ileana couldn't possibly face and thought it best for her to recognize her limitations before doing something foolish. Amidst all this, despite the state of its guardian, the sword still refused to help. The protagonist then realized he'd have to do it the hard way. He immediately invoked the sword's powers, making it manifest in its true form. Seeing the sword in its true form, the protagonist remarked that Calerus seemed to be just as the rumors claimed. Calerus in turn asked how he managed to do that. Davey said all the sword needed to do was lend him its powers during the fight and leave the rest to him. Next, Davey combined his skills with the divine sword and began calling down lightning from the sky. After that, Davey asked the enemy how much longer he would keep hiding. He saw a rift in front of him and declared it was time for the villain to show himself. But upon seeing a mere bat flying toward him, he said he'd expected more from a vampire. After all, he thought he was dealing with an advanced species. At that, the small bat transformed into a female vampire. Davey then said he already knew her, calling the vampire Miss Maid, confirming she was surely the queen's servant. Seeing him, the vampire woman said she had thought someone was backing the prince when her subordinates were taken out, but now she realized he had acted alone. Sarcastic, Davey tells her he's really amazing, but he tells her not to be shy and to come closer, because he can't stand having to look up all the time anymore. Not only that, but he adds that if she stays up high for too long, she might end up revealing more than she intends. Shirley, in her vampiric form, becomes incredibly irritated by these provocative comments. However, this was exactly what the protagonist wanted. Immediately after, he launches an attack with his divine sword. The vampire woman in turn warns that if Davey causes a catastrophe, the queen will not hold herself responsible. Relations with the Voltese kingdom could be severed, potentially leading to battles between kingdoms. The protagonist realizes that by revealing her true form, the enemy is likely confident she'll defeat him. However, he asserts that her plan won't succeed. His arrogance irritates the vampire even further. At that moment, she finally decides to attack the protagonist. She uses her vampiric magic for this, and this magic destroys everything it touches as it spreads. Even so, Davey manages to dodge and tells his adversary not to get so agitated. However, his words have the opposite effect. As a result, the vampire then hurls spikes at the protagonist. He leaps from the pillar he was on, but he realizes the spikes have also reached him there and narrowly miss him. Davey manages to dodge as many spikes as possible while falling until he finally lands on the ground, and like a skilled swordsman, he deflects the attacks with his blade. At this, the vampire woman admits he has exceeded her expectations, yet she asserts that despite his strength, Davey is still only human. The protagonist points out that his adversary shouldn't hate humans so much. After all, she serves a human. Deeply irritated, the vampire's patience finally runs out after so many provocations. Davey, however, argues that this is a trait of vampire lords. After all, they are as irritating as they are strong. Not only that, but they are also one of the strongest species, born with immense power, and upon awakening, they become leaders. If it weren't for their natural enemy, the Great Elf, they would be impossible to defeat. A flashback reveals that in the protagonist's past, the sword god had revealed he used to irritate vampires before striking them. This tactic destabilized his adversaries, making them easier to handle. He also revealed that vampires were especially proud, so the higher their rank, the easier it was to wound their egos. Back in the present, the protagonist muses that the Farron Empire held great faith in Harisi, and he wonders how they would react if they knew Harris's true nature. Then, the protagonist returns to the fight. After dodging a few enemy attacks, he counterattacks with his sword. However, the vampire uses a magic shield to defend herself. Not only that, but she doesn't employ just any ordinary defense. Instead, it's a blood shield. Calerus remarks that he's likely facing a countess. Although her rank isn't very high, she's a pureblood and could easily challenge a lord. Hearing this, the protagonist declares that there's no alternative but to defeat her right now. Calerus, however, questions if he can truly do what he says. Davey replies yes, and then asks if the sword itself is afraid. Before he can hear the answer, he is attacked. Shirley states that people who pretend to be calm in situations like this always meet the same end. She adds that the girl who received the divine sword, despite her strength, lost consciousness. Furthermore, she intends to defeat the prince and leave him minimally intact, as she needs to present his body as proof of her efficiency. She then attacks Davey, but the protagonist has no intention of making things easy for his enemy. Not only that, but instead of standing still and waiting to be hit, he advances directly towards his adversary. Witnessing Davey's actions, the vampire woman claims it's sheer foolishness and tries to strike him once more. However, the protagonist not only dodges the attack, but also manages to get behind the vampire. He takes the opportunity to scoff at his adversary, claiming she knows nothing, especially when it comes to swordsmanship. The protagonist reflects that swordsmanship is an art that goes far beyond simply swinging a sword repeatedly, and drawing upon all his training, he uses Calerus's skill against the enemy, sending her into despair as she realizes she cannot dodge it. She is immediately struck squarely and crashes to the ground like a meteor entering the atmosphere. After the attack, the surrounding scenery changed so much that the protagonist himself was amazed by what he had done. Calerus tried to say something about his past, but Davey interrupted him. He said that thousands of years had passed since Calerus's creation, so he didn't want to hear his whole story. Ultimately, instead of talking, he truly wanted to end this fight. The protagonist thought that even if he wanted to, the sword wouldn't believe he was a disciple of its first owner. Calerus realized that the vampire had decided to flee. Davey said it wasn't a good idea to follow her now. The sword remarked that even for it, this tide of blood was nauseating. Fortunately, the mist would no longer spread, as the explosion had shattered its source. However, there were still bloodstones remaining in the area. The protagonist knew that people affected by the tide of blood usually died or became infected. If these infected weren't eliminated, they would infect others. For now, the mist was confined to the arena. If it wasn't fully contained, it could spread outside and cause panic. With that, Calerus told the protagonist he was lucky not to have been hit by something so corrosive, noting that despite his youth, he was clearly skilled. Davey replied that, in a way, that was true. Furthermore, he knew it would take some time until he could awaken the blade's aura, as his strength hadn't formed through a common method like other people's. When someone possesses wisdom and proficiency, combined with a certain level of skill, that person becomes a master. The protagonist was one such individual. Moreover, the sword was beginning to realize this, as it felt a bit of his immeasurable power. Not only that, but Calerus noticed the protagonist possessed both dark mana and sacred powers, and was surprised, having never met anyone like that before. Davey stated that he usually broke paradigms, but Calerus called him crazy for achieving such a result. However, the protagonist told Calerus that this was actually just the result of hundreds of years of research, but now he didn't want to talk anymore, as he still had unresolved matters to attend to, and since he couldn't do what was needed alone, he allowed Calerus to help him. Davey thought he didn't want to sacrifice himself for the sake of others, but if it helped him regain his powers, then it might be worth it. Even if this wasn't his usual style, he was willing, considering the results he imagined he could achieve. Next, he began to pray to the goddess Freya, interceding for those who had been struck by the tide of blood. Not only that, but he asked the goddess to do something about it, claiming he couldn't do it alone. Upon hearing the prayer, Calerus asked if that was how one requested help from a deity. Not only that, but he noticed the protagonist wasn't accustomed to doing such things. Davey had been affected by Daphne's sanctity, and learned that the foundation of his power wasn't the faith that supported the gods, but rather the understanding of that very faith. To be exact, it wasn't about receiving the gods' love, but their curiosity. Since some were wounded, he intended to use the sword to save them. Therefore, he only asked Freya for permission to do so. Indignant, Calerus declared that no deity would listen to such a poorly made prayer. However, Davey countered that the sword knew nothing about the gods. He claimed that the gods' love wasn't given to those who called themselves devout, but rather to those who acted to receive divine curiosity. As Calerus had said earlier, nothing could be done about the life force absorbed from people. Thus, the only alternative was to fill the crystal with an even greater power. He was referring to the greatest form of sacred magic, used only with divine blessing, created by Saint Daphne, who wielded the most powerful sacred magic of all time. And he claimed that gods liked crazy people, especially those who were completely out of the ordinary. Immediately afterward, sacred magic manifested from the heavens. It struck Calerus and the protagonist. The sword was utterly surprised by this, as it was a rank 9 power. Not only that, but it thought it couldn't resist such immense power, and it claimed the protagonist was trying to destroy it. But in reality, it was the opposite. Since he couldn't receive so much power himself, the protagonist used the sword as a receptacle, and now he intended to use this magic to heal the inner arena. Not only that, but the power was so strong that people far from the arena could see a strong, shimmering light. It shone brighter than the sun. Moreover, the protagonist was embraced by celestial wings, and his wounds were healed instantly. Furthermore, the dark magic crystal shattered, and with it, evil dispersed. Davey remarked that the explosion was so strong, he felt like he'd been run over. He also teased the divine sword, saying it had survived after all, but added that it must be quite exhausted. However, despite wanting to maintain control, the protagonist felt something in his back and began to lose strength. As he fell to the ground, something appeared before him. Davey could somehow see his own attributes, like in a system window, and noticed that some things had changed. He also noticed he'd been nicknamed a crazy person, and wondered if Freya wasn't exaggerating with that description. From above, the being he believed to be Freya simply offered a gentle smile, as she had, in a way, seen something interesting in the protagonist. A while later, as he tried to remember what had happened, he wondered when was the last time he'd had such a deep sleep. For the past 6 months, he hadn't been able to sleep without worrying about something. Somehow, he felt this sleep had helped clear his mind a little. Waking up, he found himself facing Winley. She told him Davey had been taken to a lodging in the Phyllis Duchy and asked how he was feeling. After getting up, he asked how long he had slept. His sister replied that he'd been out cold for 2 days, and she'd been so worried, thinking he might never wake up. At this, Davey realized his sister had been truly worried about him, and considering what had happened the last time he'd passed out, it wasn't surprising. Then, Winley mentioned she'd had a strange dream where she was in a red mist, and her brother had saved her, but she was doubtful about it, so she asked her brother what really happened that day. Winley also mentioned that while she was examining Davey, she'd discovered something, a mark on his back, which she identified as a stigma, about about 3 handspans long, large enough that it couldn't be ignored. In a way, this surprised him, but he soon realized that the pain he'd felt earlier was this very stigma being etched onto his back. This had never happened before. However, he knew Freya was responsible and wondered if she really needed to draw such a large stigma on his body. Winley explained that, in fact, it was the priest who treated him who discovered the stigma. Not only him, but the entire duchy knew about it, and chaos was erupting outside. Furthermore, when Davey was found, not only had the mist disappeared, but the surrounding sacred energy was concentrated on him. He thought that a stigma meant a deity had granted a person their love, and the good thing was that only this information had leaked out about him. Winley, however, wanted to understand better what had happened to her brother. He was unsure whether to tell her his secret or not, because he knew what would happen if he did, and if something big occurred now, it would make his journey more difficult. In that case, he decided to withhold the information and simply said he'd fainted before seeing anything, so he couldn't say what happened. Although that didn't make much sense, Winley decided to trust her brother, but asked if he was in pain. Thinking about it, he concluded that he was better than ever, because in addition to invoking the 9th sacred magic onto the sword, he had also increased his own sacred powers. And the result couldn't have been better. His mana capacity had increased considerably. With this, all 3 of his powers had improved, and he could now create an aura blade, worthy of a true master swordsman. Of course, sacred magic was the power that had evolved the most among the 3. However, by extension, the others had also improved, as if from the stigma's effect. Nevertheless, Davey lamented that to get stronger, he always had to go through extreme experiences like this one. Winley told him he had no idea of the craziness that had happened while he was asleep, especially when his maid, Amy, discovered what occurred and was worried about him. His sister added that besides the maid, Princess Ileana had also come looking for him and wanted to take him to her kingdom, claiming she could give Davey more proper treatment there. He thanked his sister for her concern and care, but said she must be exhausted so she should rest and he would do the same. Before leaving, Winley told Davey he didn't need to worry about Benedis, as he had left the arena as soon as the tournament was cancelled and was out of danger. And despite the current commotion, she hoped Davey would recover soon. As soon as his sister left him alone, Davey checked the status window that had appeared with his mark again. He noted that it looked like a game, and despite not fully understanding the nature of this system, he concluded that it could only be Freya's doing. He still didn't know if it had appeared because of his prayer or a mere consequence of using divine magic, but he thought it didn't matter much right now. Then, a voice spoke to him. It said he could pretend to put up a barrier over it, but knew he was already accustomed to being able to peek at someone else's status. Immediately, Davey was startled and asked where that came from. He said it was very bold to try to deceive his senses and approach in such a way, but he promised he would find out who was behind it. Immediately afterward, the being whose voice it was manifested itself and told him to look down. The entity said it was embarrassing to think that someone would be able to break her seal, but if that was divine will, she had no reason to go against it. A flashback showed a moment when he discovered the sword god's talent for art. He wondered whose portrait Harisi was painting. After looking for a moment, judging by the horns on its head and the red pupils in its eyes, he concluded that it could only be the portrait of a demon. Not only that, but judging by its appearance, he deduced that this demon appeared to be very strong. Besides, with so many details in the portrait, Davey deduced that Haris knew this demon very well, as that was the only way he could remember so many details. In turn, Haris said that this demon was beautiful. None of the girls in paradise could compare to her in terms of beauty. Her name was Perselk, but all that remained of her now were the memories her father carried. Because when he was still human, he adopted Perselk as his daughter and taught her swordsmanship. But by irony of fate, he had to eliminate his own daughter and sealed her away with the goal of ending a war. Because of this, Perselk von Faran became known as the Demon Queen of the Abyss. Back in the present, upon seeing the Demon Queen of the Abyss, he immediately recognized her. Noticing this, Perselk said his eyes never disappointed her. Seeing him in shock, she asked what Davey was thinking. He just said that Perselk was smaller than he had imagined. A while later, Davey tied Perselk up. She said this reception was very rude, claiming that unlike humans, such things didn't interest her. Davey, however, told her this was no joke. Perselk replied that since it was their first meeting, she didn't understand why she was being treated so hostilely, as there was no reason for it. Not only that, but she was also curious about how she could have a symbiotic relationship with someone so rude. Davey didn't understand what she was referring to, so Perselk explained she was talking about the mark on his back, which was meant meant to be a vessel where her soul would be deposited. Davey immediately understood why the mark was so large. Everything made more sense now, as the symbol was actually a seal designed to imprison a demon king. After explaining, Perselk asked to be freed, reiterating that she disliked such situations and felt uncomfortable and undignified being in that position. Davey then released Perselk from her restraints and asked what a demon queen, sealed within a sword, wanted with him. He also stated that her answer needed to be convincing and straightforward. First, she formally introduced herself as Perselk von Firan, the Queen of the Abyss who watches all from the void. She added that the saying, "When one stares into the void, it stares back," existed because of her. Not only that, but she was also the primary cause of the great war between humans and demons. Up until that moment, everything Davey knew about Calerus was that the sword had been used by Heres to pierce the Demon King and end the war. But now he had just discovered that, in addition, the sword harbored Perselk's soul, sealed there by her own father. Furthermore, Perselk seemed completely different from other demon kings. Davey had previously believed he'd received his power from the goddess Freya, not a demon. However, Perselk clarified that Calerus was merely a friendly soul who dwelled in the sword alongside her. She added that if she had known things would end this way, she would have said a proper goodbye, but she also knew Calerus wasn't a very sentimental person. Getting straight to the point, Perselk explained that according to divine will, she had been transferred from the sword to Davey. Davey claimed not to understand the reason behind this, but Perselk confessed she didn't know either, which frustrated her. Regardless, everything happened because Davey used sacred magic through the sword, so Perselk stated he bore responsibility for what transpired. Besides, she had a personal interest in him. After all, Davey was the second person to successfully unlock the divine sword's full potential. Speaking of which, Perselk asked if Davey had ever met Heres. He replied that he had, recalling that Heres always said Perselk could return. The Demon Queen was pleased to hear that her father spoke of her frequently, instead of keeping it a secret. Davey remarked that people needed to learn to hide certain things from each other, and questioned why one would lie to a demon king. In turn, Perselk wanted to correct something about herself. She affirmed that she wasn't the one peering from the void. She had merely borrowed the will of a greater being. She was referring to the status window, and she believed humans customarily called this the Great Divinity. Hearing all this, Davey couldn't believe that a being as powerful as Perselk communicated in such an infantile way. He also wondered what a divinity emanating sacred power expected from someone like him. Perselk, in turn, suggested they take a walk, claiming Davey could use the opportunity to show her how interesting the world outside was. Davey asked what he would gain from it. Perselk replied that he had already gained something, as he had received her powers. She asserted that with the system window, he had become capable of acquiring even more abilities. Davey realized Perselk knew much more about him than he had imagined, and he couldn't ignore that fact. In any case, Perselk claimed it had been a very good trade for him, and she was eager to see how Davey would reciprocate. Davey thought Perselk's powers were quite tempting. He didn't even consider giving them up. So he agreed to do as she wished. Not only that, but he had also accidentally gained someone who could hear his secrets without suffering consequences for it. Sometime later, the grand event of the Duchy of Feliste, which was originally supposed to be a fencing tournament, had turned into a celebration following a sudden attack. Amidst all this, Davey became the center of attention due to rumors about his stigma. Because of this, he barely managed to leave his quarters. Perselk, in turn, pointed out that Davey had saved everyone's lives and asked if it wouldn't be better to tell everyone the truth instead of hiding. After all, by looking at the stigma, they would see someone who had received a physical manifestation of divine love. Davey knew that in the past 400 years, only 3 saints had appeared, and a stigma was even rarer, so revealing himself publicly was out of the question. With that, he went to the twins and asked them to pack their bags immediately. He stated that instead of having to explain himself, he simply wanted to leave this place and go home. Winley agreed, reasoning that they hadn't committed any crime and therefore didn't owe anyone explanations. Besides, this wasn't even sacred territory. Davey, in his thoughts, believed that in reality, perhaps only for a short period, this place, along with half the city, truly was sacred territory. Nevertheless, fleeing when things got complicated was the best plan. Mid-escape on their way home, Perselk asked if it would be all right to just leave like this. After all, some people would probably follow him all the way to his homeland in search of answers. Davey replied that it would be fine, as long as something bigger than him captured people's attention. Sometime later, Ileana received news of Davey's escape. She was furious, claiming that Davey had not only left a huge mess for her to sort out, but also left a misunderstanding and fled with his siblings. He had told people that he dealt with the enemy after awakening the sacred sword, and that the stigma appeared due to the powers hidden within it. Ileana, however, insisted that all of it was nothing but a big lie. Seeing the princess so irritated, her maid thought it had been 10 years since she started working with Ileana, and wondered what would happen if everyone discovered that the true face of the cold and powerful princess was actually a rebellious and aggressive girl. Ileana, in turn, told her maid to ask the knights to prepare immediately. On the way back to his homeland, Davey saw his siblings sleeping side by side. He thought that, like this, they even seemed to get along quite well. It was good to see them without fighting, even if it only happened when they were asleep. Amidst this, Perselk asked if he regretted what had happened with Calerus. She mentioned that besides its current owner, Davey was the only one who knew the true nature of the divine sword, or perhaps he was the only one. She believed he should be its true master. Davey wished he could, but he knew he wouldn't be able to use such sacred powers until he recovered his original strength. As tempting as it sounded, he wasn't the type of person who stole, so he wouldn't try to take the sword from its current owner. Besides, he claimed it didn't quite suit Calerus's personality, and he wasn't keen on using such large and heavy swords. Not only that, but he had another sword in mind that he wished to possess. Judging by his expression, Perselk concluded that Davey had a plan. She admitted she didn't know everything, and even when she looked deep into Davey, there were still parts she couldn't access. But putting that aside, Perselk asked what he planned to do when he got back home. She said that with the stigma, Davey's enemies wouldn't be able to move freely, so finishing them off right now would be the best option. Davey claimed he wouldn't do anything without being well prepared. Besides, the opinions of the nobles led by Duke Barrietta held a lot of influence in the kingdom, unlike Queen Linus. For the same reason, the royal family couldn't punish the nobles carelessly. Defeating them one by one would take too long. This situation had only fueled the queen's arrogance. However, Davey had already thought of a solution. After arriving home, everyone was called to speak with the king. Benedis apologized for what had happened, but the king stated that none of it was his fault. In fact, the king blamed the Voltes kingdom for opposing the Union of Nations, and felt relieved that Benedis had returned safe and sound. The king had also heard about the stigma. In turn, Davey explained that despite being unworthy, he had somehow piqued divine curiosity and earned the mark. Unlike the king, the queen didn't like hearing that at all, but she tried to maintain her composure, no matter how difficult it was, even claiming to be happy about the prince's achievement. The king then stated that this matter could not be taken lightly. He ordered a letter to be sent to the Voltes kingdom, reiterating the request for union. He told the twins to go rest after their long journey, but he asked Davey to stay a little longer. In turn, Davey said that nearly half a year had passed since His Majesty last called him for a talk. To be precise, this was the first time they had met properly since he woke from his coma. The king asked if the prince held any grudges because of this. Davey felt he didn't have to lie anymore, but he also didn't think it was right to say everything he felt at that moment. In any case, he understood that his father had looked after him through the chief chamberlain. The king thought that there wasn't a father in the world who wouldn't notice such a drastic change in their child. And although he didn't consider himself a good father, he had noticed Davey's transformation. That's why he agreed to talk with him after such a long time. The last time they had met, little Davey had begged his father to save his mother, asking if he hadn't been informed about her health condition. Davey insisted that his mother wasn't sick, but poisoned. However, his father completely ignored him and ordered the guards to remove the child from his presence. Even so, Davey refused to leave without an answer. Yet, there was nothing he could do about it. Only 4 years later did Davey discover the truth about his mother's poisoning, but the king had remained silent on the matter. Now, standing before the king again, he asked if his father felt good after abandoning his mother and marrying the enemy for the good of the kingdom. The king said the fault wasn't his current wife's, but his own. However, Davey didn't want to hear about that. He only wanted to know if the king felt any remorse. After all, his mother had called out for him even in her last moments. No matter how much Davey tried to shake off these thoughts, a scar like that didn't just disappear. Besides, he had seen his mother die with tears in her eyes. In turn, the king stated that he was aware he hadn't been a good father. But he claimed that being king wasn't a position that allowed one to do whatever they pleased, as most of the time, a king had to deal with matters they didn't fully understand. So he asked Davey to live in silence and grow stronger each day, because that way, no one would cross his path or stand in the way of his future reign, for that was what he wanted, to pass the crown to his son. However, Davey realized that his father had apparently completely forgotten about his mother, so he said that normally people say it's a son's duty to follow in his father's footsteps, but he wouldn't do that. He claimed that if being a king meant giving up his own family for the sake of the kingdom, then he didn't want to follow that path. And even though many people coveted the crown, Davey asserted that wasn't his case. Therefore, he stated that the king could pass his crown to someone else. After all, he refused to accept that title, even if he were forced to. After leaving the royal hall, Perselk remarked that Davey could be rude when he wanted to be. He replied that it was necessary, and no matter how much she could see into him, certain things never changed. Besides, Davey said he had been able to realize what he truly wanted. After returning to his quarters, he asked Amy not to let anyone bother him for the rest of the day. Then Davey went to his room's window and prepared to leave on a mission, declaring that it was time to enter the rabbit hole. Sometime later, in the kingdom of Raun, owned by the Black Moon Guild, it was reported that Shirley had disappeared. Not only that, but the organization's leader stated that some of her subordinates had also gone missing a few days prior. According to the report, they had failed to eliminate the Roan princes. One of the guild members remarked that there was apparently nothing special about being a Class A intelligence group dispatched by headquarters. The guild master warned him to be careful talking if he wanted to stay alive. However, the man retorted that the missing woman's identity was still uncertain. What's more, he didn't believe some brats could have caused so much trouble. As a true guild member, he would go after the boys and Shirley too. After all, something like this could only be done by a real assassin. The leader's servant asked if it was all right to let this happen. The leader, in turn, said that the man's arrogance would be his downfall, so he let him go. Not only that, but he added that despite being labeled Class A, Shirley was far more powerful than that. Most of the organization didn't know it, but Shirley was a much more dangerous woman than she appeared. However, he couldn't understand how such a woman could fail in an attempt to eliminate defenseless children, only to disappear immediately afterward. He thought he needed to leave, but he wondered why no one was responding to his calls. Just then, the guildmaster realized something was wrong and tried to do something about it. Immediately, however, a blade hovered at his neck, and a voice told him to think twice before moving. Not only that, but the leader realized his servant was the first to fall, and he hadn't even noticed. Next, he was forced against his own desk. His captor noticed that the guild leader was an ordinary human, not a vampire. Annoyed, the leader wondered why none of his people had appeared to confront the intruder. Little did he know, the intruder had eliminated everyone else before even entering. The intruder also said that no matter how much he screamed, no one would come to help him. The leader then concluded that if things continued like this, he'd be next. So he tried to talk to the intruder, asking if it was the Ruxo Guild or the Karsha Guild that sent him. Instead of answering, the intruder told the leader that if he wanted to live, he must provide the requested information. Scared, the leader said he'd hand over anything requested in exchange for his life. The intruder then released the man. He then said he didn't need much. He only wanted the list of nobles who were the hands and feet of the Barrietta family, and a list of all the crimes committed by the Duke, who held great influence in this kingdom. He already knew the Duke had a report on everyone he wanted to keep in line, and that those reports were hidden there. The leader tried to flee, but with just a finger, the intruder threatened him, saying he'd only warn him once. At this, the leader concluded he was dealing with a master assassin. The intruder said he was an expert at sensing lies, so trying to deceive him wouldn't be a good idea. Then he asked what the guild leader's next move would be. Sometime later, the intruder appeared with the requested documents. It was Davey himself, disguised. After seeing the list, he concluded there was a lot of information there, but some of it might be false. But there were still other guilds to explore, and he thought he could corner the nobles if he gathered all the reports about them. Perselk said it seemed a bloodbath was coming soon. Davey didn't think that was a bad idea, but he knew he needed to act cautiously. After all, no matter how prestigious a noble is, they'll always have political enemies. Just like his late mother's knight, Marquis Petrice, one of the 3 swordmasters of the Round Kingdom. Upon reading a letter, the Marquis fell into despair and immediately went looking for his butler because he'd discovered something terrifying. With this, Duke Barrietta would become the person who helped cut off his own arms and legs. Davey said tonight's concept was a night visit. Perselk then asked what his main objective was. The protagonist said she already knew the answer. He wanted to protect his family, have food and a place to live, avoid difficult situations, and live a long, healthy life. Perselk said it was strange to hear a prince say that, as it was exactly how he lived right now. In that case, the protagonist said she needed to know one thing. He'd be leaving the kingdom soon and going to a small territory he was given as a member of the royal family. There, he'd build his future. What's more, this territory was in the most advanced city on the continent. Revenge was something he'd pursue along the way, but it wasn't his main goal, and he wouldn't let something so small ruin his life. Perselk said that if he were king, he'd make his desire a reality faster, adding that being a king wasn't much different from managing a territory. Davey, however, claimed that managing a smaller territory was much easier than governing a country. Besides, he wanted something simpler. His wish was to have a place he could call home. Back in the royal hall, the queen declared that Prince Davey was the kingdom's pride for possessing a stigma. She then asked why the king hadn't rewarded him for such an achievement. She argued that since the prince had already recovered and even received a territory, it wouldn't be a bad idea to send him to manage his own land. Some people didn't understand why the queen had suddenly started praising the prince. She thought to herself that she would never do such a thing under normal circumstances. But after the failed attempt to eliminate the princes, coupled with Shirley's escape, things had become much more complicated. What's more, the intelligence guild where the Duke stored his information had been attacked in 7 different locations on the same night, which deeply worried her. The guild leader himself had brought the news to the queen, claiming they were attacked by a monster that was impossible to defeat or even locate. As a result, the queen's fear only intensified, as she knew what could happen if the information she was hiding fell into the wrong hands. After all, she could be accused of trying to rebel against the crown, and the documents proved it. On top of that, she was starting to distrust Marquis Patrice. She suspected he might be supporting Prince Davey against her, and in that case, the solution was simple: get rid of the Marquis. However, since she no longer had Shirley to assist with such a task, the best she as queen could do was try to remove the prince from the royal palace. She had suggested distancing the prince, but hadn't expected the king to agree so easily. Yet the opposite occurred. The king argued that it wasn't right for an adult, uncrowned prince to continue living in the palace, so he called the chief chamberlain to prepare the prince for his departure. Surprised, the queen wondered what the king was thinking. Sometime later, the protagonist was summoned to speak with the king, but he wasn't surprised. He knew that sooner or later, the kingdom would recognize him as a threat and decide to remove him. The king told Davey to go to his territory and develop it to prove his worth. Perselk commented that the king was probably afraid his son would rebel, and that's why he decided to send him away. Little did the king know, the prince himself had planned to do exactly that even before this decision was made. Davey thought that the king and queen surely had their own plans. It wasn't his place to stay there any longer, as he also had other things to do. Amidst all this, Perselk remarked that things had become complicated, as many lives could be at risk due to Davey's recent actions. However, he didn't seem worried, believing a complete overhaul was necessary before the next king ascended the throne. There was no way to hand this current reality over to Varys, and it would be a bonus if, in the meantime, he also got the chance to face his enemy. As soon as the protagonist left the meeting, he was surprised by the twins. Desperate, they wanted to know why Davey had to leave and if there was anything they could do to help. Davey told them that this was already his wish, and although he might seem weak compared to others, he now possessed the stigma, so he wouldn't be in danger. With that, he asked the twins to trust him. Winley told Davey to ask for their help whenever he needed it, even for small problems, because she would do everything to assist him. The protagonist explained that even though Hines' territory wasn't the best place in the world, many people still lived there. He promised that once he transformed the place into a pleasant environment, he would invite them to visit. Next, the protagonist went to Amy and asked her to go to the Ministry of Finance and the Department of Territory Administration to gather all available documents about Hines' territory. He also mentioned that no one would likely refuse to provide the documents if Amy stated they were for Prince Davey. In turn, Perselk commented that the protagonist seemed to believe he was invincible. She found the situation quite interesting. She also mentioned that her mother loved eccentric things. What's more, even with his great powers and abilities, she noted that Davey hadn't become an insufferable, arrogant person. At this, the protagonist asked if she was feeling empathy. Perselk replied that Davey was quite passive compared to her mother, so it was possible she genuinely felt empathy for him. Not only that, but she told him to feel flattered because the Demon Queen had become his fan. In a way, Davey said, that was an honor. Sometime later, Amy appeared with the few documents she had found. Even though there were only a few, the protagonist understood that the territory was a remote village. And, thinking about it, maybe that was for the best, as he'd have more freedom to develop it. He was eager to pioneer this new place, and not just him, Perselk was too. However, she took a look at the documents and discovered that Hines' territory was a cursed land. But she wasn't surprised. After all, a territory wouldn't be given to Davey without some kind of catch. The protagonist couldn't disagree. Not long after, all the preparations for their departure were complete. Amy asked if everyone who was going with Davey was already there. He replied that he didn't have many allies, since only a few had sworn an oath of loyalty. Next, Marquis Patrice introduced himself to the prince. He told Prince Davey that leaving the palace now was the right decision, adding that even though he wasn't a crowned prince yet, that could change in the future. The Marquis also remarked that Davey had grown up quite a bit, and if his mother were still alive, she would undoubtedly be proud of him. Davey disagreed, stating he was a dishonorable son. However, the Marquis countered that if that were truly the case, he himself would have to be buried alive for failing to protect the prince. Davey had actually discovered Patrice was an ally when he invaded the Marquess's home and found evidence Patrice had gathered about those behind his mother's assassination. Patrice then told Davey to contact him if he ran into any trouble, assuring him he would help as much as he could. Davey pointed out that if rumors spread about the Marquess helping him, it would cause absolute chaos. Patrice, however, replied that if he didn't help the prince, his vows would have been meaningless. In that case, Davey stated he would turn the small village into his new home and hoped the Marquess would continue to fulfill his duties from within the palace. Davey liked the idea of having an ally inside the palace, hoping that in his absence, the Marquess wouldn't give his enemies a moment's rest. However, he still wanted to be the one to deliver the final blow himself. Davey then mused that it would usually take a full day to reach the territory via a mana portal, but since this particular location was close to the capital, he wouldn't have any trouble getting there by carriage. As they traveled, he watched Perselk, thinking she truly was like a sleeping beauty. It felt like the days he'd spent with her had flown by. He also noticed that Perselk loved to sleep, and he wondered if her small stature was due to her magical powers being so weak. Meanwhile, the little one was using his leg as a bed, and Davey gently covered her with a warm jacket. Outside, a knight announced that they were almost there. Soon after, Davey spotted the territory ahead. The territory, Hines, was located in the east of the kingdom. It was an arid land with little more than sand for miles around, a place where only monsters seemed to thrive. Its only advantage was that the main road to the capital passed through it. If these roads were improved, the territory could become a vital transport hub. However, this was no ordinary territory. It was a cursed, inhospitable land, a dry place where nothing could grow, and one that was poorly regarded by everyone. The territory had been managed by someone before their death, but 5 years prior, a severe drought had devastated the land. The exact cause of this devastation, however, remained unknown. With this in mind, Davey opened his status window to analyze the territory's information. He noticed that one of the listed pieces of information was incomplete. Perselk commented that it was a curse. Not only that, but she explained that this curse spread like an addiction, starting small but quickly spiraling out of control. Davey hadn't realized remnants of black magic still lingered in the world. Apparently, some ancient citizen of the territory had angered a sorcerer, so he tried to use purification magic to cleanse the area. Perselk, however, stated that it wouldn't be an easy task. A long-standing curse like this was difficult to break. Not only that, but the entire territory was afflicted. The number of living species there was currently as scarce as knowledge of black magic itself, as cursed mages had vanished a long time ago. As soon as they arrived at the location, a group blocked Davey's caravan. They demanded that the newcomers identify themselves. Looking at the supposed defenses of the place, Davey remarked that everything looked quite weak. He wondered if having guards still working there was even a good sign. Amidst the confusion, the prince stepped out of the carriage. He declared that they were all family now, so there was no need to fight. The local guards immediately recognized him and quickly apologized for the poor reception. Seeing the guards' condition, Davey felt concerned. He asked when they had received the message about his arrival. The guard replied that it had been 2 days ago. Davey then asked if there had been any monster attacks since then. The guard's expression told him all he needed to know. With that, Davey declared that before tackling the curse, he would have to deal with the goblin problem first. The captain of the guards introduces himself as Manhwa. He explains that in the absence of a lord, he had to take over leadership of the territory, but now that the prince is here, he can take on this role. Davey states that the guards have worked hard, and from now on, they will be promoted to official guards. He tells Manhwa that one of his lieutenants will train them, and instructs the captain to make sure the squad is properly organized. Davey claims he doesn't like to waste talent. He also says that if Manhwa can improve himself, he will grant him a noble title. After all, he still has the authority to do so. Some time later, Davey assesses the situation, noting that despite its age, this fortress still has a robust defensive line. He wants to understand how the goblins managed to invade. Manhwa explains it was all thanks to the guards' constant exhaustion. He adds that dozens of houses were burned and many citizens were abducted. Furthermore, he reports that they don't have enough provisions for the winter, and even the farmers are starving. Amidst this, Perselk points out that the prince won't be able to use his wealth here, and even if he fixes the castle walls, it will only last 2 years at most. Davey jokes that if she keeps this up, he'll promote Perselk to his secretary. She refuses because that would mean less time to sleep. Regardless, Davey doesn't have much else he can do. He then gives some money to the guard leader and asks him to buy as many materials and provisions as he can. Amy, who accompanied Davey to the distant territory, speaks up, asking how he still has so much money. Davey makes up some excuse, but he knows he actually stole it from the intelligence guild. Purcell reminds him that there's no justice in being a thief, but Davey tells her to go to sleep instead of lecturing him. Bernil, who left his position as palace butler to accompany the prince, offers to help with the purchases. He is a relative of the Chamberlain Besfus and says he will make sure to get everything His Highness needs. In that case, Davey tells them to act quickly, ordering that only a minimum number of guards remain there while the rest should gather with the knights. Outside, Davey set up a platform to address the residents. He formally introduces himself as the new ruler of the territory. He states that he's already aware of the Goblin abductions, and although some people feel the urge to pursue the enemies, many are afraid and prefer to hide. Even though not everyone is a warrior, the prince insists they cannot do nothing. Otherwise, sooner or later, the goblins will return and repeat their actions. He doesn't just want to defend against the goblins, but to eliminate the problem once and for all. Some residents speak up, agreeing that the prince's words make sense, but they are the last line of defense remaining and can't do much in their current state. However, Davey claims they only need to act successfully once for the attacks to stop. Davey knows that to some, he's just another noble confidant in his own bloodline, but incapable of doing anything. Yet, he asserts that he is not just a prince, but the lord of Hines territory, and now everyone here is his family, so he will take care of them. After all, he's not the type of person who lets his family die. He knows that mere words won't convince everyone, but he claims to possess a stigma sent by the gods, which might increase his credibility. But if it's still hard to believe his words, he asks people to take it as an order, and he declares that no one will die without his permission. Sometime later, Davey enters the demon forest accompanied by a group. However, Purcell says that taking these unprepared and exhausted men to hunt goblins is a terrible idea. Davey, however, points out that they have 150 men, which should be enough. Even so, Purcell says that being overconfident might not always help him. Besides, numbers can always change. Davey claims to have everything under control, prompting Purcell to remark that making it seem like he's always right is the characteristic she admires most about him. Next, the guard leader says that as soon as they cross this mountain, they'll find the place where the goblins are gathered. Davey comes across the location and realizes it's an abandoned village. However, he doesn't know how orcs and goblins could live in a place like this. Monmeter explains that it's a ghost village, currently serving as a goblin encampment. One of the young men is seething with rage because the goblins killed his friend. Davey approaches him and says he understands his feelings. He then tells them to use that anger to fight bravely and eliminate their enemies, and by doing so, to honor the dead, avenging them. Davey admires their attachment to those who are gone, even if they were friends and not relatives. With that, he says he's found the right territory. He then attacks first, firing an arrow. An unsuspecting goblin notices the arrow too late and is immediately struck by it. Not only that, but the arrow was covered in flames, causing a fire to break out in the area. The guards panicked, as they thought they would be making a surprise attack, not a frontal assault. However, Davey calms them down, assuring them that he won't let any of them perish. Upon seeing where his arrow landed, Davey celebrated. He had used an arrow crafted by the philandering god of the bow, the same deity who had mastered all Apollonian skills. Now, it was serving its purpose in this attack. Although it seemed chaotic, this wasn't an ordinary skill. It was originally designed to be used as a trap during wartime, but the protagonist had to use it now. After all, he wasn't the kind of person to back down over trivial matters. With that, he prepared for his first action as a lord, blessing all his companions with battle buffs. Purcell asked if it was right to use magic on these men. Davey replied that either way they didn't even know they'd been affected by magic. All he needed was for the men to feel motivated to fight. Now that everyone was blessed, the protagonist stated that soldiers elsewhere wouldn't receive such special treatment. Not even the paladins of the sacred kingdom of Balshaz had this, as only a saint or a pope could use level 7 sacred magic. Davey gave them permission to unleash all the resentment they had held against their enemies until now. He imagined he had always wanted to do this. Then, he ordered everyone to advance. The protagonist had no idea of the guards' thirst for revenge, but seeing how they were acting, he could only conclude they had been eager for this. All the guards were in a state of ecstasy, and the goblins, who usually terrorized humans, were now feeling that very same fear firsthand. It didn't take long for them to be cut down. The guards, who had previously lacked confidence, now realized they were capable of fighting. Davey noticed that in a short time, the battle had actually turned into a goblin massacre. He let the guards vent their rage while he stayed on the sidelines, acting as support. Soon he healed those who had been wounded. He also reminded them that he hadn't authorized any deaths, so they needed to be careful because they weren't invincible. However, he added that anyone who got hurt would be healed, so they didn't need to hold back. Seeing such a vast disadvantage on the enemy's side, the protagonist almost felt pity for the goblins. Regardless, it didn't take long for the guards to finish them all off. Not only that, but they also thanked their new lord. However, the protagonist wasn't used to such praise and felt quite awkward, so he told them it was too early to celebrate, as there were still people to rescue and he needed to find them. As he walked, the protagonist reflected that his intention had only been to eliminate the guard's fear, but this had resulted in an unexpected effect. Now, everyone admired him perhaps a bit too much. The next day, before the subjugation, the guard seemed prepared for a holy war, even though they were only going to eliminate goblins. However, their lord only called 10 people to help with the mission, leaving some disappointed as they had also wanted to participate. The guard leader remarked that their lord was just a boy who had recently turned 16, and he probably thought Davey was simply enthusiastic about his first victory. He believed it wouldn't be long before Davey understood how things truly worked around there. Soon after, the young guard was surprised. He saw their lord returning safe and sound with the rest of the group. Both he and the other guard were left dumbfounded. After all, they realized that with just a few people, the lord had managed to subdue the remaining goblins in a short amount of time. The protagonist sensed that some people might think the guards who accompanied him had been hypnotized or something similar, but he just wanted to make sure everyone returned safely. Perselk warned that if this continued, they might end up developing a pseudo-religion or something similar. However, Davey stated that there were still some goblins left, so he would have to continue with the expeditions. While he took some with him, others would stay behind and prepare for winter. He thought everything would return to normal in a few days, and the excited guards would calm down. At least that's what the protagonist believed at the time. After that, rumors spread far and wide, and he gained the reputation of a saint among the people. Not only that, but some guards even started escorting the lord as if they were priests of a religious leader. Thus, this became the first time the protagonist regretted something since waking from his coma. Anyway, the protagonist earned the people's trust, unlike many others, and that's important to him. According to Astria, the king who conquered the Palladian Empire on the continent of Bord, and also the man who taught Davey how to use a spear. Even when governing a small territory, a ruler deals with people, not cattle. Therefore, people need to willingly follow their leader. Even though Davey didn't learn much about politics from Astrea, he sympathized with his words. While he was going through the territory's documents, Perselk appeared and asked how things were going. The protagonist mentioned that some of the information was ambiguous. Perselk then noted that if he could break the curse, he might be able to turn the territory into something decent within 5 years, but it would take another 20 years to really improve the place. After all, simply breaking the curse affecting the land wouldn't make it instantly return to normal. Perselk said she had a clear opinion on the matter. She explained that the territory lacked an underground river system, which severely limited its resources. Not only that, but due to scarce harvests, there was no more livestock, so eating meat was out of the question. The coins he had managed to acquire might be a temporary solution, but the local lack of funds was a serious problem that needed addressing. Davey pointed out that the territory had no way to profit, meaning there was no way to earn money. However, he believed there were other ways to solve this financial issue. He noted that a large number of young adults lived in the region. He suggested they could be put to hunting monsters, turning that into a form of income. The second option was to create a special crop, but that would require treating the land first. And then there was the option of bartering, though they'd essentially be trading diamonds for grain. Perselk countered that this solution required other territories to negotiate with, and currently, they had no options, let alone products to trade. Davey, however, wanted to analyze the territory himself to be sure, convinced he would find something. He was willing to use whatever was available, no matter what it was. As he searched, he recalled that his dream was to own his own building. Right now, though, he only owned a pigsty. Yet, he remembered these lands were once fertile. The previous owners abandoned them, and then a lord took possession. Davey knew that somewhere there was a mage's hideout, and that mage was responsible for the curse. He wanted to find them to undo what had been done. However, he hadn't yet replenished his divine power, so it would be difficult to undo such a powerful curse without his full abilities, especially since he lacked power reserves. He even considered asking to borrow Calerus again, imagining he could convince the princess with some random excuse. Perselk, however, didn't recommend he try that. In that case, Davey stated there was only one alternative left. He then said there was something right here, practically begging to be used. He then placed his hands on the ground and performed a curse rearrangement. Perselk Perselk said she had never seen magic like that before. The protagonist mused that the creator of this magic must be from another continent, which is why his friend didn't recognize it. This magic was also known as the magical programming language, highly programmable since it was created with countless forms and patterns of mana. For the same reason, dark mages needed various artifacts, or a long time for incantations. Perselk then understood that this magic could be used to locate the mage who created the curse. The protagonist confirmed this and immediately began deciphering the codes. Meanwhile, Perselk commented that she had to deduce the information herself, as Davey didn't share all the details he knew. Then she noticed something. Davey said that it wasn't exactly a curse. Instead, it was a self-sustaining greenhouse created by a mage. Next, he headed to the eastern section of the Hines territory, as he was curious why the territory's border was so well defined. He ended up discovering 7 possible locations where the mage could be, all situated on the territory's borders. Moreover, the dome covered only Hines territory. It was as if it had been designed to regulate everything related to the territory's climate and geology. Perselk realized that the curse had purposefully dried out the soil and created a lack of rain. The protagonist confirmed this, adding that so far his technique had only managed to locate one of the curse's effects. He still didn't know why it was created, but he did know that the creator's intentions were to turn Hines into a desolate territory. So, he wondered, what would happen if he removed the curse? Davey imagined that with the right configuration, he could even turn this vast desert into a tourist resort. Following his clues, he arrived at some ruins. He was surprised to find such a place amidst raw rocks, but judging by the architecture, he didn't think the construction predated the Great War. Perhaps the Dark Mages weren't even aware of this place's existence, but apparently, the curse hadn't activated out of nowhere. Besides, the place was eerily quiet. Then a golem appeared, and Perselk remarked that he had spoken too soon. Perselk stated that this wasn't a common golem. It seemed to be using a magic stone as its energy source. What's more, they could possess special abilities. However, the protagonist could only think of one thing. He was attacked but managed to dodge. Not only that, but he ended up on top of the golem. As he tried to grab the enemy's gem, he muttered, "This smells like money." He celebrated upon grabbing the precious stone, claiming it was his lucky day. Meanwhile, on the city walls, some guards were enjoying the peaceful atmosphere while the Lord explored outside. The truth was, no one had expected Davey to be so helpful. Currently, no noble dared to visit such an inhospitable territory. What's more, the people who managed to leave and reach other cities were often treated poorly by everyone else. The only thing the kingdom had done for this territory was to stop collecting taxes, since the inhabitants barely had enough to eat, let alone pay tribute. And amidst all this, a young man was sent here. Some people whispered that Davey was only sent here because he'd been demoted in a power struggle, which made some of them distrust him. However, there wasn't much they could do about it. After all, Davey was the only one willing to help. Besides, before his arrival, they were facing the biggest wave of goblin attacks yet. If it hadn't been for his help, they wouldn't have lasted much longer. Before that, goblins had managed to breach the fort's defenses and even abducted some people. The guards, who could barely protect the place, weren't able to rescue the missing people. In the midst of this chaotic situation, the prince and new lord appeared, raising doubts about his approach. Some thought he would punish the head guard for doing a poor job, but if Davey had done that, many would have turned against his leadership. However, contrary to expectations, the new lord handled the situation very well. He also created an opportunity to counterattack the goblins and even called the inhabitants family, a gesture that gave some hope that the abducted people might return home. Davey inspired many with his words and actions. Even though he didn't like being called a saint, he became an important figure among the people, glorified as a deity. It was easier for these people to believe a miracle had been performed before their eyes than in an untouchable deity who hadn't manifested to help. A boy helping with the repairs said it was great that the new lord had dealt with the goblins. However, he doubted if this territory had any future. Long before the goblin problem, drought had already devastated the territory. Adding to that, the lack of rain had ruined any attempts at planting. Priests and mages had been sent to try and reverse the situation, but all of them failed. Everyone's conclusion was that this couldn't be solved by human hands. So, no matter how blessed the new lord was, they believed not even Davey could fix these lands. Speaking of our protagonist, he knew that magic crystals were a natural formation of highly condensed and pure mana. Compared to a regular stone of the same size, a mana crystal was 100 times more valuable and powerful. That's why he went crazy when he saw some of these on the goblins' foreheads, and he didn't hesitate to try and get those crystals. Even though he said the task wasn't easy, Perselk disagreed, having seen him deal with the goblins effortlessly. Davey thought the only known fact about mana crystals was that they could be found in ancient ruins, and only in small quantities. This only increased their market value. Despite that, the protagonist wondered how long the money generated by these items would last. Moreover, Perselk said he couldn't just show these items to any buyer, as that would raise suspicions. Anyway, the protagonist continued his path until he found a crystal much larger than the others. Not only that, but he realized this could be the energy source of the curse. With this, he understood Perselk was right, as many had started wars to obtain a crystal as large and valuable as this one. Besides, the crystal was full of pure mana. Davey imagined that if he could use it, he'd be able to freely cast ninth circle spells. So he decided to try, but he noticed that, unlike its external appearance, Davey thought the code's structure was overly exaggerated, just to cause a drought in the territory. He suspected there was something hidden within it. Even though it was difficult to manipulate, he wanted to try and find out. And amidst his search, he ended up finding some energy cores which were hidden within the source code. Seeing the change in the magic's behavior, Perselk asked what Davey had done. He replied that to start, he had spread a bit of water in the area. But there was a catch. With so much water already stored in the clouds, everything accumulated would fall as a single massive downpour. It would be a huge storm. Far away, a discussion was taking place. Some nobles were talking about Marquis Patrice, and they believed that if he continued to act independently, it wouldn't be long before the aristocracy disintegrated. So, they tried to find a solution to prevent any of the evidence from being used against them. For the conspirators, it was as if ghosts from the past were emerging to haunt them, as now several enemies were appearing out of nowhere. Furthermore, the queen had not commented on the situation, nor even on Prince Davey's stigma. Rumors claimed the stigma was so powerful that the boy couldn't control it, so they figured it shouldn't become a problem for them. Besides, the Sacred Kingdom was in the same boat, meaning they couldn't acknowledge the stigma's truthfulness. Not only that, but some believed that instead of worrying about a mediocre prince, they should focus on what truly mattered. Amidst this, Duke Barrietta drew attention to another matter, stating that the cohesion of the aristocracy wouldn't break in a single day. He also said that one must fight, even if it means taking every risk in the world. However, he believed the correct course of action was to find a way to recover the stolen secret information. But, in the worst-case scenario, they should also prepare for war. A servant stated that he would make all the necessary preparations. Immediately, the Duke instructed him to do so discreetly, as this secret could not be exposed until everything was ready. Barrietta felt that his colleagues were greatly underestimating Prince Davey. Unlike them, his instinct told him not to make the same mistake, as something had happened to the prince after his coma. The moment he gained influence and support, he would likely show his true colors. However, he believed that as long as Davey remained in Hines' territory, he wouldn't be able to do much. After all, he wondered, what could the prince possibly achieve in a barren, dead land? Contrary to what Duke Barrietta believed, the protagonist made it rain under the Hines skies for the first time in years. Still, he admitted that doing so was not an easy task. Back home, he mentioned that it would take a few days before they could start planting. He could tell this just by looking at the magic crystal, which functioned like an operating panel. Moreover, it was connected to all the other magic crystals in the region, working as a kind of remote control. With this, Davey asserted that he had control over the region's weather, and since humans are naturally lazy, having something like this was quite useful. He had also stored the other crystals he collected in magic bags, and wanted to wait for the land to recover before acting again. A week later, the protagonist went for a walk, and immediately his fans appeared. Davey asked why they were doing this. One of them replied that they couldn't just stand by while their lord worked so hard, which was why they were offering to do heavy labor. The protagonist wasn't sure if they would be able to handle so many tasks. Regardless, he said he had something simple for them to do. He had asked the knights to prepare land for planting, so he wanted everyone who could to cultivate that land. He also stated that they had 4 days to plant, and if they couldn't manage it, they could give up without any issues. Davey explained that he would reward their working hours, depending on how much effort they put in, but he wouldn't let anyone work without getting paid. The leader of the guard said that despite the climate change, cultivating such an enormous plot of land in just 4 days was impossible. However, the protagonist didn't understand why. After all, the land had already been used for planting, so they should have equipment to assist with the work. While Monmouter worried about the population, some were only concerned with what they would spend after getting paid. At that, the leader of the guard said they should be grateful for everything their lord had done, and not try to take advantage of his kindness. However, the protagonist was not foolish. Was not. He used his magic to increase the physical strength of the workers, and just as he had done with the guards, he gave these people the necessary motivation. Monmouter was quite surprised to see this, but at the same time, realized it would be useful. In turn, Davey told Monmouter that he would discover a new world once he started using a pickaxe. Moreover, if he had Calerus, he could give the workers an even greater buff. Monmouter asked what the Lord intended by giving them so many things. Davey explained that his desire was to turn this dead land into a source of income, because the fastest way way to earn quick money was through large quantity and scarcity, and the product that satisfied both conditions was abundance. Even Perselk realized that Davey's intention was to address both quantity and scarcity. Unlike her, Monmitter still didn't understand and asked how the Lord intended to do this. The protagonist explained that his plan was to plant moonflowers, in addition to the other provisions they needed. Lunar plants can't be grown on the eastern continent because the weather conditions are always changing and difficult. Plus, it's super expensive to import lunar flowers from the west, as they're used by mage towers and alchemists to create potions for the temple. They're not just expensive, they're scarce, leading to huge competition for them. Knowing this, Monmitter says they can't grow these plants there. However, the protagonist, Davey, knows he literally has control over the local climate in the palm of his hand. He says all he needs to do now is visit the vegetarians living in the forest. Obviously, he's talking about the elves. Sometime later, in the land of the elves, Ena Helishana, the chief of the forest elves, says the spirits warned her about a visitor. Her master Medes appears and apologizes for arriving unannounced. Ena, however, assures him he's always welcome. She mentions she recently got some excellent tea leaves. While drinking the tea Ena serves, Medes says he had a dream recently. She then asks what dream brought him all the way here. Her master pauses for a moment before answering. He then reveals that his dream showed a curse had fallen upon this forest. Ena recalls her master always saying that the work of spirits comes from nature, so something like this is both expected and natural. But her master insists the forest is drying up. He also tells Ena that this isn't her true home and asks her to return, wanting to take her to their hometown, to the embrace of the divine tree. Ena, however, declares this is her home now. She has no intention of going back to the place her master calls home. She suggests her master can take the other elves living there so they don't suffer from the curse. Medes doesn't want to take everyone and leave Ena behind, claiming she won't survive if she stays. But Ena replies that if that happens, it would be the will of nature. She's very attached to her new home and even hopes that one day someone might save this place. Ena feels the lively wind blowing on her face, noting it's as if the wind is telling her about a good encounter. Changing the subject, she asks if her master enjoyed the tea. She then reveals she used cricket wings as ingredients. Obviously, her master was not pleased. He thinks that for a brief moment, he forgot why Ena doesn't have a good relationship with the Eastern Elves. The others call her the most nature-obsessed. Not far from there, the elf's expected guest approaches. Davey thinks elves are a rarely seen species on the continent. According to records, they started hiding their presence 300 years ago, after the Great Incident. Some even believe they don't exist, but Davey thinks he might be lucky enough to find them, as he noticed some spirits watching him during his fight against the goblins. He believes the existence of spirits proves the existence of elves, given their symbolic relationship. Davey would prefer not to encounter them, but if he does, he won't act against them. Perselk doesn't like them much, claiming elves are rigid and stubborn. Davey agrees. He knows Apollon, the elf of doom, probably caused all the trouble, and what little he knows about him makes him never want to meet him. After walking a bit, he finds an enchanted forest, likely the home of the elves. The spiritual creatures living there approach him. He notes that these creatures are usually influenced by those with an affinity for spirits. They might even like him more than the elves, thanks to his purifying powers. Not only that, but Davey underwent intense training to acquire such powers, even diving into fire just to get used to high temperatures. Uriana was his spiritualist master at the temple. She had a contract with 13 royal spirits born as humans. Perselk notices that even without a contract with these spirits, Davey also has an affinity for them. Plus, the fact that he possesses dark mana doesn't interfere with his relationship with good spirits. Perselk then asks how he plans to find the lunar flowers. Davey replies that actually he doesn't even know if these flowers can produce seedlings. After he says this, a small creature places a tiny flower in his hand. Shocked, Perselk asks if it's what she thinks it is. Davey confirms, yes, a lunar plant. Right after that, they discover a garden full of these plants, hidden inside a cave. He then thanks the spirit that guided him there. Perselk realizes there are a lot of lunar plants, enough to replant near their territory with some left over. However, she notices Davey doing something strange and asks, what exactly is that? Spiritual power is based on mana, divine power, and dark mana. Anyone with the power can see spirits. The only difference is the level of affinity a person will have with them. Therefore, the protagonist can confidently admit that there are no spirits he cannot summon. At this point, Perselk asks if he's planning to form a contract with a spirit. Davey explains that this is the Garden of the Moon Goddess, and as the name suggests, the place belongs to the spirits. If someone picks one of these flowers without their consent, a disease will befall them. So, he knows he can't act carelessly. With this in mind, the protagonist tries to communicate with the spirit residing there in a different language. Immediately, the nature spirit manifests and is astonished that he knows how to speak the language of spirits. As a result, they manage to establish communication. The protagonist tells Perselk that the spirits have authorized the harvesting of the flowers, so he wants to do it before the elves discover it. Perselk didn't quite understand what just happened. However, Davey says it's better to avoid troublesome situations. After all, their mission is to collect the plants, not waste time chatting. Speaking of the elves, Yuria thinks that reaching the spirit garden and receiving a spirit's will is truly astonishing. She also thinks that the visitor received the spirit's consent just by communicating, without any prior preparation. And on top of that, he's just a human boy. Yuria never imagined that a human would come to know the Garden of Lunar Flowers, much less receive its authorization. Now she wonders whether or not she should tell her master about this. Her master asks Yuria what's wrong. She, in turn, says she just wants to know why he hasn't drunk his tea. After all, she prepared it specially for her master. She found a dead cricket, let the ingredients dry for a week, and then boiled them. However, even with all that work, her master ignored her sincerity. But she says if he didn't like it, he can try other things, as she recently created a new menu. Medes thanks her but refuses, thinking that Yuria's eating habits are problematic. Yuria, in turn, says that a human who can converse with spirits just entered the flower garden and awoke a great being from its deep slumber. Her master is astonished by this information. However, he notices that she isn't joking and says it's been a long time since a dragon disappeared, and they are now just legends of the past. Despite this, he finds it more probable for a dragon to still exist than for a human to be able to speak with spirits. Med says that among humans, there are those who possess some eccentricities. However, there has never been anyone capable of communicating with spirits. Besides, he believes that only elves have the necessary connection with spirits to carry out such communications. However, Yuria says she will have to leave the village for a while. After all, this is what she had been waiting for. Someone who can save the village from the curse. Back to the protagonist, he wants to know why the work that should have been done in only 4 days was completed in half a day. His ally says that all the workers are enamored with the Lord and want to repay the kindness he has shown. Davey can't complain. After all, this was the result he was looking for, but he knows that in the long run this won't work. The production of lunar buds began in earnest, and using the watchmen they started the plantations, but suspicious voices began to be heard throughout the territory. This raises a question for the protagonist. If the plants will really grow in his territory after all, he knows that lunar buds take up to 5 months to grow. It's also necessary to have the power of spirits for the flower to bloom. However, he only wants to sell the leaves and not the whole plants. Monmater tells the Lord that they don't have the necessary skills to cultivate lunar plants, and claims that the leaves are slowly drying. Davey claimed that rain would soon arrive, thus solving the problem. However, a few days later, not only did it not rain, but the temperature also rose, and the workers became worried. Even so, the protagonist had everything under control, and for the past 4 months, he controlled the temperature and climate as he pleased, eliminating any worries. It wasn't long before the news that lunar plants were being cultivated in the Hines territory spread. Besides, the nobles know that the current lord of the territory himself is leading this experiment. The master of the Red Tower of Mages, known as Sage Harrison, appears and asks if they are talking about the territory cursed 5 years ago. One of the young men says that it apparently started raining there, which means the curse has been broken. The lady says that even if it's true that land is barren, and it would take at least 10 years for the place to start prospering. Not only that, but she says that the current lord is the eldest prince of the Roan kingdom and must have lost his mind after being sent there. The Tower Master's assistant says that the prince they are referring to is Davey. However, Harrison tells him to be silent. After all, they were the first to have access to this information. So if something interesting is happening in the east, it will be of great use. In that case, he asks the assistant to make the preparations. Back to our protagonist, he noticed that a beautiful garden of spiritual flowers had sprung from a previously barren and cursed land. They barely managed to cover production costs due to the low number of seeds available for cultivation. The good news was that more leaves were being sold. Amy mentioned that the current stock was nearly 20,000, with another 10,000 still ready for harvest. Davey knew the current price was 4 leaves for 100 gold coins. 10,000 leaves would amount to 250,000 common coins, or 5,000 platinum coins. To put that into perspective, a normal family could live for 2 weeks on just 1 gold coin, and 5 gold coins would last an entire month with some left over. Unlike the spiritual stones, he put the leaves up for sale publicly, as a business. Davey also intentionally spread rumors, leading many to believe he was just an idiot, which meant they weren't interested in interfering with his operations. Perselk warned that this tactic wouldn't work twice, so Davey responded that they needed to make the most of it now. Not only that, but he believed everything else was ready too. to draw the attention of the entire continent to his product. After all, lunar leaves appeared for sale only a maximum of twice a month, and even then, the large quantities weren't enough to meet the demand of 2 continents. These leaves were the primary ingredient for magic and alchemy catalysts, and also crucial for creating church potions. So knowing that such plant leaves were available for sale nearby should have been great news. However, along with a large shipment, the protagonist spread another rumor. Soon, word began to spread that the lord attempting to grow the leaf business had fallen ill and was bedridden. Davey did this, believing it to be a necessary evil. It wasn't uncommon for an expensive product whose price was high due to scarcity to see a sharp price drop with an increase in supply. Therefore, if he were to distribute them without any reservations, the price of the leaves would obviously plummet. To maintain high prices, he wanted to create an artificial shortage, allowing him to charge whatever he wished when he resumed sales. Amidst all this, a crowd gathered before the protagonist's gate. He realized that within a few days of the rumor circulating, the region had descended into chaos. All the merchant groups, organizations, and even priests had come there, demanding answers. Amy reported that she had informed everyone the lord was bedridden, yet they insisted on seeing the products. At this point, Davey realized he would have to do something about it. Meeting with his staff, he asked Manmeter about the security of the territory. His allies said they were doing their best, but claimed they needed more people working at the security posts. After all, it was difficult to handle so many visitors at once. In response, the protagonist ordered that anyone appearing suspicious should be expelled. He knew he had the advantage in this situation and had no need to be lenient with all the visitors, yet he still needed to maintain good relations with everyone. After this, he inquired about the inns, and his ally replied that they were all full. Even some empty houses had been utilized, and it still wasn't enough. Davey suggested using the tents they had bought to set up a camp and asked the butler to charge for stays, but without exorbitant prices. Before Manmeter left, the protagonist wanted to speak with him privately. He then showed him a vial of potion, saying they needed to discuss it. Sometime later, the guard captain went to an inn. His men asked their chief to stay and drink with them, but Manmeter said he needed to rest. So he went to his room and lay on his bed, claiming to be very tired. He thought about his schedule: a morning treatment with Master Berman, troop training in the afternoon, and now etiquette lessons with the Lord's governess. It was all too much to handle. Besides, he'd never had so much work in his entire life. However, just when he thought he would finally rest, a visitor appeared, asking to speak with the captain. The man apologized for the interruption, and then introduced himself as Hallis, a 4th grade specialist from the Green Tower. He stated that he needed to discuss some matters with Manmeter. After that, Hallis remarked that the captain's management was impeccable, but he knew it was difficult to manage so many people in a small space. He then said that the current lord was lucky to have someone like him by his side. Despite the compliment, Manmeter claimed to be just an unimportant knight. Getting straight to the point, Hallis said he would like to meet with the lord, but his quarters were closed to visitors. He then asked if Manmeter couldn't help him with that. The captain explained that the lord had fallen ill from working so hard, and until he recovered, he wouldn't be able to receive visitors. After all, the lord's health was more important than business. Hallis claimed to understand his reasons. However, he added that the Green Tower had no time to waste. He then placed a bag of money and precious stones on the table. Manmeter immediately stated that he didn't accept bribes. However, Hallis argued that it was actually a gift, and he wanted nothing in return other than Manmeter's friendship. The captain said he wasn't used to receiving gifts like this. Hallis, however, told him to accept it as a reward for working so hard. Besides, it wouldn't be missed by him, and he believed Manmeter would make good use of the money. However, Manmeter was already prepared for situations like this. He thought to himself that everything was unfolding exactly as his lord had predicted. During their private meeting, Davey reminded the captain that he was his right-hand man, and that it wouldn't be long before some tried to turn him against the lord. The protagonist told Manmeter that he might be tempted with bribes or pressure, but he asked the captain to choose those people carefully and discreetly. He also told Manmeter to accept any bribes, pretend to help them, and then reveal to the lord who these individuals were, the ones trying to turn his captain against him. Not only that, but he asked Manmeter to pretend to help them and show them a particular item. Davey explained that it was a magically treated potion, priced at 100 gold per vial. He didn't want Manmeter to sell it, but rather to get the subordinates talking, spreading the word among everyone else. After all, his goal was to maximize the value of his product, and this item would help keep the stock in the region for as long as possible. Back in the present, Manmeter presented the item to Hallis, explaining it was a raw material that had been manufactured and would soon be commercialized. Upon seeing the potion, Hallis declared it was definitely a top-tier item. He'd never seen anything of such quality before, meaning he wouldn't find anything like it anywhere else on the continent. He then thought to himself that he needed to have priority on it, no matter the price. Monmeter noticed Hallis was impressed just by looking at the item and asserted that his lord had worked hard to produce it. What's more, all products not meeting quality standards are discarded and used as fertilizer, and they have another 10,000 of these ready for sale. Hallis understood that from 20,000 grams, they had produced only 10,000, meaning half was discarded. He thought that for a 17-year-old lord, that was a bold decision, and in this case, he couldn't let the opportunity slip by. Monmeter then mentioned that the lord intended to auction off the current stock and continue production afterward. Hearing this, Hallis assumed there would be some priority for buyers as well, but Monmeter claimed not to know any more details. Hallis said he knew enough, and promised that the Green Tower would reward Monmeter for this. With that, he took his leave and departed from the captain's quarters. Monmeter was then surprised that the Lord's plan had worked out so well. The next day, he went to the Lord to recount what had happened. The protagonist explained that certain actions were easy to predict, and that this wasn't a place free from the clutches of greed. All he had done was display attractive products to entice rich clients. Monmeter then revealed that besides the Green Tower, he had also received bribes from representatives of other regions. Davey told him to keep the money and didn't care how his captain would spend it, as he had earned it. Besides, the protagonist already made most of the profits from the leaf production, so he didn't mind leaving Monmeter with that money. After all, he wanted to keep him close. Persilk asked if the protagonist was sure he would be fine standing up to the other larger groups. He replied yes, explaining that once the rumor spread, many would want long-term agreements. Branches of various towers and alchemist groups would want to establish themselves in this region, which would transform from an empty territory into something bustling and prosperous. With that, profits would increase, along with an increase in population. Davey knew that in a way, the ancient curse had served to keep the territory empty for him. Now he just needed to manage the new administration. At one point, Eulis, the Red Tower Master's ally, reported that the other magic towers planned to invest in the Hines region with money and relocation. He wasn't sure if he should do the same, so his master said that despite becoming an elder, Eulis was still too cautious. He also said it was normal to make mistakes and trusted that Eulis would make the right decision. However, Eulis argued that it didn't make sense for the regional lord to insist on auctioning off his goods. He reasoned that despite needing more investment, selling directly was more profitable, which made it seem like the lord was intentionally devaluing his own product. Eulis didn't quite understand the reason behind this strategy. Little did he know that the protagonist was secretly selling directly to the Western continent. Unlike Eulis, his master believed the lord was smarter than he appeared. Harrison explained that in a small region like Hines, there likely weren't many inhabitants, and they could only buy what was sold within the region itself. Therefore, the lord was accelerating the territory's growth while saving as much money as possible. Furthermore, the territory had geographical advantages for being situated between major trade routes, and by having towers and branches from various places, it would make Hines a perfect commercial district. Harrison stated that the lord's decision not to increase product production was to prevent other groups from buying in bulk and selling at a higher price to the end consumer. He also said that the lord's strategy was to accumulate as much money as possible in a short amount of time and plan for the future. He was acting as if he had nothing to lose, even if risks existed, which meant the leaf production was just the beginning. Harrison added that the lord had much more to offer, and he probably wasn't the only one who had noticed this. Even if the lord was bluffing, he would still come out ahead. In that case, Eulis said he knew what kind of relationship he wanted to have with the lord, and concluded that he needed a meeting with him as soon as possible. His master said that he also wished to speak with the boy, so he asked his disciple to arrange a meeting. As soon as his conversation with Eulis ended, the sage remembered being asked if it was possible for a young man who barely emitted a mana trace to kill a high-level vampire with just a single attack. Ileana had harbored this doubt since her last encounter with the protagonist and had turned to Harrison for his wisdom. What's more, Davey had also used his borrowed sword without even having a contract with Calerus, further increasing the doubts about him. Reflecting further on the question, Harrison thought it was possible, provided this individual was a disciple of the sword god, or even the sword god himself. Adding this to all the other information he had about Prince Davey, the great sage concluded that everything was slowly falling into place. Sometime later, various requests for housing in the Hines territory began to accumulate, as did land purchases near the village. Some even started fighting over the properties. Desperate, Amy asked what she should do to resolve these disputes. Davey told her to put the territories up for auction. Whoever paid the most would get the property. However, the butler asked what the starting bid should be. The protagonist said to start with the highest possible value, as he had always heard that those who were truly rich owned large estates. Furthermore, he imagined that a true state was a business business where profits needed to be maximized. Before leaving, Amy mentioned that a message had arrived for Davey. It was a letter directly from the royal palace. After this, Amy announces the public auction. The initial bid is 90 gold coins. Soon after, a competitor covers the bid, but a member of the Green Tower quickly counters it. Then a representative from the alchemist school raises the bid once again. They've been fighting over the same piece of land since the beginning, and the auction just made things even hotter. With each increased bid, both parties looked ready to fight. Amy announces that the latest bid is 130, so if no one raises it, the land will be sold. While the bidding war rages, Halus's last bid seems to have won him the dispute. However, in the very last second of the auction, someone else steps forward and covers the bid. After that, the protagonist receives news that they've secured a deal of 150 gold coins per flask with the Aliui trading group. Davey credits this to the strategy he devised with Monmeter. Plus, all the auctioned houses sold at a similar pace to properties in developing areas of the capital. He's happy to have profited on both fronts. Moreover, if things continue this way, Hines' annual revenue will be around 1.5 million gold, making his territory the richest region in the kingdom. With this in mind, he wants to continue leaf production without increasing the quantity. He also plans to clear land to cultivate other products. Davey believes that too much of anything is bad, so he needs to maintain a balance between supply and demand. He tells his allies not to keep unusable structures standing, and to repair those that are still functioning, as he plans a major renovation soon. Meanwhile, Davey thinks about the letter he received from the kingdom. Basically, it praised his recent achievements, which both his home kingdom and the continent had failed to acknowledge, and promised an appropriate reward. But to receive it, he would have to return to the kingdom for a formal visit. Davey burned the letter as soon as he read it, wondering how they had the nerve to send something like that after exiling him. He suspects the Marquis must be stirring things up in his absence, and this must be an attempt to ask for a truce. However, the protagonist noticed that the royal seal on the letter wasn't stamped by the king, but he'll go there anyway. It's time to proceed with his plan. Besides, the kingdom is on the way to his next destination. A flashback shows that in the past, Surtur, one of the protagonist's masters, had built a secret dungeon in the basement of the last place he stayed, but he said he couldn't finish it before he died, so if Davey found it, he wanted him to complete it in his name, because with it, the boy would be able to do whatever he wanted, and could either expose it to the world or sell it to the highest bidder. Davey, however, feared he wouldn't be able to handle the task. Nonetheless, his master said that the young one was more stubborn than him, but he trusted him with the task, and as long as Davey completed it, he could do whatever he wanted with his creation. Back in the present, the butler insists on sending someone to accompany the lord on his journey, but Davey insists on traveling alone. Before leaving, he asks the butler to look after Amy and not let her overwork herself, ensuring she gets proper rest. The butler says it's quite fun to teach Amy, as she's not just a baron's daughter but also very intelligent, and he sees her like a granddaughter. With that, the protagonist realizes his friend is in good hands. So, he finally departs on his journey. Midway on the road, Perselk notices he's veering off course and asks if Davey is taking a shortcut. The protagonist explains that he needs to visit a place before heading to the Royal Road, a famous tourist attraction. He adds that the place is one of the few great sites in the Round Kingdom, where the entire alliance worked together to preserve and research it. After all, he's referring to the blacksmith Surtur's hometown, called the Valashad region. Davey knows Perselk was raised as Harris's daughter, and figures she must have encountered Surtur at some point. She confirms, informing him that Surtur used to say this place was built with the same materials as the holy sword Calerus, so it must be an incredible location. However, the protagonist disagrees, explaining that the place belonged to Surtur thousands of years ago, but now it belongs to Queen Linnes. Not only that, but it's full of Variettas who are all his enemies, so he needs to enter disguised, as things could get tense if they discover who he really is. The protagonist waits in line to enter the site and uses a fake identification, presenting himself as the mercenary Davey. He thinks he worked hard on this new identity, and as long as they don't recognize his face, he'll be safe. However, he ends up being stopped at the entrance. The guard says he's there to explore the recently discovered labyrinth, but tells the boy not to stick his nose where it doesn't belong, and expels him from the site. Surprised, Davey wonders what's going on. Frustrated, the protagonist just stared at the spot, lost in thought. He thought that even for a noble's land, this place was terrible. Just then, a man approached him, saying the protagonist must be from far away not to know what was happening in the region. The old man pointed at something. In the queue to enter the city, someone was paying a bribe to the guards. The old man then explained that was the only way to get into the city. Davey thought it had been a few years since the laws changed, so bribes shouldn't even exist anymore. However, the old man said the protagonist's eyes were terrifyingly cold. He then handed something to Davey, telling him to give gave it to the guards. He also said that though it was little, it was enough for Davey to get in, and advised the young man to avoid unnecessary trouble. The old man said Davey resembled his grandson, which was why he was helping him. Davey thanked the kind man for his generosity and gave him a few coins in return. After all, he realized it wasn't money the guards were truly after. Next, the protagonist approached the guard again. He then stated that collecting money from people was illegal unless it was a processing fee for large-scale purchases. The guard scoffed, calling the protagonist just a naive kid, and asked what he planned to do about it. In turn, Davey said this was their last chance to redeem themselves and avoid punishment under national law. Therefore, he told them to return all the money they had received so far and confess their crimes. While the guards laughed at the situation, even the protagonist felt a bit embarrassed, but he knew this was just standard procedure. At that moment, the chief of the guards pointed a sword at him. He said no one would care if they killed the boy right there, so he told Davey not to meddle in their affairs. Davey, however, asked if the guard didn't mind being an outlaw. The guard replied that he and his group were the law. Besides, they were following the orders of Duke Varietta. Just as he was about to attack, the old man from earlier interrupted the guard, claiming the protagonist was just a boy and didn't deserve to be punished. Annoyed, the guard, instead of attacking Davey, aimed at the old man who had interrupted him, but the protagonist intervened and disarmed the guard. Not only that, but he said attacking defenseless elders was an act even more cowardly than accepting a bribe. Furthermore, threatening a citizen of the kingdom was the same as stealing from the nation itself. Davey then took hold of the guard's sword and declared that he needed to be punished appropriately for his crimes. After dealing with the guard, he announced that the same punishment would be applied to everyone involved in the scheme. He then told the others not to complicate things further and to inform their chief about what had happened. However, instead of complying, the other guards surrounded the protagonist. Davey then stated that they had chosen the most difficult way to deal with the situation. He also said their actions were enough to have 3 entire generations of their families penalized. But since the guards didn't back down, the protagonist didn't stand idly by and attacked. However, he still gave the guards a chance. He told them to call their chief to that spot before the worst happened. Immediately afterwards, someone appeared at the scene, asking what all the commotion was about. Davey threw an identification pendant in the man's direction and told him to think carefully before taking his next step. Immediately, Viscount Garetta knelt before the prince, having recognized his identification from the pendant. Not only that, but he pleaded for forgiveness, claiming his actions were due to a lack of activity in the region. Davey stated that this region was home to the 1,000-day and 1,000-night market, and was also considered a treasure by the entire alliance, so he didn't believe that claim. The Viscount claimed that was unfair, since the prince hadn't announced an investigation of the area. Therefore, it was an abuse of power. In that case, Davey asked if the one in charge of the place wanted him to show an authorization. Annoyed, the Viscount said yes, claiming that Duke Varietta would never let something like this slide. Davey realized the Viscount wanted to make things difficult. He supposed that, being the largest state in the region, even inspectors were afraid to do their job there, fearing retaliation. With that, the Viscount tried to win over the prince with smooth talk. However, Davey asked if he hadn't heard about the recent rumors. The Viscount didn't know what the prince was talking about, so Davey declared himself bloodthirsty. As soon as he eliminated the Viscount, Davey remarked that the man had wasted his last words. Sometime later, the old man drives a cart. He tells the protagonist that 10 years ago, everything was peaceful, but then Baron Alishad of the royal family passed away. That's when refugees started appearing in the area. Soon, exploitation became a problem, and people who sided with the foreigners were punished. The old man lost his son this way. Davey then realizes that this is why the old man helped him. He reminded him of his son, not his grandson. He also says that the old man's son seemed to have been a kind person, judging by this story. Soon after, they arrive at a marked spot. Davey declares that he has finally found the ruins of Valharashad, the historic site of the Market of 1,000 Days and Nights. The old man is unsure if everything will be all right after what happened earlier, but the protagonist claims that the local duke doesn't pay much attention to what goes on there. Then the old man thanks Davey for saving him from the guards and for avenging his son. He now feels indebted to him. Davey, however, just tells the man to simply continue living a just life. As they say their goodbyes, Perselk remarks that the story he heard was a bit sad. The protagonist agrees, but claims that things will get better from now on, and he feels he has done something significant for the area. Upon entering the ruins of Valharashad, Davey is enchanted by the beauty of the place. He takes the opportunity to get a panoramic view of the surroundings. However, he didn't expect to find so much intact. Because of this, he decided to make some notes. Perselk, however, thinks it's pointless to look for anything amidst ruins that have already been excavated. Davey says that even though it seems like a waste of time, there's something there that hasn't been discovered yet. He soon notices there's a cryptogram in the area. Perselk doesn't quite understand what that is, so the protagonist explains that the place was coded to to hide something that only those who decipher the code will find. He got this idea by looking from above, as he could discern the patterns. The code was created by Surtur, and even though there were people in the past capable of deciphering it, currently, the protagonist is the only one who knows how. So, he believes no one but him could find the true treasure of the place, and all signs point to the spot indicated by the code holding something interesting. Davey realizes there's an entrance through the anvil in the center, and to enter, a special password is needed. The protagonist thinks Surtur left a will for the people of his race, in which he would give his entire fortune to the person who found his legacy. Because of this, the protagonist feels like a pirate king or something similar. Upon opening the dungeon's secret passage, he realizes that the creator of the place put a lot of effort into its construction. It has magic to resist the underground pressure, and an oxygen source was created for people to breathe inside. Davey imagines the task couldn't have been easy, and if he hadn't known Surtur, this place would probably have remained buried forever. After exploring the dungeon, the protagonist finds something. Perselk says it looks more like a residence than a dungeon. Davey remembers that Surtur proclaimed himself a forge maniac. He created this place right after Harris's death and spent the rest of his life working on just one project until his last breath. Even though his mortal body died, everything of Surtur's remains intact, just as he left it. Amidst all this, Perselk finds a room resembling an altar. Davey thinks Surtur worshipped some kind of unknown forge deity or something similar. As he tries to approach, he ends up activating something. Magic manifests from the chest stored there. Perselk says he's never seen a person's consciousness materialize with such force. The protagonist's system warns of imminent danger. However, he knows that the 1000-day blacksmith received this title after forging for 1000 consecutive days without rest. But his own race, the dwarves, called him by another name, the Devil's Blacksmith. Unlike normal blacksmiths, who simply prided themselves on striking metal forcefully, Surtur used mana to overcome the limits of normal forging. He broke through all his limits until he was recognized as a hero, and despite not completing his final work, he asked Davey to complete it in his stead. With that, the protagonist opens the chest left by Surtur and finds the nameless crimson sword, which exterminates the living, and also the blue sword, which governs the dead. Both are twin swords, but they were not completed by their creator. Anyway, Davey could see the swords as statuses and realized their power hadn't fully manifested yet. Perselk said the cries he'd heard earlier probably came from these weapons. Davey agreed, explaining that these were living swords, just like Calerus, and claimed that was so typical of Surtur. The holy sword Calerus is Surtur's greatest creation, but it was forged using the physical essence of the fencing master Harris. These two, however, are different. They were created without a specific master in mind, meaning Surtur had no one particular to wield them. As a result, the swords were made to find their masters on their own. Perselk commented that the swords didn't seem incomplete, but Davey knew that wasn't true. He said the final touches still needed to be applied. For that, he needed fire. Not just any fire, but one that burned hotter than normal. And he only knew of one place that had such a thing, the Dwarves' Forge. After leaving the area, Davey headed in another direction. A guide told him that if he followed the main road, he would soon see the plaza he was looking for. Davey thanked him and continued on his way. He then asked Perselk what she thought would happen regarding the royal summons he'd received. His friend replied that the business he'd created was very profitable, so, as stated in the letter, they intended to reward him, because in just a few months, he'd made more money than the entire kingdom in a whole year, and the taxes he paid had opened the eyes of the bigwigs. Therefore, they would likely try to convince the prince to nationalize the business, making the kingdom even wealthier. However, she knew very well that Davey already knew this, and had only asked to make the trip less boring. In turn, Davey was a bit shocked to have received so much attention from the continent, but he knew it only happened because his business had made such a huge impact. Sometime later, he arrived in his homeland and was greeted by the chief chamberlain. Davey remarked that it had been a while since he last saw Besfus. Besfus replied that he, the prince, had grown, not just in height, but also in stature, thanks to his new ventures. In turn, Davey said he believed the heavens had blessed him, and he was just making the most of it. Changing the subject, Besfus mentioned that some important books had recently been stolen from the palace. This had enraged the king, leading to all related nobles having their titles revoked and facing imminent execution. He also added that the king had already retired for the night, and if Davey wished to see him, it would be best to wait until the next day. Davey thought that even if the information had been gathered with Marquis Paletris at the center of it all, such significant progress wouldn't have been possible without the king's involvement. He also thought that the king had apparently been holding back, back, but now had decided to go all in at once. Amidst these thoughts, Davey bumped into someone. Prince Carlos had decided to show up to see him. Even though he didn't enjoy seeing him again, Davey said that Carlos apparently wanted to speak with him alone and asked the butler to leave them alone. Despite his concern, the butler obeyed Davey. Then, Carlos said that Davey had become much more arrogant just because he'd succeeded in a business venture. He then told him not to feel proud, claiming that Davey had merely gotten lucky and any commoner in his place would have done a better job. But Davey replied that Carlos must be quite envious to say such a thing in person. Davey said that unlike him, Carlos was just an idiot who couldn't do anything without running to his mother first. Annoyed, Carlos said that Davey must have gone crazy to insult him like that and tried to attack Davey, but Davey pushed him away, saying that Carlos was the one who had gone crazy. He also said that Carlos was delusional, since everyone around him flattered him only because of his position, and claimed that without it, he wouldn't have such an inflated ego. Davey stated that he had been able to achieve things on his own, unlike Carlos, who had everything handed to him on a silver platter and didn't strive for anything. Furious, Carlos tried to attack Davey once more. In turn, Davey thought that if Carlos wasn't such an idiot, he wouldn't have shot that arrow 6 years ago. Remembering this made Davey slightly irritated. So instead of dodging, he decided to counterattack. And with that, he sent Carlos to the ground. Not only that, but he also said that Carlos's negative words reflected poorly on the king. He also pointed out that Carlos had a habit of calling him a commoner, but then reminded him that half the blood running through his veins was the king's, the most important man in the kingdom. Immediately afterward, he took the opportunity to subdue Carlos. However, Carlos stood up and didn't seem satisfied. With that, Davey flicked Carlos's forehead, which was enough to make him cry out in pain. Carlos, his face bleeding, threatened Davey. Davey, however, asked if Carlos hadn't taken enough of a beating. At that, Carlos ran off, vowing to get his revenge in the future. Perselk asked if Davey had punished the audacious prince enough. With a smile, Davey replied that he had only been playing with Carlos. Startled, Perselk realized Davey had actually enjoyed what he did. She told him never to laugh like that again, as he might end up scaring someone. Davey hadn't realized this, thinking it was just a bad habit. Anyway, he said he had put a curse on Carlos, one that couldn't be cured even with magic. Perselk asked what exactly he had done. Davey replied that he had simply given his dear brother a gift, one that everyone would witness at tomorrow's meeting. The next day, the nobles gathered in the royal hall. They discussed how best to profit from and use the money raised by Prince Davey's business. The king himself, however, had not yet spoken. Perselk observed that the nobles were discussing Davey without even involving him, as if he weren't present at all. She didn't see Marquis Patrice, the only noble who had shown any empathy for Davey, unlike the others who only cared about money. This made her worried about the direction of the conversation and the future of the country. Meanwhile, Davey remarked that next time he might open a restaurant, having heard that the most profitable businesses involved food and water. He added that he had no experience with such things. The king then spoke, stating that before any decisions were made, Prince Davey must be rewarded, as he was the one who had brought these blessings to the entire kingdom. He thanked the prince on behalf of the whole kingdom. Davey, for his part, said he had done nothing more than his duty. Even so, the king claimed that Davey had achieved something greater than anything in the past 10 years, promising to reward him with anything he requested. However, Davey knew that no one there truly intended to grant him a real reward. He said he didn't have anything in mind at the moment and asked for some time to decide what he wanted. The king called it a wise decision and granted the prince all the time he needed. Following this, the nobles resumed their meeting, discussing the best way to invest or not in the lunar plant business. Seeing this, Perselk said it was worse than she had imagined. Among the others, Duke Varietta, leader of the nobles, spoke up. He stated that first, one thing needed to be verified. He pointed out that everyone was excited about the business, but had forgotten to evaluate basic details beforehand. Varietta argued that while the business was revolutionary, they shouldn't try to tie it to the nation without even consulting its creator. Hearing this, Duke Ferrandis claimed that no one held a higher status than royalty, but Varietta questioned if Ferrandis would give everything he owned to the kingdom for the well-being of his nation. The noble didn't even need to speak, as the answer was more than obvious. So, Duke Varietta declared that everything would be decided by Lord Davey, and no one had the right to interfere. Perselk told Davey that someone was finally helping him, but Davey knew it wasn't quite like that. Varietta continued, saying that if they were to forcibly nationalize the business, there would be resistance, and no one would want to be an entrepreneur in such a situation. Davey, for his part, stated that this wasn't all Varietta had to say. The Duke confirmed the prince was right, and said a mediator would be of great help given the current state of affairs. He then revealed he had a letter, claiming it was from High Priest Valsius of the Sacred Kingdom. The letter requested Prince Prince Davey's visit to the Sacred Kingdom, as they wanted to verify his stigma manifestation and reward him with the title of saint. A duke named Rhonda called this ridiculous, saying they couldn't send a prince to the Sacred Kingdom. However, another noble argued that they couldn't override the Sacred Kingdom's decisions, as they served the god Priya directly. Rhonda countered that the Round Kingdom was not subordinate to the Sacred Kingdom, and sending the prince there would be like offering him as tribute. Davey, in turn, said they were overthinking it, stating that nothing particularly special would happen if his stigma was recognized by the Sacred Kingdom. Varietta argued that the prince wasn't seeing the full picture, and as royalty, he had obligations to fulfill. He added that they had nothing to gain by angering the Sacred Kingdom, and then suggested doing as they requested. In that case, the nobles asked about the prince's current business. The duke explained that unfortunately, if the prince became a saint in the Sacred Kingdom, by law, he would be prohibited from governing his region. Therefore, a new lord would have to be appointed for the Hines territory. Hearing this, the nobles understood the duke's intention and began to agree with him. Davey also realized the nobles' true intentions and found the situation had just become more interesting. Varietta stated that currently, the Hines region was the most important point in the entire kingdom. Because of this, they couldn't just put anyone in the position of lord. He could only think of one person to take the post. He then nominated Carlos, the second prince, to take over the territory in Davey's absence. Davey thought this made sense. After all, Carlos was Varietta's grandson. With him in the position, the duke could privatize the business and take the profits for himself. Not only that, but Davey knew the other nobles' intentions weren't any different, as they all wanted a piece of his business. Then, Carlos entered the royal hall. He knelt before the king, making sure everyone saw it, including his older brother, Prince Davey. However, something unusual happens. In front of the king and all the nobles, Carlos behaves very strangely. Without knowing why, he makes animal sounds when he tries to speak. Instead of being praised, he ends up humiliated at the worst possible moment. Purcell finally understands what Davey did to his brother the night before. Davey then remarks that she's laughing too much. However, Carlos's grandfather finds no humor in it, asking how he dares behave like this at such an important meeting. Carlos tries to justify his actions, but every time he opens his mouth, he imitates a different animal, unable to hide his embarrassment. Furious, the king says he doesn't want to hear another word from him and orders the guards to remove Carlos. Not only that, but he declares that until further notice, Carlos will be on probation, without possibility of appeal. Still trying to justify himself, Carlos only brings more shame, and his behavior also affects his family members. To make matters worse, as he's being forcibly removed, Carlos's hat falls off his head. Immediately, everyone is shocked by what they see. Carlos, known for his long hair, has gone bald overnight, and he tried to hide it with his hat. But now everyone knows the truth. Seizing the opportunity, Davey states that his brother isn't mature enough to hold his position as the lord of the Hines territory. This leaves Varietta incredibly irritated. Not only that, but Davey asks if the count's position is above the king's. Seeing Varietta's astonished face, the protagonist asks another question, challenging Varietta if this kingdom belongs to him. The count says no, believing the prince has misinterpreted him. He also states that all his actions are for the good of the kingdom. Davey in turn asks why the count has a letter from the Holy Kingdom that even the king hasn't seen. He also asks why the count is siding with the nobles but pretending not to, thus stating he doesn't trust his words. Cornered, Varietta asks what the prince is suggesting. Davey says that all the count tried to do was sell this country according to the Holy Kingdom's request. Not only that, but he also wanted to use the chance to take possession of Davey's business. Davey claims the count is no different from the other nobles and says he has a solution to deal with the Holy Kingdom. The king asks what the prince has in mind. Davey replies that all inhabitants of the Holy Kingdom are human, and furthermore, even the high priest is not above the king. Next, the protagonist uses a crystal ball to make a call, communicating remotely with Father Velium from the Holy Kingdom's administrative department. Davey apologizes for the sudden call, but asks if the Pope has decided on the matter he mentioned earlier. Before hearing the answer, the protagonist knows that even in a holy land, humans need to conduct business. And even though the High Priest is an important figure, he contacted the Holy Kingdom's highest authority directly, the Pope. Father Velium says the High Priest acted alone, without the Pope's authorization, and promises that this will never happen again. With that, the meeting concludes, and the letter sent by the High Priest proves useless. Alone, the protagonist takes the opportunity to thank the priest for his help. Velium explains that while it wouldn't be bad for them, they never actually considered asking the prince to come to the Holy Kingdom. Furthermore, in the long run, it wouldn't be a significant benefit, as Davey is more useful in his current position. Also, Davey told the Pope that if he stayed away from the Hines region, the cultivation of the plants would be interrupted, and the Pope doesn't want that. Plus, he also promised to send a special shipment to the Holy Kingdom. Father Velium thanks him for such great cooperation, and says the Pope is interested in continuing to buy large quantities. Davey knows there's nothing sacred about this arrangement. It's a materialistic deal, but he doesn't care about that. After all, he created this business from the start to make a profit, so as long as they pay, he's willing to sell. He just wants to make some good, easy money. And ultimately, he only cares about good results. Seizing the opportunity with his crystal ball, the protagonist calls Amy. She cries for help until the butler interrupts, telling Amy she shouldn't show weakness. The butler apologizes for this, saying he's taking care of things at home. Davey says the meeting ended well and he'll soon return to Hines. Meanwhile, the butler mentions that the guests have been moved to temporary tents, and he's also taken care of the construction permits, which will begin soon. However, there's a problem with the infrastructure improvements. The butler doesn't believe everything the Lord requested can be accomplished so easily because there isn't enough time. The protagonist thinks that even though he revived a territory, Hines has been stuck in time, and its local technology is quite outdated. Therefore, the butler claims that finishing everything requested would take 10 to 20 years, as the problem can't simply be solved with money. Davey realizes that despite having money, he has nowhere to use it, so he claims it's time to start his second venture. He says he'll rely on the skills and technology of the continent's greatest engineers. After all, he's prepared an offer impossible to refuse. Basically, the protagonist intends to trade corn for diamonds, and nothing beats a trade item that offers a great return with low risk. He's referring to rocks. Sometime later, Davey travels to the territory of the Yellow Rock tribe. This is a village of dwarves located in the northern region of the kingdom. Dwarves, often called little engineers, are known for being stronger than humans and for their high resistance to heat. In addition to being considered perfect for engineering, and unlike elves who are merely legends, dwarves have some contact with humans. However, they don't have much interest in other species beyond trade, so only important humans like nobles and royal representatives interact with them. Being promoted to the point of being able to enter a dwarf tribe was the reward the protagonist requested from the king. Instead of asking to be king, he decided to take another path, knowing that if he hadn't made this specific request, he wouldn't be received so easily by the dwarves. After all, the little ones aren't very easy to deal with. When he made his request to the king, he and other nobles were wary, as angering the dwarves could close the doors with them forever. Davey said he was fully aware of this, and that's why he requested such a reward. Furthermore, he said he was confident he could at least pass through the gates, despite the skepticism of the others. Purcell says that when the request was made, he noticed all the nobles thought the same thing. Everyone wondered what on earth Davey would do next. Not only that, but they also sent several soldiers with him to keep an eye on him during his expedition in the land of the dwarves. But they are right about one thing. The protagonist indeed plans something big, and this could put the nobles in a tough spot. As soon as they reach the Yellow Rock tribe, the prince's representative announces his arrival and requests permission to enter. One of the sentinel dwarves named Gerut says he's never seen the prince before. The protagonist formally introduces himself and says he's there to make an irresistible offer. Looking at the prince's carriage, the dwarf immediately recognizes the cargo and knows the protagonist isn't bluffing. However, he says his tribe is facing an internal problem, so they aren't in a position to take part in any agreement. Even so, he will allow the prince to enter, but he tells him to proceed on foot and leave the horses outside. Upon entering the dwarf village, Gerut says the elder will see the prince. Soon, he takes him to the elder's quarters. Davey notices that the place is small but cozy. Inside, the 8th elder, named Golda, awaits him. Just by looking at the dwarf, Davey senses he isn't in the mood for conversation. However, he finds it strange that there's only one leader, as he's certain multiple dwarves lead the tribe, so he thinks it's better to introduce himself before asking questions. With that, the protagonist makes a more than formal introduction, greeting the leader in the way dwarves greet each other. Golda is surprised. He thought humans had no idea how dwarves greet one another, and he concludes that he's in the presence of an honorable human. He then says it's very rare to receive someone like this, so he asks the prince to sit. He says all the other elders are busy at the moment, which is why he's the only one in the meeting room. Getting straight to the point, Golda says the prince must know they usually make agreements outside the village, so he asks what motivates his visit. Davey says that formal trades are scheduled for a few months from now, and he isn't there for that, but rather to make some personal requests. He also says he brought some gifts with him, such as meat, beer, and other provisions. Golda says he likes humans who know how to show proper respect to dwarves, and above all, he really likes beer. However, he says that unfortunately, his tribe tribe is in a complicated situation and cannot attend to external demands. Furthermore, he cannot go into details. However, since the prince has come from so far away, he will allow him to stay for a few days to rest. But he tells him to behave, because if he causes any problems, he will be expelled immediately. Afterward, Golda leaves the place. The protagonist, in turn, takes the opportunity to check the dwarf's status. With this, he discovers that Golda was forced by the others to be the only one to meet with him. In a way, Golda liked the respect and gifts the human demonstrated. However, Golda's greatest frustration stems from the Flame of Beginnings, which is known as the sacred sword of the dwarves. In the past, Surtur had mentioned creating an item with the dwarves. Back then, he wasn't very skilled, so the item's quality wasn't the best. However, they both felt so accomplished that they celebrated for days after finishing the creation, which was quite significant for Surtur. Back in the present, the protagonist is staying in the dwarf village. He says he didn't expect to hear about the Blaze of Beginning sword there. Davey once heard that this sword didn't have a sharp blade. It was created by Surtur in partnership with the dwarves, their first collaboration as species. As a symbol of their unity, the sword wasn't capable of cutting. Moreover, this sword carries Surtur's memories. What's most interesting is that it's actually a prototype, the first version of Calerus. Even though it was made differently from other swords, the general production method is the same, as it involves creating items using mana. This method unites the material and non-material worlds. Furthermore, the materials themselves, like the hammer used and the iron treated, are also unique. Basically, this method requires a blacksmith to seek knowledge beyond their current understanding. Given how close-minded dwarves can be, they wouldn't even attempt to create something like this. That's why they must be racking their brains trying to unravel this production method, and that must be the problem Golda mentioned. But now, the protagonist wants to step out for a bit, because besides borrowing the dwarves' skills to develop his territory, there's another reason for his visit. He wants to gain access to the Great Forge, the same one created by the dwarves using intense techniques. Davey had already anticipated resistance when trying to talk to the dwarves, so he created a plan beforehand. After leaving his quarters, the protagonist heads to a tavern. Golda finds him and asks what the prince is doing there. Davey wants to know if Golda has some free time. The dwarf replies that he can't do his job properly if he doesn't rest well. Besides, his brother Golgoda drove out all the elders, which is why he's drinking. At that, the protagonist asks to join him for a drink. Not only that, but Davey says he's heard dwarf liquor is very strong and asks to try some. Some dwarves say the prince doesn't know what he's getting himself into. They also say he seems quite reckless for asking to try the liquor. Davey, however, can only think that the dwarves are too noisy. A waiter serves the drink, but states that dwarf liquor is much stronger than humans are used to. The protagonist says that's nothing and downs the glass of liquor in one go, claiming that all liquors should be like that. The dwarves are impressed to see this, as they thought the boy would pass out after drinking. Purcelk asks if that's really all there is to it. Davey says the liquor is strong, but the taste is bad. It's not like he usually drinks much though, but he knows one thing. Drinks and bets are two things dwarves enjoy most. With that, he proposes a drinking contest against Golda to see who can drink more liquor. Golda says dwarves never disrespect someone who can hold their liquor. He accepts the bet and says he'll pay for everything they drink, so the waiter can serve freely. Even without knowing if he'll win, the protagonist thinks betting is the best way to forge bonds and get what he wants from the dwarf elder. In turn, Golda says that if he loses, the prince will have to leave their village immediately. Otherwise, he's willing to grant any wish the prince desires. Golda adds that it's nothing personal, but while he appreciates the prince's visit, he'd much prefer it under different circumstances. For Davey, this is great. After all, the dwarf took the bait. The next day, Golda feels frustrated for losing the bet. He never imagined he'd lose to a human, and now he'll have to grant his request. Davey thinks he doesn't get drunk thanks to his sacred mana, but the dwarf doesn't need to know that. He learned this from one of his swordsmanship masters. The hero who united the Murim world of Zhongyuan, named Cheonma Dokojun, was not only skilled in combat, but also known for his heavy drinking. Even Daphne, an immortal saint who loved to drink, swore not to get involved with Cheonma Dokojun when it came to alcohol. The problem was that while learning swordsmanship from him, drinking became part of Davey's routine. His master forced him to consume alcohol as it was part of his swordsmanship technique, and this only made the training harder for the protagonist. Compared to someone like that, the dwarves are nothing. Anyway, Golda intends to honor the bet and asks what the prince desires. Before that, Davey asks if the tribe's turmoil is due to the Blaze of Beginnings. Golda says yes, explaining that the sword was being protected by the dwarves but ended up breaking. The sword passed through several tribes before reaching them, and his father was the last one responsible for looking after it. But since he passed away sooner than expected, the responsibility fell to Golda Golda and his older brother, Golgoda. The dwarf tells the protagonist to feel free to ask about other matters too, as he's open to conversation. As Davey expected, by being treated with courtesy, the dwarf is returning the favor. He thinks it was good to have drunk with Golda, as it caught his attention. Next, he mentions that although he isn't a master, he possesses forging skills, and asks if he can participate as an assistant in the project involving the broken sword. Sometime later, Davey is led to the central forge. Upon arriving, Perselk finds it incredible that the dwarves managed to build all of this without mana or alchemy. However, some dwarves aren't pleased with a human's presence in the forge, thinking Golda must have gone mad to agree to it. Davey even feels bad for putting the dwarven leader through this, but it's at this moment that Golgoda appears, asking his brother what happened that led him to bring the human to the forge. Golda replies that he lost a bet and just wants to see the forge. The dwarves, however, insist this is the main forge, so Golda must still be drunk to agree to such a thing. But he asserts that's not the case, swearing on his title as an elder, and asks the others to trust the prince, just as he did. At this, Golgoda tells the other dwarves to simply get back to work. Since Golda is also an elder, if he decided this, the others must respect it. Golgoda then says he will allow Davey's presence, but warns he'll hammer his head if he does anything foolish. Davey simply says he won't forget the warning. Sometime later, Davey sees the sword itself, which stands 2 meters tall and 30 centimeters wide, not much different from a decoration. The dwarves are trying to repair it using hot iron and hammering. However, Perselk notices Davey is focused on something else and asks what it is. Davey says the sword can't be fixed. He explains it was made using a process similar to crafting a holy sword, but since it was never a complete item like a holy sword, it didn't last long. And despite regretting it, he knows that's just how things are. Golgoda works intensely on the item. Seeing this, his brother suggests he take a break so he doesn't overdo it. Even Davey notices that if they continue like this, it won't work. In the midst of this, another group of dwarves appears. They are from the Black Rock tribe, and their leader, named Thors, says the Yellowstone dwarves will only end up completely destroying the sword. Thors comments that Golgoda is doing well for someone who destroyed a sacred item, adding that he never liked the idea of Golgoda being in charge of the sword. He also says it's not too late to hand the sword over to the Black Rock tribe, claiming their smiths will take much better care of it. The Yellowstone elders respond that even the best smiths of the rival tribe wouldn't be able to fix the sword so easily. Thors retorts that they are mistaken, pointing out that they've been working on the sword for a long time without any progress, and therefore might end up destroying it completely. He also states that the elders of the other tribes have already agreed that the sword needs to leave the Yellowstone tribe, as they can't leave this item in the wrong hands. After all, things would have been different if the father of the Gord brothers were still alive. Hearing these words, Golgoda looks desolate. With that, Thors declares there's nothing more to see there, and he will take the sword to his tribe, whether the Yellowstone dwarves like it or not. However, Davey speaks up, asking if Golgoda is truly a master smith. Seeing this, Thors scoffs that Golgoda must really be finished, having even found a human friend and brought him to the central forge. At this, Golda tells Davey to step back and not get involved in this matter, but Davey says that a true master smith feels the spirits in each of their works and respects every single one of them. However, he claims Golgoda threw that mentality away from the beginning. Then, Davey takes the dwarf's hammer and uses it on the sword. In shock, the dwarves think the sword is now completely ruined. Some even try to pull the human away from the sword, so he doesn't make the tribe's situation even worse. However, Davey asks if Golgoda truly wants to resolve this situation. Golgoda says yes. Davey then states that having a big ego won't solve the problem, especially when this sword has protected their small village for 3,000 years. Instead of letting go of an item that fulfilled its duties, Golgoda is imposing his own desires on it, trying to forcibly repair it. Davey claims that an item that was the pillar of the village shouldn't be treated this way, and anyone who doesn't understand this shouldn't be called a master smith. Even though he knows he's standing before the best artisans on the continent, Davey thinks the dwarves still don't understand that this item cannot be repaired, so he picks up the sword in front of him and throws it into the blazing furnace before everyone's eyes. The protagonist knew that every master artisan's creation held a soul, and no one could truly call themselves a master without respecting that. Surtur used to say that if he ever found someone brave enough to disrespect that soul, he should crush them. But instead of doing that, Davey threw the sword into the forge. As they watched the sword being consumed by the fire, some enraged dwarves threatened to kill the prince. However, Davey stated that given the sword's condition, this was the right thing to do. He added that the dwarves shouldn't insult this sacred item any longer, especially since his master had created it, making it deeply connected to him as well. Furthermore, Davey claimed that no one there truly understood the actual purpose of a sacred item. He explained that the sword had died a long time ago, and the dwarves weren't confident enough to create new ones. So, he asked if they were truly proud to call themselves a race of master artisans. Furious, the dwarves demanded to know who Davey thought he was to speak to them that way. Golgotha interrupted the argument, saying that the dwarves were only making themselves look worse. Davey realized that the elder had already begun to understand that the sword's life was over, and trying to repair it would be a waste of time. However, even though they knew they lacked the skills to recreate the item from scratch, they didn't want to admit it. They had eventually come to the conclusion that the sword would lose its meaning if it wasn't passed down through generations, but they were now realizing that this approach wasn't ideal. Thors retorted that the prince was only saying this because the sword had no connection to humans. Even the best dwarven artisan couldn't recreate a legendary item. He added that Davey shouldn't be so arrogant, as no human, not even him, could accomplish such a feat. Perselk noted that he had never seen these stubborn dwarves so shaken. In response, the protagonist told Thors he was wrong to say he couldn't craft a legendary item. Immediately, all the dwarves present were shocked to hear this. Even Perselk was left speechless. Some dwarves muttered that even among their own, no one was that skilled, so a human claiming to create a legendary item was absurdly difficult to believe. Moreover, they believed that only Surtur could ever craft such an item. The protagonist, in turn, told them they could continue spouting nonsense or simply watch him work and learn something. With that, Davey began to work in front of the dwarves. He thought that among all the skills he learned from his master, one in particular stood out, and with it, he had managed to master several other abilities. Surtur was a great teacher, and because of that, the protagonist learned a lot from him. Even so, he hadn't reached the same level of skill as his master, but what mattered was that he had managed to create many items, some even better than the dwarves' sacred sword. After all, it was just a prototype. As he watched the protagonist work, Thors noticed the prince was mixing cadmium steel and mithril alloys, and immediately told him to stop. However, Davey replied that unlike them, he wasn't constrained by common sense in creation. He claimed that the rules the dwarves had created didn't apply to him. Furthermore, he argued that common sense didn't truly exist, as the possibilities for innovation were endless, provided one changed their approach. One could combine various processes to create new things, even if apostle was what they called the dwarves. The dwarves watched the protagonist work, disbelieving what he was doing. After some time working, a sword was created. Davey showed them the item, stating that it had been quite easy to create. The dwarves realized the protagonist had melted the old sword and forged a new one. Upon seeing the item, they were dazzled by the creation. Not only that, but the protagonist believed his new sword's strength was far greater than the previous one. Perselk praised his work, and Davey replied that if they threw out the idea of common sense, anything could be created. He explained that the most important thing was the texture, as the sword would absorb mana on its own. In short, it was a structure that made mana circulate throughout the sword, very similar to the mana circle inscribed on his own body. Next, he asked if Elder Golgotha recognized the technique he had just demonstrated. Davey explained that only a few items could self-heal without the aid of mana, which made them different from artifacts that became useless once their mana ran out. Perselk noted that despite the tumultuous start, Davey had won over the dwarves' hearts. The protagonist then stated that although he had started creating the sword, he wouldn't be the one to finish it, for even the blacksmith of 1,000 days had only created the item's base and left the rest to the dwarves, so he would do the same. Golgotha replied that they didn't have the necessary skills, but Davey simply told them to learn. Immediately, the dwarven elder asked if the prince could teach them. He said yes, but not for free. He then proposed to begin as soon as his current task was completed. Some dwarves were truly impressed by the protagonist's swords. Then Perselk says Davey might be accused of blasphemy, but Davey replies that with his stigma, he's not worried about it. He asks what Golgotha thinks about it, and the elder doesn't quite know what to think. Davey states that he didn't make these swords, but he will be the one to give them the final touches. The dwarves mention that the blacksmith who created these swords passed away a long time ago. Davey knows this very well. These swords have been aging while stored for so long, and because of this, their power has increased more than tenfold since they were first forged. When this type of mana processing technique is used, the sword needs to be intentionally stored to become stronger over time. Therefore, the new sacred sword will need to be left untouched for at least a few months, as the time can vary. This worries the protagonist, as he doesn't know how he'll give such items their final touches, especially since he doesn't even have the necessary materials. However, since he's in the dwarves' central forge, he considers asking them for what he needs, as that was the main reason for his visit. Golgotha says he's willing to help and authorizes the prince to use the forge and its materials as much as he wishes. He adds that even if his own skills are lacking, he's recognized the protagonist's talent and believes everything will be in good hands. Davey knows that forges are personal items usually forbidden to other blacksmiths, so being lent something like this is truly unusual. This means the dwarves genuinely want to learn the protagonist's techniques, and if that wasn't clear already, it certainly became clear now as Golgotha appeared with an item. Perselk asks if it's a bone. Davey says it's not a common bone, but rather the bone of an unknown ancient dragon. Golgotha claims there's nothing more precious than this, stating that the item is a family heirloom, passed down through generations because no one had the skills to use it. The protagonist becomes very excited, as he never imagined he would see a dragon bone in such a place. However, a dwarf draws attention to something. He says that if the prince takes both the dragon bone and the elder's personal forge, it could cause a problem. So, he offers his own forge instead of Golgotha's, telling Davey he can take whatever he wants. Not only that, but several dwarves start arguing over who will help the protagonist with this project. They begin offering various items and materials to the prince, claiming they also have family heirlooms to offer. Sometime later, the protagonist stands before a pile of various items. Perselk then asks if he has everything he needs. Davey says yes, and thanks the dwarves. Golgotha says he'd like to help more, but explains that there are rules blacksmiths must follow. In any case, he leaves the prince free to work, and in the meantime, he will study the techniques Davey has already taught. Now that he has everything he needs, the protagonist wants to get to work. A flashback shows that in the past, Miss Bean was furious and wanted to unleash all her anger on Davey. Surtur, however, wanted to know why she was so annoyed with the boy. The Hall of Heroes looked much like a paradise. It was created by the hero's subconscious and served as a resting place for them in the afterlife. Thanks to Odin's ability to create dragons, Davey had the chance to touch an unknown dragon bone. Surtur really caused trouble for the goddess of mages. He had used a dragon as an ingredient to create the sacred sword, which displeased Miss Bean greatly. But instead of being angry with him, she blamed Davey because he was tasked with overseeing the process in his master's place. As a result, the protagonist didn't like having to learn how to use sacred relics, as he thought they didn't even exist in the real world. But back in the present, he realizes he was wrong. He intends to apply fire resistance magic to his creation. However, he knows that if he makes even a single mistake, everything will go wrong, and the sword will melt. Perselk watches the process closely and finds what he sees beautiful. For the red sword, which used to be blood red, suddenly took on the color of a transparent ruby. As for the blue sword, it resembled a supernova in the night sky, as if it had connected with Davey. In addition to seeing how much the swords had changed, he also noticed Davey's intense concentration. Indeed, the protagonist is, as he knows what will happen if he makes a mistake during the process. But he knows what he's doing, and after intense work on the swords, he finally manages to complete both of them. After finishing his work on the swords, the protagonist felt he should give them names. Perselk asked if he had anything in mind. He replied that as soon as he saw the two, the names came to him. He then declared that from now on, their names would be Azure and Carmesum. Along with this, he also checked the sword's new stats. Perselk remarked that the names were awful, noting Davey's lack of creativity. However, he was more interested in their attributes than such minor details. So, he decided to test the Carmesum sword. Perselk asked what he was doing. Davey said he was just testing the cut. Immediately, a whetstone in front of him began to melt. Perselk observed that Davey hadn't even used force to strike the target, yet the stone was cut in half. Next, Davey decided to test Azure, but this time, he didn't strike any target. However, Perselk noticed it wasn't for nothing. The sword had cut mana in the air. The protagonist confirmed that everything was as it should be, as Azure was designed to cut things that don't exist in the physical realm. He was therefore amazed by the sword's final quality. Now that everything was ready, he could finally leave. Outside, some dwarves were waiting. Davey asked what they wanted. The dwarves explained they had secured the area so no one would bother him while he worked. They mentioned the prince had been inside for 4 days straight, and they were worried since he hadn't come out even to eat, nor had he responded when they knocked on the door. Perselk commented that Davey had become obsessive about finishing the swords, but found it very interesting to observe him at work. Davey asked why, but Perselk preferred not to say. Anyway, the dwarves asked to see the finished swords. As they looked at them, some even cried with emotion, appearing like devotees before a sacred artifact. This wasn't strange, given their passion for crafting items as blacksmiths. Witnessing a masterpiece being created was truly moving. A few weeks passed, and the protagonist offered to teach the dwarves. He shared everything he had learned from Surtur about crafting weapons. Not only that, but he also taught the dwarves how to combine metal and mana for better results. Davey, however, had to be patient, as the dwarves were quite rough, and the technique he wanted to impart required a certain delicacy to master. However, the moment the dwarves set aside their pride, they became even more passionate about their work. Some looked as if they were holding a hammer for the first time, so full of enthusiasm they were. To take a break from the forges, the protagonist went to enjoy some fresh air. Golgotha accompanied him and invited the prince for a drink. He explained that this drink was more suitable for humans than the liquor dwarves usually drank. Despite that, Golgotha wanted to talk about something else. The protagonist already guessed what it was about and apologized for what happened to the whetstone, but the elder wasn't interested in discussing it. Golgotha knew the prince had come there not only to complete the swords, but also to secure the dwarves' strength in building his territory, and he asserted that dwarves never forget a favor. Although not as skilled as the prince, Golgotha stated he would help him with anything he wished. He felt they were indebted to the prince, and with that, everyone from the Yellow Rock tribe would assist him. Therefore, Golgotha swore by the Iron God that he would stand by Davey for whatever he needed. Thus, the protagonist felt his mission there was accomplished. Soon after, one of the dwarves appeared looking for the elder. He said an intruder was hidden in the village, and they needed to deal with the problem. Golgotha was surprised by this information, but in the middle of their conversation, an object was thrown in his direction. However, the protagonist managed to intervene in time, preventing the elder from being hit. He noticed it was a red knife that had been thrown, finding it very strange. Meanwhile, in the queen's chambers, her son Carlos was furious with Davey. After all, thanks to the protagonist, he had gone bald and couldn't stop involuntarily imitating animals. Every time he opened his mouth, Carlos would emit an unpleasant sound. Unable to control it, he took out his anger on the people and objects around him. Although he didn't know how, he was certain Davey had caused all of this, as everything had happened right after their last encounter. Carlos's maids ended up suffering at his hands. Believing everyone was laughing at him behind his back, he mercilessly attacked the women, claiming even they were underestimating him. His excessive rage caused Carlos to overreact, and innocent bystanders ended up getting hurt. However, someone watched what he was doing and seemed to enjoy the situation. Carlos demanded to know who was observing him. The mysterious man said he hadn't introduced himself yet. As he approached, he startled the maids but introduced himself as Pass, asking the prince to remember his name. He knew Carlos had been quite disappointed lately, but he had something that might be of interest. With that, Pace revealed himself to be a vampire. Not only that, but he showed that he had captured Shirley and had kept her prisoner all this time. Startled, Carlos asked what he wanted. Pace explained that someone had apparently played a trick on Carlos, but he would fix it right now. Immediately, the prince stopped making the strange sounds, and Pace told him to consider it a favor. Carlos said he still didn't know who he was dealing with, but Pace assured him he shouldn't worry about that. He only told the prince that he needed to form a contract with him, because that way he could deal with the human he hated so much. As tempting as the offer was, Carlos stated that his half-brother possessed a stigma, and moreover, someone was protecting him. Despite this, Pace declared that Davey was still just a human. Carlos asked if Pace wasn't human either. Pace replied that Carlos would find out sooner or later. He also mentioned that he had already sent one of his vassals after Davey, and most likely, he should have already eliminated the prince. Back with the protagonist, he dodged enemy attacks and realized that the thrown knives were not ordinary. Even Perselk came to the same conclusion. Davey noted that this was a blood knife, and he knew there was only one race with that ability. From afar, he spotted a creature and thought this monster had the power to use various different blood-based abilities. This power came from vampires who absorbed blood energy and used it to their advantage. The dwarves were frightened to see the monster. Unlike them, the protagonist was excited that a high-level creature had come so far to find him, and now he wanted to discover more about it. Amidst this, the creature used its power, which further scared the dwarves. The monster charged an ability and unleashed an energy blast that caused tremendous damage to the ground, sending the dwarves flying. But the protagonist used his abilities to create a shield around them. The creature approached immediately afterward, standing face to face with Davey. He, however, didn't understand this behavior. Even so, he was extremely curious and realized he would have to fight to discover more about the enemy. After being attacked, the dwarves are sidelined. Meanwhile, the protagonist faces off against the enemy. Not only that, but the monster stares back at him. Right away, Davey comments that his opponent seems pretty animated. And sarcastically, he asks if it thinks it's a real predator or something. Immediately, the protagonist notices an aura of blood. He knows that even among vampires, only high-level ones can use this ability. So, this enemy is, at the very least, at an expert level. Perselk tells Davey to be careful, as they've realized this enemy is much stronger than normal magical beasts. However, the protagonist isn't worried about it, saying that even if that's the case, the monster is still just an animal that moves by instinct. The beast roars as it sees the protagonist approach, but Davey hits it, sending the enemy flying into the air. The monster itself didn't even try to react. At this, the protagonist thinks the opportunity is perfect. With the enemy still airborne, he prepares to use magic and pulls the crimson sword from a magic portal. Davey says you have to saddle a horse to test its speed, meaning you can only know if a weapon is good by testing it in combat. With that, the protagonist performs several consecutive strikes, and the enemy is left completely unable to react. A flashback shows that during the peak of the Murim's Central Plains, the high-ranking officials of that sect were corrupt. They restricted martial artists and caused people to starve. The protagonist stood before the man who unified the Murim under a single sword. However, the only thing he could think of him was that he seemed to be just any ordinary drunk. Regardless, the man left behind 88 sword forms. This swordsman joined forces with the sword god Harris and evolved them to suit his combat style. Back in the present, the protagonist says that a man always needs tools. He sees the enemy react to the damage it suffered and concludes that the sword is truly incredible. Perselk, however, warns that the monster isn't dead yet. Davey realizes that the monster's abilities are similar to those of a lich. The creature is hiding its immortality core nearby. It can regenerate infinitely as long as the core isn't broken. The monster will also be destroyed if its main body is shattered into so many pieces that it can no longer revive, or if it's exposed to a large amount of sacred power. But that's not something easy to do. Davey asks if Perselk knows anything about how a magical beast could gain immortality at the level of a high-tier vampire. They say that the fact the monster managed to use blood energy isn't natural. With that, Davey realizes he won't get answers easily. The creature survived, and since it has the ability to revive, the core must have been given by a vampire lord. But the protagonist wonders why such a vampire lord would choose a demonic beast. Since finding out the truth will be quite difficult, the protagonist decides to just finish off the opponent quickly. He uses the Azure Sword to try and destroy the monster's core. But Perselk says that won't work, because apparently the creature can even break the system's balance. Davey doesn't understand why. After all, you can even kill a deity with these swords. Plus, they've aged for a long time and become very strong, so there shouldn't be an enemy so powerful that it can't be defeated by them. Anyway, he wants to think about that later, because right now he has to solve the problem. Seeing movement, the protagonist knows the enemy is on the move, but he launches a preemptive attack and tells his opponent to hide better next time. Amidst this, a vampire manifests. It immediately lunges towards the protagonist, surprising him. However, it doesn't take long for the enemy to regret that decision, as he immediately realizes he's no match for the protagonist. Davey chases after the enemy, making him flee in fear of being caught. However, the protagonist has no intention of letting him escape. He then uses the Crimson Sword and throws rocks at the enemy. This blocks the vampire's escape path, leaving him nowhere to go. Davey, meanwhile, is toying a bit with his prey. He even thinks that if others saw him in this situation, they'd probably mistake him for the villain. The enemy doesn't understand what the protagonist is saying, and only thinks about getting out of there as fast as possible. However, when he tries to flee, Davey stops him. The vampire is immediately surprised by Davey's speed. Not only that, but besides stopping the enemy from fleeing, the protagonist says he can't just leave after what he's done. He then attacks the vampire, who narrowly avoids a direct hit. However, he still gets a cut and realizes that he's truly not facing just any opponent. The vampire thinks he belongs to the high nobility of his kind, and not only that, but he believes his race is superior to humans. He's facing a human who wasn't scared by the magical beast, and on top of that, after defeating it, is playing cat and mouse as if it's nothing. With this, the vampire realizes that Pace misjudged the prince, and now that he's become easy prey, his master isn't there to help him. The vampire can only think that he's not facing a normal human. Plus, he can't even counterattack his opponent. Sometime later, the protagonist subdues the vampire and tells him to behave and not try to resist. The vampire calls the protagonist an inferior human and asks, "What do you think you're doing?" Davey says he needs to know a few things, but the vampire claims his species doesn't give confidential information to humans. The protagonist, in turn, claims he never intended to make the vampire talk, as he has a perfect magic for that and can see through others' minds. He knows about the resilience of vampires. However, he believes there's nothing he can't uncover. At this, the protagonist uses his interrogation flame magic to get all the information he needs, and in the process, the vampire feels the flames burning his body. Immediately after, he begs the protagonist to put out the fire. Perselk says that even though he's an enemy, she finds this excessive, but Davey claims the vampire won't die. His friend says she isn't worried about the vampire, but Davey says he usually doesn't show mercy to someone who tries to take his life. Perselk knows this well, yet she still feels uncomfortable, so Davey says she's too kind-hearted. Next, he says he doesn't need to uncover much about the vampire, so he wants to get it over with quickly. Crying in despair, the vampire vampire can barely speak and still shows resilience in this situation. The protagonist asks if he wants to experience a little more of the flames. Knowing he doesn't, the vampire introduces himself as Pedkid and says he's a viscount. Davey says he knows very well that he was the target, not the dwarves, then asks if this attack was because of what he did to the vampire maid. Pedkid says yes. Davey comments that the vampire is very cooperative for someone who, just seconds ago, was saying their mouth was a tomb. Next, he asks what he really wants to know, questioning why Pedkid and the magical beast have immortality. The vampire hesitated to answer this question. With this, the protagonist thinks he might need to provoke him a little more. Annoyed, Pedkid makes an unexpected decision and claims he'd rather die than answer that. Immediately, Davey perceives the danger. He knows the vampire was cursed not to reveal what he knows. Pedkid starts to swell up and is about to explode. It doesn't take long for him to become a walking bomb and go flying, taking his information with him. After the explosion, the protagonist explains that the vampire didn't act willingly, but rather due to a curse, adding that he hadn't expected to uncover much anyway. Purcell apologizes, feeling guilty about the situation, but Davey assures her it's not her fault. He explains that when a curse is broken, the person who cast it can sense it. So, essentially, the defeated vampire's master now knows their subordinate has died. Not only that, but Davey also realizes that the curse he placed on Carlos has been lifted. The curse he used was deliberately difficult to remove, but someone apparently managed it, leading Davey to believe that all these events must be interconnected. Therefore, he expects the person behind it all to be powerful. Back in the dwarf village, they are rebuilding some of the destroyed parts. Purcell notes that the beast passed through here before going after Davey, which is why the area was devastated. The protagonist realizes the dwarves have become much busier because of this, mobilizing their forces to repair the damage. So he goes to meet the dwarf elder. Golgotha, in turn, apologizes for what happened. Davey asks if the elder was injured during the attack. Golgotha replies that he wasn't, but dozens of buildings were destroyed, and a few people suffered minor injuries. However, the protagonist notices something different. He senses the elder wants to tell him something, but is hesitant. At that, Golgotha invites them inside to talk. Inside the chambers, Davey mentions seeing several sentinels around the city and asks if anything happened. The elder says it's nothing major, just a child who disappeared from the orphanage. The sentinels are looking for them, but haven't found them yet. Furthermore, Golgotha fears that this place is no longer safe for the prince. Davey, however, says he also has something to reveal. He hands an item to the brothers, explaining that the notebook contains all the necessary information to restore the sacred item, as it will take a long time for them to finish it. He also mentions he'll be leaving soon, which is why he prepared the notes. The elder says there's no way they can pay for this, but Davey replies he wants nothing in return. In fact, he's the one who owes them a favor. Thanks to the dwarves, he got what he wanted. His sword's finished. Furthermore, he reveals that the magical beast was after him, not the dwarves. So once he leaves the village, their problems will resolve. He apologizes for causing so much commotion. Davey muses that the dwarves could have reacted differently. If they had been hostile, they might have used this chance to place all the blame on him. But instead, the dwarves stood by the protagonist, which is why he decided to reveal that he possesses a stigma. The only thing that worries him is the possibility of vampires attacking the village after he leaves, but there's not much he can do for now. In return, Davey went looking for the missing child and found them hidden in a tree. The protagonist felt he owed this to his hosts, and now he can leave the village without further worries. Sometime later, he departs for his home. Things at the Hines territory gate aren't very busy until, amidst the calm, a caravan arrives. The guards demand they identify themselves. At this, the protagonist says these visitors are the Lord's companions. The guards quickly recognize him as the territory's saint, even though Davey claims he isn't one. Anyway, he's happy to be back home. After returning to Hines, he became quite busy, as much had happened in his absence. Its population had grown significantly. Normally, this would be a problem, but not with him there. After all, the protagonist hadn't returned without reinforcements. He had previously explained the whole situation to Golda. The elder says the situation there is precarious, including the Lord's mansion, but this is his chance to repay him, so he promises to transform this place into a worthy home for the world's best blacksmith. Golda states that no one will follow a leader who can't take care of himself, so he'll start with Davey's residence before moving on to other renovations. Davey says he has a few things in mind he'd like to request, and he thinks the other dwarves will like them too. Seeing the Lord accompanied by dwarves, who are known for never leaving their lands, Monmiter wonders what the territory's leader did to convince them. Despite so many questions, the protagonist thinks the territory's reconstruction is going very well. Sometime later, he goes to rest in his new chambers. He comments that he'd rather be be fighting a magical beast than managing so much. Now he understands why the kings of the Joseon dynasty died so young. Perselk says being a leader isn't easy and asks if he's not even going to change his clothes before lying down. But Davey can only think about how soft this ergonomic bed is, saying the alchemy department made it recently. However, he notices something different. Despite the bed being giant, there's someone else lying in it. And apparently, they don't like being disturbed at all. Instantly, Davey feels he's provoked someone he shouldn't have. Scared, Davey wondered if he'd walked into the wrong room, but he knew that was impossible, so it could only mean there was an intruder. With the region developing so rapidly, he'd been dealing with more and more cases of people trespassing into his quarters. Some had even tried to bribe the guards to gain access to his room. Davey remembered one of his masters always warning him about this. She'd told him not to get involved with just any woman, or else she'd come after him. This made Davey realize that a promise from a depraved saint was certainly something to fear. He'd received numerous bribes, he thought, but had never agreed to meet any of the women who'd paid. It had gotten to the point where he started threatening those who tried to sneak into his room. After all, Davey just wanted to sleep peacefully after an intense day of work, and didn't want any women bothering him. But now he saw that somehow, someone had managed to get in. Not only that, but he realized it was a child. What was going on? Who was this girl? The little girl simply said her name was Kaya. Davey was shocked. Not just him, but Perselk also knew this wasn't good. Davey became furious at the situation, imagining some enemy was using an innocent child to try and manipulate him. Furious, he called for Amy. The housekeeper approached, asking what her master needed. Davey demanded to know what this child was doing in his room. Amy, however, didn't know how to respond. Davey claimed he had warned her not to let anyone enter his quarters, even when he was away. However, Amy asked if the prince hadn't brought this child back from his trip. He said no, so if Amy didn't know who this child was, someone else must have secretly placed the girl there. He didn't like it one bit, calling it a bad joke. Amy apologized, saying she should have guarded his quarters better, and promptly took the girl away. She promised to find whoever was responsible for her right away. However, Kaya looked at Davey and called him Daddy. Both of them were left speechless. The shock was so great that Amy let go of the girl, and Kaya immediately ran towards Davey, hugging him tightly. Despite being called Daddy, Davey had no idea what was happening. But his problems were only just beginning, because then he was startled again as another girl appeared in his room. This one, however, seemed more frightened. A while later, Kaya was running around the quarters, and Amy tried to keep an eye on her. Upon checking the girl's status, Davey realized that this was actually the human form of the Crimson Sword, and the other girl was the Azure Sword. He just couldn't understand why both had taken on human, childlike forms. Perselk remarked that Davey's sense of morality must be wounded, given the terrible names he'd chosen for them. Davey, however, retorted that it was too late for that now. Davey definitely hadn't expected this, but he discovered the swords had become self-aware and called him father because he had created them. He insisted, though, that this had happened against his will. Meanwhile, Amy offered Kaya a biscuit. Seeing this, Davey wondered if swords even needed to eat. As if one wasn't enough, the other girl approached Davey. She hadn't made up a nickname for herself, so Davey continued to call her Azure. The girl in turn called him Daddy. Davey felt his heart couldn't handle so much cuteness. A while later, he gathered the two of them. He asked if they could return to their original form. Azure and Crimson understood the command. They manifested their power together and transformed back into swords. Perselk noted that they didn't even hesitate to return to their original form. Davey commented that their transformation seemed instinctive. What's more, the density of power within the swords seemed to have increased, so the emergence of their consciousness had actually strengthened them. After that, he told them they could both return to their human forms. With this, he wondered if he should reveal it publicly. Perselk reminded him that the two were his daughters. Davey said they were technically adopted daughters, and he didn't want this to interfere with a future marriage or anything similar. While he pondered what to do, Amy appeared to speak with the prince. She announced he had just received a visitor. Davey asked if a guest had arrived without announcing their presence. The housekeeper said yes, but revealed it was his sister, Princess Winley. Winley is enchanted by the children as soon as she arrives, and asks her brother who these girls are. Davey tells her they are his adopted daughters. Winley is truly surprised by this information. She immediately comments that Davey always has something new every time she sees him. She mentions she was worried when she heard about his departure to an inhospitable territory, but was very happy to learn he had set up a business and was living very well. What's more, as soon as she arrived, she saw dwarves around town and was delighted, because she thought they never left their villages. Davey explains that they are all helping each other. He adds that he would like to welcome Winley more properly, but as she can see, things are quite hectic around here. She says it's no problem and is simply happy to see her brother content. Besides, she knows he's a busy guy. Davey thinks his sister is right. After all, he is having fun. He then invites Winley inside, while still attending to his family. Amy leads the other people who traveled with Winley. The protagonist notices something strange about this, but for now, he'll let the housekeeper deal with the others. Inside the house, Davey asks Winley how she found time to visit him, being so busy with her own territory. She explains that the number of nighttime attacks has decreased, so Varys has become a very peaceful territory recently. Unlike his territory, Varys is quite uninteresting. Actually, Winley says the reason for her visit is something else. She asks if her brother knows how to use the power of a stigma. She knows that despite her brother being a busy guy, he's the only one she can count on now. That's why she wants to know if he can help. The protagonist sees his sister crying and realizes she's in trouble. He quickly volunteers to help in whatever way necessary. A little while later, Winley falls asleep. Davey knows there's a considerable distance between the Varys and Hines territories, so she must be exhausted. After all, she traveled for several days without proper rest, just to speak with him. Winley had mentioned that a friend of hers was on the verge of death, with doctors and priests having given up trying to cure her. The protagonist knows that Patna is Winley's friend and personal bodyguard. She was hit by a poisoned arrow while defending the princess. His sister had fallen into a trap and was pursued by bandits, so if Patna hadn't been with her, Winley might have been hit by the arrow. Winley said a priest removed the poison from Patna's body, but after that, marks began to appear all over her body. Additionally, abnormal symptoms started manifesting in the bodyguard. Because of this, she has been suffering greatly and is basically dying slowly. Desperate for help, Winley decided that a priest wouldn't solve her friend's problem, so she tried to appeal to someone with greater authority. That's why she came to her brother, because he has a stigma, and she believes only he can help. Davey promised he would do everything he could, and after crying for a long time, Winley fell asleep. The protagonist hasn't left his sister's side since then. The children approach, and Kaya asks if Winley is sick. Davey says no, affirming that Winley just needs some rest, so now he wants to let her sleep. Kaya, however, doesn't want to leave Winley because she's grown attached to her. Perselk finds the affection of the two children for someone they barely know very sweet. Not only her, but the protagonist too. And without realizing it, he's getting used to this idea of being a father. He thinks that normally he would stop the children, but since they are full of energy, having them by Winley's side might even help his sister's recovery. A while later, the protagonist reconsiders the symptoms his sister described. Perselk asks what the problem is. He says these symptoms are familiar and he has a hunch that something is about to happen, but he doesn't know what it is. After this, he asks the butler to find the best and most trustworthy guilds in his territory. Davey states that things are about to get complicated, and he wants to be prepared. Perselk says this doesn't seem like a big problem. After all, he's used to seeing Davey turn any danger into an opportunity. Davey knows that well, but his concern is having a larger number of patients because based on the symptoms, only one illness comes to his mind. Perselk asks if there really is a disease that makes someone cough blood and causes blue marks all over the body. The protagonist says yes, but not on this continent. That's why he's worried and confused, not knowing its origin. The next day, Winley was playing with the children. Watching this from a distance, Davey thought that every action generates a reaction. The patient had received healing magic right after being hit with a poisoned arrow, but then started showing abnormal symptoms of a disease unknown to doctors. Perselk mentioned that Davey wasn't looking well. Davey replied that he'd been thinking a lot lately. His friend then asked where savages who pillaged the kingdom's borders could have gotten such a powerful poison. Davey had suspicions, but said it was too early to draw conclusions, so he needed to investigate further. Perselk asked if that's why he'd called the Intelligence Guild. Davey confirmed, explaining that he believed the cure for every illness lay in its cause. That was the first thing he'd learned in his medical studies. Then he noticed a presence and remarked that the timing couldn't be more perfect. He told the person not to be shy and to reveal themselves. Perselk asked who he was talking to. Davey pointed to a disguised person in front of him and told them not to waste time. The mysterious person said they'd heard the prince needed help. Davey confirmed, thanking them for the visit. But realizing his guest was cautious, he went straight to the point. He said he wanted to buy information and could pay a good price for it, knowing very well that nothing in this world came for free. The mysterious person replied that with appropriate payment, they could even provide information from neighboring kingdoms, no matter if the information was intimate or not. Davey asked if the guest had any information about the princess of the Farron Empire. Perselk interjected, saying he didn't need to play the merchant's game. Regardless, the guest stated they'd give their life to collect whatever was needed, so the answer was yes. Davey said he would be direct. He then placed the payment on the table and stated that there was a knight named Patna who protected his younger sister, Winley. He wanted to know everything about her and where she had been recently. Meanwhile, he saw in the merchant's status that their name was Ena Helishana, a dark elf. In turn, the elf asked if all they needed to do was investigate that woman's past. Davey asked if he had requested too difficult a task. Ena said they wouldn't accept the money. Davey asked, why not? Ena replied that they would be paid after completing the service. Davey then asked what would happen if he decided not to pay. The elf, knowing Davey was quite sarcastic, also knew he didn't usually break agreements, which was why she knew he'd pay. Davey realized that even though she was discreet, Ena wanted to form a connection, and he found that good. He then asked if her guild had proposed such an arrangement. She said she'd made the decision on her own. In that case, Davey agreed to the arrangement. Immediately, Ena vanished from the spot with a smoke bomb. Davey, however, remarked that they could have just left like a normal person. He then realized that Ena Helishana had tried to hide the fact that she was a woman. Not only that, but her nickname was Echo, someone famous across the continent for always completing her tasks. Perselk asked what he knew about the name Helishana, as it was Ina's surname, and it had caught his attention. Davey said it probably wasn't anything significant and told her to forget about it. 2 days later, as Davey prepared to leave, his sister insisted on coming along. He explained that Winley's friend was in a serious condition, so he needed his sister to stay there while the matter was resolved. He also told Winley not to be stubborn. After all, the journey was long and bringing more people would only delay them. Besides, there was no time to lose, so he needed her to stay and rest, as such horse travels were very tiring. Davey thought his intuition told him something bad would happen if Winley came along. Perselk, however, commented that it had nothing to do with intuition. Despite all this, his sister insisted on going with him, until, amidst their discussion, someone appeared. It was one of Winley's companions who asked what was happening. Winley said her brother didn't want to let her travel with him. Perselk, in turn, said that this was the very problem Davey had mentioned. Ulysses introduces himself as a rank 5 mage. He mentions he's associated with the Red Tower, even though that affiliation seems a bit unusual for someone of his status. Davey introduces himself in return, stating he's heard about Ulysses. Despite Ulysses' friendly demeanor, Davey wasn't thrilled about meeting the mage this way and felt there was no reason to continue their conversation. After all, no matter how famous Ulysses might be across the continent, he was still from the Central Magic Tower, and Davey found no interest in associating with him. Ulysses, for his part, comments that this region is far from humble. In fact, it's the most brilliant territory in the eastern continent. He also adds that Princess Winley spoke highly of the place, which sparked his interest in visiting. Winley quickly tells Ulysses he shouldn't be saying such things in front of her brother. Even Perselk notices that Davey's jealousy only grew after hearing this, and advises him not to be hostile toward Ulysses. However, Davey's intentions are precisely the opposite of that advice. As far as Davey knew, Ulysses was known as the prodigy of the Red Tower, and there was no denying he was highly skilled despite his youth. On top of that, his background was one of wealth, competence, and good looks, basically the ideal guy with no apparent flaws. The real problem was his closeness to Winley, so Davey immediately asks how they met. Ulysses explains that he met the princess while on his way to the Hines region and accompanied her all the way here. Davey thanks him for his kindness, but internally, he felt like killing the guy. The mage then clarifies that Winley actually helped him. When he was fleeing from mountain bandits, the princess used her magic to defend him. Because of that, he feels he owes her a favor. He then states that he's very skilled with spatial magic and can create a small mana portal that transports items anywhere he wishes. Winley is quite surprised by this, unlike her brother. She explains that such portals are smaller, unlike those that need to be installed, and only a truly skilled mage would possess such an artifact. Ulysses, however, says it's just a coincidence he's carrying the item, explaining he had to safeguard it to ensure it wasn't damaged. Winley finds it incredible that he can use 2 different types of magic, little knowing that her brother does the same thing. Regardless, Perselk points out that this could be beneficial for Davey, as teleporting things over long distances is difficult for him. Even though he didn't like the idea, Davey agreed. Reluctantly, he accepted the mage's help. Sometime later, the teleportation magic was used. The 3 of them appeared at their final destination, the kingdom of Varus. But upon arrival, the place seemed rather unsettling. Perselk noted a smell of burnt protein in the air. Davey realized the smell was very similar to burnt bodies. Winley wondered if there had been another invasion, but couldn't understand why, as it hadn't been long since they'd driven out all the bandits. Amidst this, someone recognized Princess Winley. The man introduced himself as Count Lington from the Corporation for Disease Treatment, stating he'd been sent to tend to her friend. He also added that Winley was even more beautiful in person, believing the rumors he'd heard had significantly understated the reality. Winley quickly interjects that they don't have time for such conversations and wants to resolve her friend's problem as soon as possible. However, Count Lington states that this situation will have to wait and asks everyone to follow him. He explains that the castle where the princess will stay has already been isolated using an artifact from the Holy Kingdom, and he'll take them there right now. Once at the castle, the Count apologizes for moving the knights without permission, but explains that given the current situation, he had no choice. Winley reminds him that the lord of the territory is her brother, Boris, but if he's absent, authority passes to her. Count Lincoln acknowledges this and admits that doing something like this without asking is indeed horrible, but his position in the Corporation for Disease Treatment grants him such authority. Therefore, someone like Winley should be well aware of this. The Corporation for Disease Treatment is an organization approved by the continent's 3 emperors, holding the highest authority in public health matters, and, representing them, the Count declares that a terrible disease has gripped this territory. It's known within his organization as Demon's Blood. Once infected, a person starts developing blue marks on their body and begins coughing blood easily, which then spreads the contagion to those nearby. Despite this, Winley insists it's no time for such discussions and asks Davey to accompany her immediately to Patna. Count Lincoln, who hadn't recognized Davey earlier, apologizes, claiming he had always been interested in meeting him. He also heard that Davey possesses a stigma and has a successful business involving moon plant leaves. He asserts that nothing happens by chance and claims Davey is blessed to have all of this. At this point, Winley grows tired of the conversation. She states her friend needs her. The princess tries to summon her butler, but Count Lincoln informs her that all staff on the premises are in quarantine. Since the disease is highly contagious, he couldn't risk it spreading, so everyone who had contact with the patient is under surveillance. Contrary to what the princess might think, Count Lincoln asserts that he has the Queen's direct authorization to carry out his duties in this territory. He further claims that in times like these, his authority supersedes that of the local lord, as this isn't the first time such a situation has occurred. Not only that, but he states this disease is incurable. Not even divine power will solve the problem. However, that's precisely why he and his team are here. He asks the princess to leave the rest to him, because he'll soon return with good news. A treatment room was set up on site. The protagonist went to check the situation and noticed many sick people. He realized this quarantine was more about preventing the worst than actually curing patients, though it was still a plausible way to handle things. Purcelk said he'd never seen anything so horrific in his life, and the smell of the place was unbearable. Meanwhile, the protagonist looked for his sister's friend. It didn't take long to find patient number 1, and she was in a terrible state. Upon seeing her, Davey said it was all caused by a flower. As far as he remembered, it was called a tostas flower, a rare plant that grows in extreme environments and contains a lethal poison. Davey checked Patna's temperature and said her brain cells would fry if this continued. Her body was in a very unstable condition. Her skin was cold like a corpse, but her organs were extremely hot. He had suspected this might be the case, but seeing the patient now, he concluded it would be more complicated than he'd imagined. However, the most intriguing thing was how this disease had reached this continent. Davey claimed the disease was lethal, caused by a virus called melting acceleration. Not only that, but he said the disease had prevailed in another world and was created with a specific goal: to be unlike any other known illness. Besides being highly contagious, it could kill millions through a single person. Last time, it took 10 years for a cure to be developed, and even though many people were saved, countless others had already died by then. With that, Davey said he needed to make antibiotics before it was too late. He picked up a scalpel from the nearby table and prepared to perform a removal, but before he could, he was stopped. A baron named Gorneo, an official from the disease organization, said it was a restricted area and asked what the protagonist was doing. He introduced himself as Prince Davey and said his presence should have already been reported. The baron said he was aware of the prince's arrival, but claimed this place was off limits even for royalty, so he asked Davey to leave. He added that Davey must already know a pandemic was spreading across the territory, and they had discovered the disease spread through the air. He then asked the prince to cover his face before he inhaled the contagious disease. He said he was aware the prince had a stigma, but affirmed it wouldn't protect him because a high priest had recently visited the kingdom and even he got infected. Suddenly, the baron saw someone screaming in pain and asked when that patient's condition had worsened. Gorneo told them to calm the patient down and then give him painkillers. One of the nurses prepared a syringe, but the protagonist claimed that if he gave that to the patient, it would kill him. He then asked to check the vial, and upon grabbing it, he said that was the problem. Davey tore open the patient's shirt, realizing the man's blood was clogging his lungs due to the virus. Therefore, he would have a cardiac arrest if this problem wasn't dealt with. With that, the protagonist prepared a scalpel and made a precise incision on the patient, relieving his pain. Not only that, but he continued with the medical procedures, leaving even the other nurses impressed. Davey was hyper-focused on the task until Gorneo interrupted him and asked why he had taken that person's life. He also said someone's life wasn't a toy, so he couldn't just do whatever he wanted. But then, the Baron noticed something. One of the nurses said the patient's pulse had returned to normal. Gornio was surprised by this information and realized the prince hadn't killed the man, but helped him. After being released, Davey asked to borrow something. He took one of the vials from the area and told the nurses they just needed to stop the bleeding and stitch the wound, but warned them not to use painkillers on patients with these symptoms, as it would kill them. With that, he said his work there was done. But before leaving, he addressed Baron Gorneo, saying that people blessed with the stigma were immune to diseases. Therefore, he couldn't be compared to someone like the High Priest. A while later, the protagonist returns to Winley, but he doesn't like seeing her alone with Ulysses. Anyway, he wants to know if she has any news about Baris, but Winley replies that the situation where her twin isn't looking good. Davey says the situation at the treatment center isn't much different, but he believes people are doing their best. Ulysses mentions he's gathered some information. He says that currently, 2 officials from the Disease Treatment Center have been sent to Varys, Count Lington, and Baron Gornio. By the way, these titles are a thing of the past, as they are now officials of the Disease Treatment Center. Ulysses also lays out the treatment center's hierarchy, revealing they have a president, 3 directors, and 15 officials. Below them are knights and doctors, but Davey notices that the 3 directors are actually the emperors. The president, meanwhile, is Valshaz, the Pope of the Holy Kingdom. And while external wounds are easy to treat, this world is quite vulnerable to diseases. However, the 15 officials are still a secret because they are extremely skilled in medicine, and the group fears losing such important people. Nonetheless, upon receiving authority from the 3 emperors and the Pope, what Count Lington said makes sense. They are greater than royalty at this moment. Moreover, opposing this is the same as opposing the 3 empires and the Pope. Therefore, anyone who tries will be considered a traitor, and even if they don't like the situation, there's nothing they can do about it. In addition, they are accompanied by the Knights of Destruction, whose captain is Count Collio, the same count from the eastern territory of the Randis Kingdom, one of the royal knights. Ulysses heard he retired a few years ago, but for him to be here means the situation is serious, so he doesn't want to interfere in these matters. Winley says if she had known the gravity of the situation, she wouldn't have involved them both in this. The protagonist tells his sister not to worry, assuring her everything will be fine. However, he then asks if this is bothering Ulysses in any way. Ulysses says no, explaining that Patna is actually a mage affiliated with the Red Tower, so he also has an interest in helping her, as he's an elder of the tower himself. Davey thinks this guy gives off the impression of being diligent, yet he senses Ulysses has other motives for being there, which he's hiding. Besides that, the protagonist thinks staying at the treatment center won't be useful because he already has what he needs. He says the treatment center is preventing the disease from spreading, and his role is to create a cure while there's still time. Perselk asks how Davey intends to do that. The protagonist says the medical treatment center must have tried the same procedure, but because they used traditional methods, they weren't successful. Perselk then understands he will use the patient's blood, but still doesn't know how that will work. Davey says he has a method and asks if the elf is here. Ena Helishana reveals herself, saying the protagonist has found her again. However, she doesn't like that her stealth never seems to work on him. Anyway, she proceeds to hand over the requested information, but mentions she hasn't received payment yet. She also says she has something else for him, something she thinks will be useful. Davey jokes that if she keeps this up, Ena Helishana will ruin her reputation. She, however, doesn't care and claims she knows what she's doing. Davey opens the scroll the elf provided. He asks if the information written there is reliable. He knows that for informants, reliability is practically their lifeblood. Therefore, if Ena Helishana confirms the information's veracity, she isn't lying. The protagonist says he has one more request. He hands her a list and asks her to bring as many of the listed items as she can, trusting she'll do the job better than any mercenary. He also tells her to put the bill under the Disease Treatment Center's name. Ena Helishana hesitates to do this, but the protagonist argues that it's to save people's lives, and he knows she isn't so cold-hearted as to not care about that. So he asks her to carry out the task for the good of humanity.